Hi, welcome back guys. This is your friend, the D and WhatIf, with another fanfiction. This is the first part of What If the Stars Witnessed Katsuki's Ascent. All credits for this video go to their respective authors. So please support the real author. Check out the link in the description for more details. Please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. Tar was filling his lungs. He tried to escape, tried to scrape it off, tried to get it out. It was hopeless. There wasn't a source he could blast. Only endless oil pouring from inside him, encasing him, pulling at him, drowning him. Katsuki Bakugo had just enough time to see All Might reach for him before he was gone. In that single moment of darkness, of being totally lost, of what he imagined death must be like, he had a single thought burning in his mind. If God exists, I'm going to kick his ass for putting me through this shit twice. Air rushed back into him. He was coughing and hacking. He was alive. Red eyes blinked open and he stumbled back. Back from what? Where was he? Looking around, it seemed he was in the epicenter of a new battlefield. There was a large masked man in a suit in front of him, who seemed unconcerned by what just occurred. Everything about him set Katsuki's nerves on edge. But he didn't cower. Katsuki dropped himself into a fighting stance, ready for whatever this fucker had in store. The man only tilted his head, amused. Nothing he was doing screamed villain, but Katsuki knew to trust his gut. Whoever this asshole was, he was bad news. Quickly, he glanced around to assess his situation, never turning his back to the man. Okay, still in the city. From the looks of it, he didn't appear to have gone far. The sirens from outside the bar were now a distant screech, but still audible. The heroes would be here soon. Hopefully, he would still be here when they caught up. My apologies, young Katsuki. I know that's not the most pleasant way to travel. Don't worry, you shouldn't need to do it again. The goop returned, but further from him, shaping other forms. Other people. Fuck, it was the assholes from the bar. Katsuki was surrounded again, his only comfort being that the others didn't seem to know what was going on either. Part of him was itching to fight. The element of surprise was the only advantage he had. But he held himself back. Stalling for time was going to be his best option. He didn't know what the new guy's powers were, and the other heroes would be here soon. Hopefully. The hand-covered fucker spoke first. Sensei, I'm sorry. I failed you. So, this guy was the boss Mr. Hands had mentioned before. What the fuck? Don't worry, Tamura. We all make mistakes sometimes. It's all a part of the learning process. You still have plenty of time to try again. I'll help you as I always do. Just don't give up. What the fuck? Katsuki bared his teeth as the villain's attention swung back to him. Oh, fuck no. They weren't getting away with that shit. Oi, asshole. The only lessons any of you fuckers are learning from me is how much it hurts to get your fucking teeth punched in, and what a goddamn jail cell looks like. The man chuckled in response, tone uncomfortably pleased. What fire this one has. You've chosen wisely, Tamura. He'll be a very important pawn. Part of Katsuki really fucking wanted to tell this asshole that there was no such thing as an important pawn. Pawns were identical and all worth the exact same, which was the damn point of them. A pawn could be in an important position, but the pawn itself wasn't actually important. Also, he was a fucking human being. And he sure as fuck wasn't chosen or Shigaraki's pawn. However, calling this dickhead out for not knowing how chess worked wasn't currently high on Katsuki's list of priorities. Probably higher than it should be, but not as high as not letting the asshole who turns shit into marbles grab him. Which, it turns out, was a big part of his life right now. Dodging forward, Katsuki managed to zip between the clone guy and Ms. Dabi. This put him closer to Sensei than he would have liked, but oh well. Better than being a marble. Surprisingly, the man made no move to grab Katsuki. Instead, he extended out a weird tree formation towards the mist guy on the ground, opening up a portal. Katsuki had no idea where that portal went, but he was not going to fucking find out. Using his explosions, he managed to duck away from Mr. Compress and the woman who could magnetize shit just in the nick of time, hopping back a fair distance from the portal. Alright, he could do this. Take him and go to Mura. I'll handle things here. Good luck with that, asshole. Katsuki shouted in response before the guy with the crusty lips could reply. Fuckhand swung his head towards him, and instead of replying to his sensei, he lunged for Katsuki. Fuck. At the very least, the guy was grabbing with 4 fingers. He was trying to catch Katsuki rather than kill him. That meant Katsuki didn't really have to worry about him. He was a distraction. Just had to keep away long enough for the heroes to catch up. That was all. What was taking them so long? Shigaraki grabbed at Katsuki a second time. And this time Katsuki decided he needed a more aggressive offensive. He'd given Shigaraki an explosion to the face earlier, but he'd been trying to make noise more than hurt him. Seriously injuring the guy might have triggered the others to kill him regardless of how much energy they'd put into catching him. Katsuki no longer gave a fuck about that. Rather than dodging like Shigaraki expected, Katsuki launched himself forward towards Shigaraki's grasp. It was a risky as fuck move, but it paid off. Shigaraki jerked backwards, hands snapping into fists to avoid accidentally decaying Katsuki. The movement threw the asshole off balance, giving Katsuki the perfect opening for a full-force two-handed explosion. Those stupid hands were knocked off in all directions as Shigaraki flew clear across the battlefield, slamming into a building. Probably not going to take him out of the fight. But that must have hurt like hell. It seemed that Mr. Suit hadn't been expecting that. One hand darting out and posture going tense as he shouted after the blue-haired man-child. Tamura. The other villains were thrown off by the move, and Katsuki was able to whip around, giving the marble guy a face full of explosion too. It wasn't as strong as the one he hit Shigaraki with, but it still knocked him back quite a ways, spinning himself with another explosion. Katsuki had been about to make a break for it when something grabbed his collar, slamming him to the ground. That was going to sting in the morning. Right now he didn't have time to feel the pain. He jumped back to his feet, only to freeze when his eyes unblurred. The man in the suit was now 10 or so paces in front of him. Bad, but not impossible to deal with. What was much worse was the blue-clad figure now in his grasp. Best Jeanist looked like he was on death's door. He clearly wasn't conscious, and this asshole had one hand hovering above his face. That wasn't very polite Katsuki. He couldn't breathe, couldn't move, couldn't think of a plan. When had this fucker managed to take down Best Jeanist? What was the guy even doing here? He hadn't been a part of the rescue team at the bar, at least not that Katsuki had seen. The guy didn't seem offended by his lack of response, pressing on. You're quite the troublesome child, particularly with that quirk of yours. I wasn't planning to do this, but unfortunately I can't risk letting you hurt Tamura any further. What the fuck was he talking about? Katsuki glanced towards the other villains, but none of them seemed to know shit. Shigaraki had stumbled back to his feet while the rest were staying back, allowing the boss to handle Katsuki. The man took a step towards him. It took everything Katsuki had to suppress his instinct to attack, but he managed. Couldn't risk the guy taking it out on Jeanist. He waited for the other to either make a clear threat or do something, glaring the asshole down. The other paid his angry gaze no mind, his tone conversational, as if they were discussing the goddamn weather. I'll be honest, I don't particularly mind if I have to kill him today. However, it does seem like an awful waste, doesn't it? He was so brave earlier, so strong, so heroic when he protected his allies. I was going to spare him for that. I'm still willing to let him live. In fact, I'll even heal him now to make your choice a little easier. As the man spoke, a glow spread out from the hand that was holding Jeanist up, and the hero's wounds began to close. He was still out cold, but his breathing evened out, and the only sign he had been damaged was his battered clothing. The glow reappeared, now seeming to pull something back from Jeanist. There we go, all better now. Katsuki hated this asshole's fucking voice. Hated how the man sounded calm, polite, formal, how he sounded like he was talking to a toddler or something. The other's free hand reached down to cradle Jeanist's face. Katsuki's own palms twitched as he barely suppressed the powerful urge to launch himself at the fucker and blow those hands off his fucking body. Now Katsuki, if you'd like him to stay alive, you're going to come here quietly. If you try to attack me or escape, I'm afraid I'll be forced to kill him. It felt like his teeth would shatter from how hard he was gritting them, but Katsuki didn't have a choice. There was no way in hell he was going to let this asshole kill Jeanist. All he could do was slowly shuffle forward, drawing out the movements as much as he dared, hoping it might buy time for the other pro-heroes to catch up. One step away from the man, he paused, unsure of what the guy wanted from him now. Hold out your arm. Either one will do. Probably going to drug him if he did it. Unfortunately, Katsuki didn't have any other options. Slowly he extended his right arm, careful to keep his palm downwards so it didn't look like an attack. In a single smooth movement, the man tossed Jeanist aside, reaching out to grab Katsuki by the wrist. It took everything Katsuki had not to startle and dodge or try to catch Jeanist. The hero was tough, and the guy in the suit hadn't thrown him hard. He'd be all right. Besides, Katsuki had a much more pressing problem to deal with. This will hurt a bit, my apologies. Don't fret about the loss though, I'll give it back once you've learned to behave. There was no time for him to puzzle out what the fuck that meant because there was a searing pain in his arm where the man grabbed him. His hand was glowing just like it had before he healed Jeanist. But it was pretty fucking clear the guy was not trying to heal him. It felt like he was trying to pull out Katsuki's blood from under his skin. Katsuki didn't know what the fuck was going on. He didn't know what this asshole was trying to do or what this pain was, but he knew he wasn't going to go down without a fucking fight. With Jeanist safely out of the guy's reach, Katsuki pulled back with everything he had. There was no physical movement involved. It wasn't like the guy was yanking on his arm or something. In all honesty, Katsuki wasn't sure what the fuck either of them were actually doing. But it felt like tug of war with his soul. The man in the suit seemed tense, upset, confused. It was hard to tell. His voice came out as a hiss. His pull weakened ever so slightly. What the? Katsuki took the chance. He grabbed hold of whatever the fuck it was they were fighting for, and he yanked as hard as he fucking could. At that very moment, All Might finally caught up to them. Katsuki didn't hear him arrive, laser focused on not letting this asshole win. The man in the suit did notice All Might's arrival, startling. As All Might rushed towards him, he lost his focus while Katsuki redoubled his own efforts. In both the physical and metaphysical sense, Mr. Smith lost his grip on Katsuki. There was a heartbeat or two where Katsuki could only feel the weird combat they'd been locked in. When the guy let go of his end of the rope, it was like Katsuki was flung backwards from the force he'd been using, the rope coming with him as he fell off a cliff. Then the world came crashing back around him, his legs giving out from underneath him as he struggled to breathe again. All Might smashed into the man, sending him across the battlefield, catching Katsuki as he stumbled. "Young Bakugo, please tell me I wasn't too late. Did he manage to?" "I'm fine." His limbs felt like they were made of lead, but Katsuki wasn't injured. There was no reason for him to be this fucking exhausted. All Might set him down gently, and Katsuki pushed away from him. Even though he almost fell, he really did not want to be touching All Might right now. It was making him feel sick to his stomach for some reason. Instinctively, he threw his hands out to the side to steady himself, letting out little explosions to rebalance his weight. For some reason, All Might tensed up behind him, mumbling something Katsuki couldn't make sense of. He didn't, but neither of them had time to think about it. The asshole in the suit had recovered from the blow and was pushing himself back to his feet. Even without eyes, Katsuki could feel the man was staring at him. From his posture, he appeared unsettled, shocked by something. Actually, now that he was able to look around a little more, all the villain assholes were watching him in shock. Shigaraki's creepy grin had been wiped off his face, a look of disbelief in its place. Glancing behind him, even All Might was watching him with a shocked expression. Katsuki did a mental once-over of himself. Did he sprout horns or wings? Nope, still the same size as before. Skin was the same color. He didn't feel any different. Or well, he felt really fucking tired, but that shouldn't surprise anyone. So what the hell? Whatever it was, All Might shook it off first. "The others are almost here. You need to go now, young Bakugo. I will take care of everything here." "Right." Katsuki quickly evaluated his position and the others near him. The villains tensed, ready to grab for him again. But the only ones he was really worried about were on the other side of the battlefield, well away from him. Still, they were in a city. He couldn't risk leading them on a chase through the streets. His eyes darted to where Genus's body had fallen. All Might wouldn't be able to fight safely with either of them nearby. "Can you make a smokescreen? I've got a plan." His teacher grinned at him and his fist slammed towards the ground without pause. Katsuki darted forward at the same time, spurring the villains out of their shock and into action. Too late, assholes. When All Might's fist hit the ground, it shattered the already damaged and rubble-filled landscape, kicking up a huge cloud of dust that covered the entire battlefield. None of the villains could see to target their attacks or try to catch Katsuki. The fucker in the suit lunged forward, but All Might intercepted him, holding him back. One of the tough things about using explosions to fight was they were bright as fuck. Katsuki's eyes had adjusted to the constant sudden bright lights, so they didn't stun him or leave him blinded afterwards. However, that didn't mean he could see while he was using them. Instead, he had to fix locations in his mind and navigate without seeing 90% of what he was doing. It was hard as hell to learn at first, but it sure as fuck came in handy now. The smokescreen didn't do shit to hinder him, but none of the other fuckers on the field knew how to fight blind. He grabbed Genus with one hand and launched himself with the other. Since the other had been healed up, Katsuki was able to maneuver the other without fear of harming him. Flying one-handed was a pain and a half, not to mention how fucking tired he was. But the threat of death was a pretty fucking good motivator. He could hear the villains yelling below him. They couldn't reach him though, so he paid them no mind. All his focus was on getting as far from the fight as he possibly could. It paid off too. Katsuki's flight took him higher than he'd ever gone before. The good news was it meant he'd land pretty fucking far from the battlefield, and none of those assholes could fly. The bad news was that he wasn't exactly sure how he was going to land. The explosion he'd launched himself with had taken almost everything Katsuki had left. Oh, and apparently the fuckers were trying some shit behind him. He could hear something else whooshing through the air and braced himself to get hit. There was a sudden shift in air pressure behind him, and Katsuki twisted his neck just in time to see Mount Lady expanding to her full height, blocking the assholes who'd gone after him. So, that just left him with the issue of landing. He was in the clear now, at least as far as he could tell, so he aimed for a nearby park. Genus was flipped, so he was now on Katsuki's back. If worse came to worst, he should be alright at least. There was some comfort to be had in that, if nothing else, about this stupid night. He did try to slow himself down. He launched several smaller explosions, but they were little more than sparks by this point. Alright, this was going to hurt. Katsuki braced himself as he slammed into the ground. Thought he wished he had his hero costume on right now. His boots and gloves were made for exactly this sort of shit. Skidding through the dirt and grass, his arms got scratched up pretty badly and his whole body felt the force of the impact. Ugh, didn't feel like he broke anything though. Small mercies. After giving himself a few seconds to breathe, Katsuki pushed himself up into a sitting position. It only took a moment for him to get Genist off his back and laying next to him. The guy was still out cold, but he seemed alright otherwise. Nothing more than a few scratches. His pulse felt strong under Katsuki's fingers. Katsuki wanted to do more. He wanted to get back up and see if there was any way he could help. See if there were people who needed evacuating. Or find his way to whatever the closest police station or hero agency was. Escaping on his own had taken the last of his energy though, and Katsuki found his vision going dark. There were people nearby, civilians. At least one of them was approaching him. Wide eyes and tense posture. They were saying something, but Katsuki couldn't make it out. His hearing felt fuzzy. "Yo, all 911? It was mumbled out. Fuck. He couldn't even form words properly. The impact might have shaken his brain a little more than he'd been anticipating. Thankfully, the person got the message. They turned to someone else nearby and he could see them dialing. That was good. Someone would be here to help soon. Emboldened, the first person came closer, getting a good look at Genist. Yeah, the guy probably looked a bit dead right now. It was hard to see his breathing through the costume. He was also pretty easy to recognize as a pro hero. He's alive. Katsuki didn't know if the person heard him or not. All he could manage was getting those words out. And then he felt his body finally give up. Darkness overtook his vision. And he was falling backwards into an empty void. Fuck. He hoped he'd gotten far enough away. Guess he'd get to find out when he woke up. Kakin. It felt like he'd been hit by a bus filled with bricks. Katsuki. Ugh. Both his boyfriends were here then. Maybe he could fake being asleep for a few more minutes. Katsuki, we know you're awake. Damn it, Shouto. With a sigh, Katsuki forced his eyes to open. Bright light assaulted him, and he reeled back. After several seconds of blinking, he managed to get the world into focus. Shouto and Izuku were at his bedside. Izuku was already teary-eyed and Katsuki only had a moment to catch his breath before his crybaby boyfriend was on him, sobbing into his shoulder and clutching him. For once, Katsuki didn't protest. He let Izuku cry, moving his hands to rub at his shoulders and waiting for him to calm down. Red eyes moved to look up at his other boyfriend, who wasn't much better off. While the other wasn't crying his heart out like Izuku was, he was shaking, and both of his hands were clasped to the hem of Katsuki's shirt, as if Katsuki might vanish if he let go. Did anyone die? It wasn't the first question he should ask, but it was the one he needed to know. It had been in the middle of a city. Attacks like that were bound to cause casualties. No deaths reported. The heroes evacuated the surrounding areas before they moved in for the rescue attempt. Shouto answered him in a too calm tone that Katsuki hated because it meant there was something else wrong. Something else that he didn't want to say. He'd need to keep prying then. How many injured? Only a handful of serious injuries. One civilian who was drunk and didn't evacuate. The injured pro heroes are all receiving treatment and mostly in stable condition. Did they catch any of the villains? Both his boyfriends tensed. And Katsuki knew he'd hit the nail on the head. Fuck. Seconds ticked by in the hospital room that now felt too large and too empty. The 3 villains were captured at the training camp. All 3 have been arrested and dealt with. They also were able to destroy almost all the Namu that were at the factory. That was all he needed to hear. But the rest of them got away. All the actual villains. Izuku pressed his face more firmly into Katsuki's side. It told him enough. All Might. He was able to seriously injure the man known as All For One. He won the fight, but All For One had been cautious. He left himself an escape route. Said something about needing to live to try another day. Oh fuck. So he was never going to sleep again. That seemed like the only reasonable and fair response to the threat left hanging over him. There was something else there though. He looked down at Izuku, knowing the other could feel his gaze and would give in. His boyfriend squirmed and tried to ignore it for almost a full minute, a new record for him, before finally giving up the ghost. All Might, he's retired. It was coming for a while, but he used the last of his power to beat All For One. Oh, he ended up pretty badly injured. Izuku had to pause for a few seconds, and Katsuki could feel the tears against his side. He already knew what his boyfriend was going to say, but he needed to hear it out loud. Finally, Shouto cut in to say what Izuku couldn't. All Might had several pre-existing injuries, including lost organs. He's not dead yet, but they're not sure if he'll make it to the end of the year. The injuries are too severe and his body was already heavily damaged. Katsuki had fucked up plenty of times in his life. Plenty of times. Anything from social interaction, to homework assignments, to trying to use his quirk. You name it, he'd messed it up. He never thought he could ever fuck up this badly though. Getting the world's best hero killed because he hadn't been able to stop some gang of assholes from kidnapping him. Fuckers got away too. Best Genist is okay though. It was really weird. He was totally fine once he woke up. Just some bruises from when All For One tossed him around. He came by to see you yesterday. Said he hopes you make a quick recovery. It was really good that you got him out of there. All Might's fight, well, it was totally badass, but he wouldn't have been able to use any of his big attacks like he did if there'd been someone else on the battlefield. There was some comfort in that if nothing else. Katsuki closed his eyes and listened to his boyfriend ramble on about the battle, comparing quirk use, tactics, raw strength. Then he turned those words over in his mind again. Wait. Instantly Izuku stopped talking, frozen like a statue. Weird. How long was I out for? Both his boyfriends relaxed. So, there was something else they were hiding from him. He'd need to get to the bottom of whatever that was too. For the moment he waited for Shado's answer. About 3 days now. You had 3 fractured ribs and a lot of little injuries. The ribs weren't completely snapped, but when your landing in the park jostled them and caused a bit of internal bleeding. Between that and exhaustion, they had to do surgery instead of recovery girl healing you right away. Yesterday you were finally well enough for her to heal you, and since then we've been waiting for you to wake up. Alright, 3 days wasn't bad. He could live with 3 days missing. Now time to figure out what it was that these two were trying to keep from him. Because Katsuki was many things, but he was not dumb. He could tell when people were trying to hide shit from him. Particularly these two, since they were both absolute crap at lying. Before he could begin his interrogation, a figure appeared in the doorway. It took several seconds for Katsuki to recognize his teacher out of his hero costume and with how fucking exhausted he looked. Aizawa took in the 3 of them before sighing and dropping his head. Despite the slump to his shoulders, there was a slight smile on his lips Katsuki could just barely make out. Said smile faded when he looked up, face growing serious as he looked towards Shadow for some reason. Katsuki's eyes darted between the two, trying to figure out what he was missing. Did he lose it? Well, that was fucking rude, even by Aizawa's standards. Sure, Katsuki could be a bit temperamental at times, but he'd only just woken up and wait. Nope, something else was going on here. The look on Shadow's face as the other glanced at Katsuki's hands before replying only confused him further. He only just woke up. There hasn't been a chance for. That's it. They were done playing the don't tell Katsuki what's wrong game. Alright fuckers, what are you hiding from me? Thankfully, his teacher also lacked the patience for that game. Use your quirk. Katsuki narrowed his eyes, but was cut off as he opened his mouth to ask how the fuck he was meant to do that in a hospital bed. I don't mean blow up the entire damn room, just test it. Anything works. At some point he better get some fucking answers for what the hell was happening here. With a roll of his eyes, Katsuki lifted the arm Izuku wasn't clinging onto and opened his hand. It took a few seconds. He was still fucking exhausted and his nitroglycerin production always went down when he was injured, but sure enough a set of sparks flew from his palm. Everyone else in the room slumped in relief like puppets with their strings cut. Izuku redoubled his efforts to meld with Katsuki's side. Shadow dropped into one of the chairs by the bedside with his hands still gripping Katsuki, and Aizawa brought his hands up to rub tiredly at his face. What the fuck were the rest of them so relieved about? His hands hadn't even been injured. Why would his quirk be fucked up? Now will one of you assholes tell me what's going on? It was Aizawa that answered him. Good question. As far as we can tell, you might be the most contrary kid to walk the damn planet. Red eyes narrowed back down to a glare. That was not a damn answer. Izuku piped up beside him to elaborate. You know the man in the suit who warped you away. All for one. A nod. Yeah, of course, how could he forget the dickhead? Actually, wait, the fucker was called All for One. What a stupid fucking name. Okay, not the most important part of this conversation. Well, his quirk, it lets him transfer other people's quirks. He's been doing it for a long time, stealing quirks and stuff, and we also think it's how he makes nomas. It requires physical contact for him to do it, so he was trying to take my quirk. That's what he was threatening Genist for. We think so, yeah. It's also how he healed Genist. He transferred over a healing quirk and took it back. Huh, well, that whole encounter made a lot more fucking sense now. Still didn't explain why all of them were so scared about him having lost his quirk. Why were you lot being so weird about me still having my quirk then? I mean, sure, the guy tried to take my quirk, but he didn't have enough time to do it. I used it to escape from that whole mess. Why would I have lost it after that? Aizawa spoke up again, stepping further into the room to drop himself into a chair to the side of Katsuki's bed. Well, we still don't know why the hell you still have your quirk. Ragdoll lost hers during the attack, consistent with every other case we've discovered. Everything we know about his quirk says you shouldn't have been able to use it to escape, so it was anyone's guess whether or not you'd keep it. Before Katsuki could ask more questions, Izuku filled in the blanks for him, voice quiet with awe. His quirk, it's not supposed to take time. Or well, it takes a few seconds at most. Once he makes contact, a person's quirk is as good as gone. That's how it's supposed to work anyways, but somehow you broke the rules. It was a solid minute between when he made contact and when All Might finally arrived on the battlefield. There's no recorded cases of that happening before. All Might's been fighting this guy for ages, and even he had no idea how you did it. All For One himself seemed really confused about it too. I don't think he's seen this before either. That was a lot to take in. Katsuki gave himself a little bit of time to think it over. Even though he didn't want to, he replayed the memories of that moment in a new light. His dual-toned boyfriend was the one who finally spoke up, asking what all of them had been thinking. How'd you do it? Grimacing, Katsuki struggled to find an answer that would make sense. I dunno, I could feel him tugging at something, but I didn't really know what was happening or what it was he was doing. Felt like he was trying to steal my soul or some shit like that. Even though I didn't understand what the hell he was trying to do, I knew that I wasn't going to sit there and let that asshole take it. So I grabbed hold of whatever the fuck it was and tugged back with everything I had. He finished with a shrug. Aizawa nodded, leaning back in his chair as he contemplated Katsuki's answer. As much as Katsuki wished he could say there was a magic off button he'd found, there wasn't. Just his own instinctive, spiteful refusal to let a dickhead like that win. Well, good to know it can be resisted. Keep checking your quirk for the next couple of days to ensure there's no lasting effects. Anything feels off, let us know right away. It was Katsuki's turn to nod, silence filling the room as all of them thought over this new information. Izuku shifted himself so he could lay more comfortably against Katsuki's side, now fully stretched out on the bed. If he didn't know better, Katsuki would swear he had a leech quirk of some kind, sucking out Katsuki's natural intimidation abilities by shamelessly snuggling him every chance he got. Shoto had shifted himself too, so he was now slumped on top of Izuku in Katsuki's midsection. Now that he had a moment to really look at them, both his boyfriends looked exhausted. Actually, now that he was looking at them, he noticed a red mark on Shoto's wrist. There was one on the other wrist too. What the fuck happened to your hands, Aizawa? Both of his boyfriends going red in embarrassment wasn't the result Katsuki was expecting, but it was amusing to see regardless. Interestingly enough, Aizawa answered him with a snort. That would be from the restraints I had to put on him after his third attempt to break out of house arrest. Your boyfriends and several of your classmates decided that it was a good idea for them to attempt to rescue you themselves. Thankfully, I had a feeling they were going to try something and managed to stop them before they got themselves killed. As much as Katsuki loved them, sometimes his boyfriends were total idiots. Neither of them would make eye contact with him, refusing to meet his unamused gaze. We were worried. Izuku couldn't even finish his weak justification before he was burying his face in Katsuki's chest again. Even though he was disappointed in both of them for even thinking about something that stupid, and the thought that they might have gotten hurt because of him was terrifying, Katsuki couldn't help being a bit touched. They were both idiots, but they were his idiots, and it warmed a deep part of his heart to know they cared about him that much. Huffing sigh, he let his eyes fall closed again. Whatever. He could yell at them when he wasn't so fucking tired. When Katsuki woke up next, both his boyfriends were gone. Unsurprising as the clock in the room said it was 2 a.m., visiting hours were over. He felt oddly watched though. Probably just paranoia. No more than a few minutes later he was out like a light. All Might was nearby. Even though he was confined to the hospital, the former symbol of peace was in high spirits. When Katsuki finally worked up the courage to visit him, accompanied by both of his boyfriends, he'd been greeted by that same big smile. It was nice of him to pretend he didn't hate Katsuki, probably for Izuku's sake. Really, Izuku should hate Katsuki more than anyone else for taking away the closest thing he had to a father figure. Izuku should hate Katsuki for a whole fucking lot of reasons. He didn't though. For some stupid reason he still loved Katsuki like the idiot he was. More than once Katsuki had wanted to tell him he ought to leave, tell Izuku he ought to run as far away as he possibly could. But he was selfish at his core. He couldn't bear the thought of losing Izuku, not with All Might laying on what would probably be his deathbed. So instead he sat in the hospital room and pretended alongside everyone else. Thanked All Might for saving him, smiled and pretended this wasn't all his fault. If he did anything else, Izuku and Shoto would be upset and he'd already hurt them enough. The next day he was cleared to leave the hospital. As glad as he was to escape the unnaturally white rooms and headache-inducing lighting, Katsuki couldn't help but regard his departure bittersweetly. It wasn't all bad. Kinda. He was escorted home by Best Jeanist and Aizawa. They didn't want to risk too large of an escort drawing attention, but they were also well aware he was still at risk. At the very least, current information suggested the villains were too busy recouping to bother with him. That was nice. His house was only about half an hour from the hospital, but it took them about 2 hours to get there, taking long, twisty routes to avoid being followed. He didn't need to ask to know they'd already pulled his address and any trace of where he lived from his file. Of course, that only helped if the villains hadn't already stolen the information. Katsuki stepped out of the car to see his house at long last. Home sweet home, or something like that. It was hard, but he tried to keep the tension out of his shoulders, keep his gaze level, and didn't spark off his palms. It'd look weird if he acted like a bitch about going back to his own goddamn house. Didn't want that. Didn't want to look weak. Not when he'd already fucked up and gotten himself kidnapped. Couldn't be any weaker. After hesitating for only a moment, he grabbed his bag and slid out of the car. Genist and Aizawa stepped behind him, both looking like they had something to say. For fuck's sake, he was going to have to deal with emotions, wasn't he? The two shared a glance before Genist took the initiative. Aizawa stepped back a little ways, just enough to give them a vague concept of privacy. Unsure, Katsuki couldn't do much but eye the man in front of him and wait for him to get it over with. Genist's eyes softened, shoulders slipping down from their usual formal posture, one hand moving out ever so gently to take Katsuki's shoulder. It took a lot not to flinch at the contact, but he managed. Lots of practice helped. The hero paused, considering his words. I wanted to thank you and apologize. For what? Katsuki didn't mean to blurt out his words like that, but he was too shocked to control himself. If anything, Katsuki owed him an apology. He'd almost gotten him killed twice trying to save him from some two-bit gang of dickheads. Green eyes scrunched up a bit in concern, but he wasn't scolded for the outburst. For my own failings on that battlefield, I was horrified to find out that you were very nearly taken again by the villains, and had I dealt with All For One properly, you would never have had to face him, let alone the fact that my life was used against you. A beat passed before Genist continued. Should a situation like that ever occur in the future, please know I would never want you to put yourself in harm's way for me. That got a snort from Katsuki. You had me as an intern. You know exactly how much I care about doing what you want. Alright, that might sound a little mean, but it was true. Probably should add to it though. That guy had like 15 fucking quirks and every advantage in that fight. It took everything All Might had to take him down. It's not your fault you couldn't do it. If anything, you being there bought me a good amount of time. I was only able to stall because he decided to grab you as a hostage instead of just grabbing me and going for it. Even putting that shit aside, I still would have done it because that's what a hero is fucking supposed to do. I'd do it again too, if it comes down to it. After a second of thought, he added, heroes don't make excuses. They do whatever they have to do, right? Genist's expression was hard to read. Maybe frustrated, maybe worried, maybe a little bit proud. He ended up staring at Katsuki for a few seconds before sighing. It wasn't a disappointed sigh, more like resigned. You know, before I took you on as an intern, I was warned about how stubborn you could be. I thought they must have been exaggerating. There was no way you were that bad. He huffed a small laugh. I suppose I was wrong. Though I think the real mistake was I was warned as if it was a bad thing. Katsuki wasn't exactly sure how to reply to that. He felt like it was a compliment, but he wasn't quite sure. After a moment, Genist's gaze softened again. For all that it might make your life more complicated, your determination is one of your better traits. I hope it's something you hold on to as you grow. All Katsuki could do was nod. He felt like any praise was unearned right now, but he also felt like maybe determination was something he could accept praise on, if nothing else. At the very least, even though he'd been weak and fucking stupid and gotten himself caught, he hadn't given up. He hadn't stopped trying. It was the only redeeming part of the whole situation. Genist took his nod for acceptance and glanced back towards Aizawa. Stay safe, Katsuki. And I'll look forward to seeing where you go as a hero. With that, he was stepping away, going back to the car while Aizawa stepped forward. Katsuki was still left stunned by his former mentor's parting words, so it took a few seconds before he could look up at his teacher. Aizawa was patient, waiting for his gaze before he started on his own little speech. Alright, I'm sure you already know most of this, but I'm supposed to go over it with you anyway. Stay in your house. We'll be keeping in touch with you and your family over the summer, but the less you're outside the better. Keep your phone on you at all times, and if anything feels wrong you call me, the police, or another teacher. Even if it's not a full attack or you're not sure. We'd much rather be safe than sorry. Obviously, don't go talking to strangers or anything like that. At that, Katsuki rolled his eyes and snorted, having recovered from his flustered state. I'm not dumb. I'm not going to go looking for these assholes or try to get myself caught. His teacher glared at him for a few seconds, but relented when Katsuki held his gaze steadily. I know you aren't dumb, kid. Just be careful. Don't try to handle this on your own. He paused for a moment. You'll call if anything strikes you as suspicious or if you see anything. No trying to pretend it wasn't that bad or brushing it off. Yeah, I'll let you know if anything's up. I know better than to ignore that shit. While Aizawa didn't seem entirely satisfied, he didn't protest any further. Instead, he just sighed. Looks like Katsuki was good to go. He adjusted the bag on his shoulder, ready to head towards his house, only to be stopped when his teacher spoke one last time, voice much softer than it was before. I'm glad you're all right, kid. I'm proud of you too. You did a damn good job in that fight. Makes me happy to know at least one of you brats was paying attention during classes. Once again, Katsuki was floored. Of all the things he'd been expecting, a lecture on not getting himself caught, maybe telling him off for requiring other heroes to rescue him, or letting him know just how much danger he'd put everyone else in. He'd never considered praise from Aizawa of all people over this mess. Had it been anyone else, Katsuki would have assumed they were saying shit to make him feel better. Or maybe they were making fun of him for getting his stupid ass kidnapped in the first place. Aizawa was one of the few teachers Katsuki had come to respect though. He didn't give out participation trophies, or praise them for doing basic shit. When they fucked up, he called them out on it. And when they did well, he'd let them know. So instead of making a sarcastic remark or taking offense, Katsuki's gaze fell and he replied in a voice that was quieter than he would have liked. Thanks. There was a lot more he should probably say, questions he wanted to ask. Some pathetic part of him wanted to ask if his teacher really meant that. Ask how he could possibly mean it, when Katsuki had fucked up so much. He didn't though. Instead he just turned back to his house. Keep yourself safe, kid. The words sound like something between an order and a request. A weird tone to his teacher's voice. I will, he replied, unwilling to let his voice waver, unwilling to let any of his doubt or fear spill out from his lips. Aizawa had to leave after that, had to head home. Katsuki needed to do that too, even if he didn't want to. He braced his shoulders and pushed his way through the door to his home. Silence greeted him. Blessed, wonderful silence. Oh thank fuck, they weren't home. No wonder he'd been able to talk with his teachers without her coming out to start in on him. With a sigh of relief, Katsuki made his way to the kitchen. There was a note on the table. Katsuki, your mother and I are working late today. There's some of your favorite in the fridge. Don't leave the house. Don't invite anyone else over. We'll talk when we're home. Be good. Dad. His favorite food wasn't in the fridge. It was some takeout from a local restaurant. It wasn't bad by any means, but that particular restaurant hadn't been his favorite for years. At least his dad was trying. Of course, the effort went to waste because nerves had settled into Katsuki's stomach, twisting it into knots. The food was left in the fridge, and he went upstairs to try to nap. He'd need any extra energy he could get for the impending arrival of his mother. He didn't sleep. Not for a nap, one that he desperately needed, and not that night either. Katsuki Bakugo was 16 years old. He was a hero in training at the best school in Japan. He had a strong quirk. He got good grades, third in his class. He'd fought high-level villains 4 times now and survived all 4 times. He never wavered, never backed down from a fight, never showed fear even in the worst circumstances. None of that saved him from his mother. Lead overtook his limbs at the rumble of his parents' car in the driveway. The air in his room turned to water, filling up his lungs just like the man in the suit had. Throughout the entire fight with the villains who'd abducted him, his hands had held steady and true. Now it took 2 tries for him to get the doorknob to his room open. He knew better than to try and hide from her. It'd only make everything that much worse, make him that much more of a coward. There was no reason for him to be this scared of her. Usually he wasn't. Usually he'd stomp downstairs, slam the doors, pick a fight with her just to prove he didn't care what she thought. Tonight, he couldn't find that courage. Tonight, he already knew what she was going to say as he shuffled down the stairs into hell. Tonight, he knew she was right. And that made it all so much worse. Stepping into the living room, he could feel both of their gazes on him. Pulling himself together, he managed to look up to meet her eyes. Mirror images of his own. Both pairs of eyes were red. The exact same shade. Both were tired, angry, and cold. Both of them could see Katsuki for what he was, a complete and utter fuck-up. She didn't yell at him. Not tonight. She didn't need to. Hell, she only hit him twice. A smack upside the jaw before she said into him. One on the back of the head before she stalked out of the room. Neither hit hurt. Fuck. With what he'd lived through, they were practically pats instead of hits. What got to him was everything in the middle. It must have been at least an hour. An hour of her tearing him to shreds in her low, snide, vindictive tone. Letting him know what a weak bitch he was. How pathetic it was that other people had to go save his stupid ass. How he'd gotten exactly what he deserved for how he acted. How the pros should have left him there to rot. If he'd been stronger. If he'd been better behaved. If he'd been smarter. If. By the time she was finished with him, Katsuki felt numb. Hollowed out, worn down, split apart and empty. Afterwards his dad finally bothered to speak up, having stayed silent during his punishment. You know, she only says those things because she cares about you. He didn't want to hear that. His dad didn't care. We were really scared for you, Katsuki. No, they weren't. We love you. We want you to be better. We want you to be safe. Katsuki turned his back on his father, heading straight back up to his room with robotic steps. Shaking fingers touched his pillow ever so gently before he lost it, pulling the fabric up to smother his near-silent sobs. This was going to be a long fucking summer. 2 months. 2 months passed Katsuki by trapped in his house. He wasn't allowed to leave. He did anyways, sometimes. Just enough to keep up with his training. He had workout equipment in the house, but he had to keep using his quirk or he'd lose his progress with it. Obviously, he couldn't use his quirk in the house, not at the level he needed to. Katsuki left only when he had to and never when there was chance of her catching him. She'd probably put a fucking collar on him if she found out. Every waking moment he felt eyes on him, even when he was in his own room. It suffocated him. Beyond that, he was stuck in his house for 2 fucking months with no outside contact. Nobody was allowed to come over. Not his boyfriends, not his friends, not even his fucking teachers. His mother's excuse was that she didn't want to risk anyone tracking down the house. The real reason was it was part of his punishment, leaving him to his own thoughts and fears. Everyone bought her reasoning, bought his excuse that he didn't feel like seeing people, left him alone with sickeningly kind words and promises that they'd see him at school. At the very least, he still had his phone. While using a touchscreen was hard for Katsuki, Nitroglycerin fucked with how the devices registered his touch. He managed. His classmates had a group chat that he started using to keep himself entertained. And he texted his boyfriends almost every day. It was just out of boredom. It wasn't because he was feeling lonely or scared or lost. It wasn't. At the end of those 2 months, an end to his confinement finally appeared in the form of the UA dorms. Katsuki almost cried again when he laid down on his new bed, for the first time not worried about when his mother was going to get home or when he'd next to be able to work on his quirk. The window to his dorm room was wide open and there was nobody to yell at him for it. The others were having some dorm room competition, which he'd steadfastly refused to take part in. Partially because he didn't want those fuckers snooping around in his room. Partially because he was already overwhelmed from being around this many people again. Even now he could still feel all the eyes on him, watching him when they thought he wasn't looking. It faded though as he lay in his bed, relaxing for the first time since he'd gone home. Somewhere far away, a man without eyes broke the connection, yet again releasing Katsuki from his quirk and letting the boy fade from his mind. His face was twisted in a grimace. No answers yet, I assume. The man made of smoke spoke politely, sympathetically. Anyone else would have been punished with how bad a mood the eyeless man was in, but his question was a kind one. None, still no sign of it. Silence between them. They'd had this conversation before so many times. It was endlessly frustrating. A game of what-ifs and calculating the risks of a second capture attempt. The eyeless man spoke at last, tone firm. We'll try again tomorrow. And that was that. Back in the UA dorms, Katsuki had fallen into a light sleep, worn out from the exhausting days leading up to the move. Nearly 5 hours passed before he was awoken by a knock on the door. He knew who it was before he opened it. Shadow had a unique sort of knock, quiet but firm. Katsuki wasn't expecting his tear-stained face. Before he could speak, he had been damn near plowed down. The door swung shut behind them and several steps stumbled backwards before they fell onto the bed. Several seconds ticked by before he realized the hitch in Shadow's breath was sobbing. Not knowing what else to do, he brought his hand up to comb through his boyfriend's hair, holding him as he cried. This was the sort of thing he'd expect from Izuku, but he tried to be comforting regardless. It took a while for Shadow to explain around his tears. A nightmare, of course. His father had been downright awful before Shadow left, and now he couldn't help but see him wherever he looked in the mirror. Couldn't help but hate himself that much more. Couldn't help but wish his fire gone yet again. He hadn't wanted to go to Izuku, unable to hear gentle encouragement or a talk on how it was his own fire. Katsuki could understand. Sometimes endless positivity wore you down. If it had been just that, they could have managed. Unfortunately, Shadow's emotions got the better of him as he tried to repeat what his father had said. Katsuki hardly felt the tiny flame that flicked out from Shadow's palm. It didn't even leave a mark. That didn't stop Shadow from jumping backwards like he'd just killed him. After that he was damn near inconsolable, unable to deal with the idea that he might have hurt his boyfriend with his flames. Even though Katsuki was pretty damn fireproof, Shadow launched into sobbing again and it pulled at Katsuki's heart. Made him feel that much more guilty. How dare he be upset for having to stay inside for barely 2 fucking months and a couple mean words when his boyfriend was dealing with the worst shit imaginable. He was so fucking weak, so useless, couldn't even get Shadow to stop crying. All he wanted was some magic way to take the pain away, to make it all better, to make his boyfriend not hate himself this much. As he clutched his boyfriend close, holding him as best he could, trying to provide any comfort, all Katsuki wanted was to make this better. In their tearful, pained, panicked desperation, neither of them noticed the odd sensation pulsing through their bodies for a few seconds. Neither of them slept well that night, but Katsuki somehow managed to pull himself out of bed at 6 a.m. Shadow grumbled at him when he slid out of the other's arms, but resettled with a kiss. For the first time in 2 months, Katsuki was able to go for a jog in crisp morning air. It left him feeling refreshed and free for the first time since he'd been kidnapped. Dawn sunlight on his skin made him feel reborn, and he extended his run to savor it. Afterwards, he made breakfast for 3 and rounded up his boyfriends, both of whom had only started waking up. Shadow was quiet, but he was doing better than last night, though his movements were still sluggish, and he'd stolen Katsuki's blanket from upstairs, which was kinda weird. Whatever, with the night he'd had, he deserved all the comfort in the fucking world. Despite his own lack of sleep, Katsuki didn't feel tired. If anything, he was feeling borderline fucking peppy. His morning run had done a world of good for him. Breakfast was quiet. their classmates moving in and out of the kitchen, mumbling greetings as they went. As soon as Shadow finished his food, he tugged the blanket around his shoulders tighter, burying his face into it. Izuku noticed the movement, making eye contact with Katsuki, who could only shrug. "You okay, Shu?" Sleepy mismatched eyes glanced up in confusion. "I'm fine, just cold is all." "Huh, strange." Icy Hot was usually the last one bothered by the temperature. Maybe he was getting sick. The dorms were pretty damn warm, almost uncomfortably so. Katsuki didn't have long to ponder his boyfriend's health since it was almost time for homeroom. But he made a mental note to check Shadow's temperature later. If it got worse, he'd drag him to Recovery Girl. Classes passed by in a blur. It was a lot, being thrown back into a flurry of activity with people constantly around him. At lunch he ended up staying in the classroom with Shadow just to have a break from it all. There was too much happening, and overstimulation itched under Katsuki's skin. Izuku had wanted to stay behind with them, but he'd been unable to see quite a few of his friends over summer, so Katsuki told him to go. After the bell rung, Shadow pretty much conked out at his desk anyways, and Katsuki needed the alone time. He was actually a bit concerned by how badly being around other people was affecting him. While some difficulty with adjusting to the sudden change was expected, Katsuki could hardly handle friendly contact. Somehow his notes still got taken, but all his attention had been on his classmates. It felt like there was something new about them, an energy pulling his focus away from the classes. Physical contact only made it worse, a burning feeling settling under his skin. The sensation of unused potional singing in his veins whenever someone brushed him. Probably his combat instincts kicking into high gear after 2 months on the back burner. Hopefully he'd be able to get rid of the feeling during training. When heroics class rolled around, Katsuki and Izuku both double-checked with Shadow that he felt well enough to participate. He had improved since his nap, but he still felt uncharacteristically cold to the touch. Despite their concern, he insisted on training, and there wasn't much they could do to stop him. Well, if nothing else, they were working individually today to create super moves, so he wasn't at risk of combat injuries. Still, Katsuki kept his eye on Shadow as he made his way to the training ground. Even though his own palms were already sweating, he wanted to make sure Shadow was okay before he started. Aizawa had pulled Shadow for a minute, and from how his posture went tense, Katsuki could guess what he wanted. Today of all days was a bad one to push Shadow to use his fire. But he nodded nonetheless, settling into a practice stance as he faced off against one of Ectoplasm's clones. His left hand reached forward, eyes narrowing in focus, and Katsuki waited for the burst of flames. Ice shards flew from Shadow's hand, and Katsuki froze in shock. What the fuck? From the look on his face, Shadow didn't understand what the fuck was going on either. His other hand reached forward and ice came from it too. Again he tried to call on his fire, but there was only ice. Aizawa ran onto the field to Shadow's side, trying to figure out what the hell had happened. The rest of the class caught on too, people stopping to look over and puzzle out the situation. Katsuki felt panic rising in his throat. Not fucking this. Hadn't Shadow dealt with enough shit in his life already? Now his fucking quirk was going out too. 1 fucking month before their provisional exam. He could already see all the problems this was going to cause between Shadow and his asshole of a father. And last night's feelings of rage and helplessness rushed back into him. It filled his veins with a burning sensation, like all his nerves had been lit up. Bakugo, dude. Spinning around, Katsuki found Denki staring at him with wide, scared eyes. What? Suddenly he felt more eyes on him, and whirling back around he realized everyone was looking at him. Even Shadow and Aizawa were staring at him with horrified expressions. Frustrated, he shouted again. What are all you assholes looking at? Katsuki ... You're... It was Ijiru that finally gave him an answer, but he trailed off, unable to finish his sentence. That was okay though, he didn't need to. Because as Katsuki opened his mouth to demand answers for a third time, he realized he was on fucking fire. Shit, his instinctive response was to panic. Luckily, Katsuki was not Izuku, and so he didn't fucking do that. He closed his eyes, took 1 breath in, let 1 breath out, opened his eyes again. Still on fire. Fuck. Alright then. Panic was still not going to help anyone. Stay calm. Analyze the situation rationally. Good things about this situation. The fire did not appear to be harming him. While it had burned off his shirt, Katsuki himself was not burning. Shadow did not appear to be panicking about his ice anymore. Katsuki's bracers and gloves were designed to handle high temperatures, so they were undamaged. They were also empty. No risk of setting them off. Bad things about this situation. He was on fucking fire. That was something he could work on. His plan had been to head to the showers and try to douse the flames. But Aizawa snapped out of it before he could take a step. The razor had a particular feeling to it. As her quirk factor was deactivated, the sensation was a bit annoying, but not painful. Like the pins and needles of numbness almost. Pins and needles swept over the flames, putting them out and leaving Katsuki standing there, shirtless but no longer on fire. with a whole lot of questions. Izuku had run forward at some point. No idea what he was planning to fucking do, but Katsuki could say with certainty it was a bad idea. Green eyes looked from a smoldering Katsuki to Shadow, who was surrounded by ice, to Aizawa's red gaze that had somehow put out the fire. There was a 2-second delay between when Izuku figured it out and when Katsuki figured it out. The two of them locked eyes. Someone broke the silence. Katsuki couldn't make out who, but instantly the rest of the class set about panicking. Ectoplasm's clones tried to get them under control, while Aizawa let erasure drop. Katsuki didn't burst back into flames, which was good, but now he knew it was an option. It only took a second for him to conjure flames in the palms of his hands. Dismissing them was a little harder, but he figured it out. His eyes had been drawn to the flame, but now they looked back towards his teacher, desperately searching for some sort of guidance. To his credit, Aizawa sighed, rubbed his face to try and smooth out the ever-growing wrinkles, and then spoke. Everyone else fell silent, his voice not loud but strong, commanding, "Bakugo, Todoroki, Midoriya, with me. The rest of you return to your training. Absolutely nobody is to speak of this to anyone until you hear otherwise. Am I understood?" After he'd gotten a chorus of confirmations and nods, Aizawa turned and led the way. All the three of them could do was follow, glancing at each other without having any answers to offer. The trio was sat down in Recovery Girl's office while Aizawa went to fetch the nurse. Katsuki and Shadow were side by side on the exam bench while Izuku sat across from them, mumbling under his breath. While they were waiting, they decided to conduct a quick test to confirm the condition. Katsuki also tested his explosions and found he was able to trigger them separately from the fire. He could also trigger both at once. Meanwhile, Shadow confirmed once again ice was now coming from both sides. Izuku had retrieved his notebook and was frantically scribbling in it. "When did you start feeling cold again?" "This morning. Actually, I remember feeling a little cold when I was falling asleep last night. I didn't notice it as much then." Katsuki was warm enough to drive it away. "Kaken, do you remember anything strange last night?" He thought the night over carefully. Shadow was pretty upset last night. His fire caused a panic attack. "I remember wishing I could do something about it. That still shouldn't have caused this shit. We weren't hit by any quirks, let alone something capable of transferring someone's quirk." Something Katsuki said must have turned gears in Izuku's head because he went stock still. Then he madly flipped through his journal until he reached a recent page which he quickly reviewed. Green eyes looked back up at Katsuki with something between awe and fear. Before Katsuki could question him, he spoke. "I think I have an idea. I mean, it'd be an insane long shot, but Shadow was tired this morning and it would explain why Izuku cut himself off." Refocusing on the situation. "Okay, Kaken, put your hand on Shadow's arm and try to give the fire back." "What the fuck do you mean by that?" "I don't want to burn him." "No, just," Izuku huffed a sigh. "Just try to give his quirk back. Like, think about it really hard." That still didn't make any fucking sense, but Katsuki rolled his eyes and grabbed Shadow's arm anyways. Oddly enough, when he made contact, there was a connection. It was the same sensation that he'd been feeling all day when someone touched him, of potential. Now that he was trying to do something, it seemed to expand, becoming more solid and forming a path of some kind. Brow furrowed in confusion, Katsuki felt around the connection mentally. He could give something or take something. It felt like he had two options as to what to give. One thing he could take. Closing his eyes, he tried his best to focus on his options for giving. They weren't particularly different, both felt warm, but one felt more sudden, explosive. Not that one, the other then. He took the less sudden one and pushed it into the connection. Aizawa returned to the room just in time to see the glow travel from Katsuki to Shadow. The transfer almost knocked Shadow out, but when Katsuki released him, he managed to lift up his left hand. All of them already knew what would happen, but seeing the fire flicker in Shadow's palm made it real. Well, shit. He looked up to his teacher with helpless eyes. Katsuki had no fucking idea what the hell he was supposed to do here. His teacher pulled the black sleeve of his hero costume and held his arm out to Katsuki. The directions were clear, but Katsuki desperately wanted to not follow them. Life didn't seem to fucking care about what he wanted though. So, Katsuki reached out and touched his teacher's arm, feeling that connection again. It was easier this time. Now he had a sense of what he was doing. He was able to pull the numb feeling energy from Aizawa with ease. Katsuki was fucking terrified by how easy it was. How quick. No more than a second or two passed before he released Aizawa and turned to Shadow, who still had fire flickering in his hand. With a bit of concentration, Katsuki put out the flame. He could feel his hair stand on end, and energy crackling around him. A distant part of him wondered if his eyes changed color or if they stayed red. Releasing erasure, almost in a panic at the implications of this revelation, Katsuki twisted back to grab his teacher's arm, shoving the quirk back to him. He needed it gone more than he'd needed anything else in his life. The air had been stolen from his lungs. Tar was filling them again. Izuku reached for him, Awful, awful pity in his eyes. Violently, Katsuki threw himself backwards, the mere thought of touching his boyfriend sending him spiraling deeper into his panic. The idea of taking Izuku's quirk, of stealing that from him, after everything. Katsuki couldn't handle it. Actually, fuck that, Katsuki couldn't handle any of this shit. Not after 2 months of being locked away. 2 months of not touching another human being. 2 months of nightmares, fear, and shame. Villains he could face down. Pain he could take. Anger, hatred, disgust. Katsuki would fucking look All For One in the eyes he didn't have anymore and call him a weak bitch without a second of hesitation if given half a chance. The only thing Katsuki had ever really feared was himself, and now that fear was smacking him upside the head, his only saving grace was how he panicked. It was a hard lesson he'd learned as a child. He couldn't panic like Izuku could, like most other children could. If he lost his shit, his quirk went out of control, and people got hurt. So when he was really upset, well and truly lost for what to do, Katsuki shut down. Everything got louder and louder until he couldn't hear anything at all. While his eyes still worked, he wasn't able to process what was in front of him. Instinct overtook him. Aizawa was saying something, and Katsuki was nodding. His boyfriends were leaving, worried eyes following him. With his body moving on autopilot, he followed his teacher as they walked to a location he didn't know. A childish part of him wanted to ask, why him? Wanted to say this was too much. This was unfair. It wasn't though. It was perfectly fair. He knew damn well that he deserved whatever shit life threw at him. Would his boyfriends hate him after this? It was entirely possible. They might not want to go near him. Might not want to ever touch him again. Not like he could blame them. Katsuki already didn't understand why they put up with his bullshit. This could easily be the straw that broke the camel's back. What finally made them realize they were better off without him dragging them down. Oh, he was supposed to sit down. Aizawa was guiding him gently towards a chair. Slowly his visual processing chugged back to life and he realized he must be in the teacher's lounge. Neat. Maybe they were going to expel him. The amount of shit he'd caused for the school was more than worthy of an expulsion. This was the cherry on top. Taking in the expressions around him though, nobody seemed angry. Upset, for sure. Nervous, disbelieving, worried. Check, check and check. Not angry, even though they really should be. Nobody was looking at him either. All eyes were on Aizawa as he explained the situation. Katsuki took in a deep breath. As much as he would love to keep wallowing in his panic, that wasn't a fucking option. He needed to figure out how the hell he was dealing with this, and he needed to do it now. If he stayed unresponsive for too long or spazzed out, they'd lock him up without question. 2 more deep breaths as he worked to get control over himself again. This was fine. Well, alright, that was bullshit. This was not fine. It was manageable. Much better. The quirk transfer only worked through physical contact. Physical contact could be limited or eliminated entirely. They made shit for people with unsavory contact quirks. Hell, since he usually had his gloves on anyways, he could just add light sleeves to his hero costume and he'd be good to go. While he wasn't 100% on it, he was pretty sure it's a voluntarily triggered quirk too. That helped a lot. He may not have meant to take Shadow's quirk, but the general idea had still been his. Now that he knew about it, it'd be way easier to keep under wraps. All he needed to do was not use it. Pretend it wasn't there. Easy. Life could go back to normal and they never needed to talk about this again. Katsuki may only have 2 methods of solving problems. Blow it up or ignore it, but they hadn't failed him yet, and today was no exception. Slowly, he managed to start focusing on the words being said around him. His teachers had started talking over his head. From the side look Aizawa was giving him, it was probably to give him time to calm down. Had Katsuki mentioned that Aizawa was his favorite teacher ever? No force on earth would ever get him to admit it out loud, but the man was a saint in disguise. If there was anyone Katsuki could trust to help him figure this shit out, it was him. Midnight and Mike were going back and forth to his left. At some point, Snipe had joined them, with Cement Toss standing off to the side. It seemed most of the staff was getting called in to help handle this situation. His hearing fully tuned and just in time to catch Mike finishing up a long-winded spiel. Obviously, it'll have to be done carefully, since we don't know if there are negative effects from repetitive or long-term use, but assuming nothing comes up, he should be fine to use it just like any other quirk for training. There's no need for additional rules. I'd have to disagree. Don't you think it would be unfair to the other students? We also don't have any regulations that specifically require a quirk be returned, so even if Bakugo wouldn't keep one, we should still clarify the policy. We gotta remember, these kids are training for fightin' real villains, and the bad guys have had this power for ages and ages. Ain't bout fair, it's bout giving them realistic experience. They need to learn ways around this sort of thing in a safe environment, for they gotta do it for real. Snipe's right. And while we might not have a rule that specifically requires a quirk be returned, training regulations already say students need to release or undo the effects of their quirk after a training session ends. It would fall under that clause regardless. Adding a new rule would be a waste, and it would look very targeted. Our rules are public records, and we don't want to broadcast the wrong message, I suppose. Katsuki felt himself slip from a shocked panic to a confused anger. His mouth was moving before he could think his words through. What the hell are you talking about? All eyes were on him now. Panic surged in his chest because fuck. That was ruder than he'd intended, but his panic was overruled by indignation. Present Mike bounced back first, purposefully relaxing his posture and giving Katsuki a bright smile that usually pissed him off. Today it made him feel a bit safer. His words, on the other hand, well, sorry, wasn't trying to set your ears on fire. We were discussing the implications of your new ability. Nezu will need to make the final call, but odds are it'll be fine to use in training like you would your explosions, so long as you return any quirks afterwards. Man, this was one hell of a way to kick off a new semester. I was worried today was gonna be boring. Aizawa gave a nod, and it seemed like Mike was ready to go off on another spiel before Katsuki recovered enough to speak again. I repeat, what the hell are you talking about? Worried glances were exchanged between his teachers. So Katsuki clarified before Mike could open his mouth again. I mean, what the hell do you mean use in training? I'm not using this shit in training. Fuck, if I can help it then I'm never using it again. Of all of them, only Aizawa didn't look shell-shocked by his declaration. While there was a grimace on his homeroom teacher's face, it was an accepting one. Still, Mike was the one to reply after a few seconds of stunned silence. Do I mean? Pausing, the English teacher collected his thoughts. Bakugo, kiddo, you can't mean that. Sure, that probably wasn't a very fun way to find out you somehow ended up with a new quirk, but it'll get easier as you use it more. Todoroki wasn't hurt, just a bit tired and shocked, that's all. This is an incredible gift. Think of all the potential applications in hero work. You should be excited. Now if Katsuki was asked to name 3 things he hated, his mother and villains aside, he would name the following. Interacting with other human beings. People telling him he didn't mean something because Katsuki fucking Bakugo didn't say shit he didn't mean. People trying to tell him how he should feel. Somehow, Mike had acquired a particularly large hammer and he was hitting all 3 nails on the head simultaneously. Impressive for a man who managed to fuck up IKEA furniture. Through grit teeth, Katsuki snapped back at the other blonde. Usually he wouldn't be talking to an authority figure like this, but Katsuki was too fucking pissed to play nice. I don't give a shit about the possible applications. I've already got a perfectly fucking good quirk. I don't want anyone else's. I'm not a fucking cheater who needs to steal shit to get ahead. And I'm sure as hell not going to become a hero with some dickhead's transfer quirk. I never asked for this. Mike opened his mouth, only to be cut off by a raised hand from Aizawa. The other teachers wore mixed expressions, but deferred to him. Katsuki's shoulders were hunched, his teeth bared and his hands were curled into fists. Wound tight like a coil, barely restrained. Burning red meant dark black coals. And he waited for the words that would either diffuse or make the explosion twice as large. While I understand this is an interesting development, Bakugo is right. He's under no obligation to use the quirk if he's uncomfortable with it. Bakugo's already dealt with quite enough negative media attention and has more than enough unpleasant associations with the League of Villains. As the tension in Katsuki's posture eased, Aizawa addressed him more directly. We will probably need to conduct some tests to determine the triggers and limits of the quirk. Other than that, we won't ask you to use it if you don't want to. Should you change your mind, I'd be happy to discuss training options and quirk application with you, but it's on your terms. With a grimace, Katsuki nodded. Midnight spoke up next, eyes darting between Katsuki and Aizawa. I hate to be the one to say it, but is that really the best option? I mean, with a quirk like this, imagine the amount of good that could be done. Part of being a hero is pushing past what makes you uncomfortable to help others. Shouldn't we be encouraging him to do the most good? Katsuki damn near growled, but Aizawa beat him to it. Black eyes narrowed and his tone grew increasingly formal. No, we will not. Our top priority is looking after the health of our students, and that includes both their mental and physical health. Bakugo has dealt with quite enough trauma for a lifetime, and we will not add to that by unfairly pressuring him into using a quirk he has accidentally ended up with. It was Mike who spoke up next, now looking more thoughtful. I agree with Shouta, and my apologies for how I spoke there, Bakugo. That was unfair of me. However, Midnight does have a point about the amount of good the quirk could do. So, what about a compromise of sorts? A compromise? While he wasn't sure how the fuck there was meant to be a compromise in this situation, Katsuki was willing to hear the guy out. Bakugo, if you don't want the quirk, why not pass it on to someone else who's willing to handle it? He hadn't considered that. Aizawa looked ready to protest, but Katsuki replied first, tone evening and posture loosening as he realized there was a way out. Okay. He paused, realizing the one flaw in this plan. Who? All the teachers fell silent. Right. Asking who should have this sort of power was a fucking complicated question. If the wrong person got it, everyone was fucked. In the end, it was his call. No matter what his teachers recommended, it was on him to make the final choice. Pretty much anyone was going to be more worthy of it than Katsuki, but that didn't mean he should be stupid about who he picked. Katsuki considered his options. The ideal person was someone he could trust, someone uninterested in power, someone who wasn't too well known, so they could keep it under wraps until they had a handle on it, someone who could use an unconventional ability effectively. The answer was obvious, red eyes looking back up to meet black, a question in them. His teacher's face tightened, coming to the same conclusion Katsuki had. Kid, you don't need to make any decisions right now. Won't change anything if I wait. Eyes falling, Katsuki hesitated for a moment before deciding it needed to be said. You're the one I'd want to have it, even if you wanted to pass it on, or something. I'd trust you to make that choice. The room fell silent again, but a different kind of silent. When Katsuki finally gathered his courage to look up, Aizawa's gaze had softened. A particularly large part of him wanted to take it all back and explode because he was not nice and he didn't say sappy shit. That instinct was stopped in its tracks by the scar on his teacher's forehead that reminded him Aizawa gave a shit about his student. Katsuki could put his need to be the toughest guy in the room aside to let him know it hadn't gone unnoticed. There was a final question in that tired stare, and Katsuki nodded. He was sure about this. With a sigh, Aizawa dropped his gaze and rolled his shoulders. Under his breath he mumbled what sounded like this fucking class, which was fair. After a moment, he refocused and made eye contact with Katsuki again. All right, kid, if you're sure about this, I'm willing to hold on to it while we figure this out. Katsuki gave a nod, so Aizawa took a seat next to him on the couch, lifting his arm upwards and offering it to Katsuki. His touch was hesitant. It took a lot to not let his hand shake as he reached upwards to grasp the lifeline. As before, it was more a set of feelings than anything else. Now they were in contact, he could feel Aizawa's erasure and his own explosion, and he felt the ability to move either of them. Neat, but not what he wanted. Feeling around a bit more, his face started to scrunch up, confusion and frustration overtaking him in equal measure. Finally, he yanked his hand away, needing to spark off the collected sweat before he lost control. The tension was back in his shoulders, and his hands curled into frustrated fists as he felt all eyes on him. I can't, there's no option to do it. He spat out at last, unsure how to communicate his failure. What's it like when you're using it? Asked Mike, who had shifted into analytical mode. Katsuki bit the inside of his cheek and tried to find the right words. It's like fuck. I dunno, a video game menu. I mean, obviously not exactly. There's no visuals or any shit like that. But like, it feels like that sort of setup. It's only there when I'm looking for it. I can feel my quirk, and I can feel his, and there's an option to move one or the other, but that's it. There's no feeling for the transfer quirk itself. No way for me to move it over. Black eyes narrowed thoughtful before Aizawa spoke, a pillar of calm next to Katsuki's chaotic fear. You said before, when All For One grabbed you and attempted to take your quirk, that you felt the ability to grab hold of something and pull back, right? Describe that feeling again. The memory hadn't faded over the months. If anything, it had grown stronger. Replayed in his mind over and over just like the goop, accompanied by a million what-ifs and a strange feeling he missed something. Katsuki paused. Well, shit. This explained a lot. Okay, putting that in the pile of unhelpful now but good for beating yourself up later, let's focus on the task at hand. It felt like tug of war. He was pulling on something in me, and I was pulling back. When he lost concentration, I fell with whatever we'd been pulling. Reanalyzing that memory, it was easier to pinpoint where the transfer occurred. I think that was when it must have happened. I didn't know what I was doing or what I was grabbing, so I think I somehow grabbed a hold of his quirk too. He looked pretty fucking confused too, so maybe it was a glitch or something. Maybe the quirk can only be taken during a transfer. I looked through the reports of quirk theft, and from what I could tell, All For One usually only took quirks from someone after he defeated them. Between that and the shock of the transfer, it would explain why you were the first one to successfully resist him. Nobody else had thought or had the ability to try before you. You reacted instinctively and it worked, so we'd need to replicate that. Maybe try taking Shouta's quirk again. This time, Shouta will just need to do the same thing you did, grab and pull. That seemed like a good plan, so after taking a few deep breaths to calm down, Katsuki gave it a shot. It didn't work. At first he tried pulling gently at Aizawa's quirk, but then when Aizawa finally figured out how to pull back, it broke the connection entirely. They determined the problem was that Katsuki wasn't establishing a strong enough connection, but when he pulled harder he ended up taking erasure. 2 hours went by like that before they gave up. Each of his teachers tried it with him, and none of them came close to being able to pull back against him. This was some sword in the stone type shit. At least he ended up learning some shit about the quirk during the trials. Most importantly, he discovered he could put quirks on hold in the back of his mind to await activation. That didn't mean shit for emitter type quirks, but it was handy as fuck for mutation quirks. Less importantly, He realized he didn't need to be in contact with someone to know what their quirk was. At about 7 feet away, he could get a strong sense of their quirk. No specifics, but enough to tell what kind it was and roughly what it did. People gave off certain vibes. Beyond that, Katsuki learned he fucking hated this stupid quirk, and not much else. All of the trials had left Katsuki exhausted, so Mike and Aizawa escorted him back to the dorms for safety or whatever the fuck. The moment he stepped in the door, he was swarmed. Thank fuck for Mike's quirk, because he got everyone's attention and put a stop to that real fucking quick. The entire class was informed that they weren't entirely sure what was going on, but they were supposed to leave Katsuki alone and not tell anyone else. Obviously, none of them were going to actually listen to that, but it was enough for Katsuki to get back to his dorm room unharassed, which was all he could ask for right now. For one blissful hour he was left alone. Then his boyfriends showed up. Katsuki seriously considered telling them to go away. They'd listen if he said he needed time, but they brought food with them. Not to mention he was still feeling pretty fucking guilty for all the shit he'd put them through today. Neither of them tried to touch him. Cautious movements he knew rationally were out of respect for his space, but which fed that nasty voice in the back of his mind. They were trying to play the pretend nothing's wrong game too, which didn't help anything. Izuku broke first. All Might heard about what happened, because Izuku told him without asking you. He says he hopes you're okay. And he wasn't aware that this was something that could happen. He knows what a monster you really are now. And he suggested a test. There's All For One had a limit on his ability. If the limit's still there, we would know whether it really is his quirk or if it's a copy somehow. Did you become the monster, or are you just following in his footsteps? What do you need me to do? Katsuki asked, instead of voicing the thoughts screaming in his head. Green eyes lit up with excitement and nerves. A smile meant to calm him on Izuku's face. So this was going to suck then. Well, it's super easy. You just need to try to take my quirk. Dead silence. The look Katsuki leveled Izuku with said all he could never hope to verbalize. Even Shadow looked uncomfortable with the idea. Quickly, Izuku started babbling reassurances. It's okay. If we're right and it really is All For One's quirk, you won't be able to take it. Even if you can, it's totally fine. I trust you with it. He shouldn't, screamed that awful voice which was usually right. With a sigh, Katsuki ignored the voice and gestured for Izuku to come closer. Let's get this over with. There was a flurry of gangly limbs and green hair. And then Izuku was squirming to get comfortable in his lap. After a few seconds of spluttering, Katsuki managed to glare at that unabashedly happy face. You know I only need minimal skin contact for this shit, right? Yep, Izuku replied, pressing his face into Katsuki's shoulder and settling down, clearly having no intentions of leaving his angry boyfriend's lap anytime soon. It shouldn't have made Katsuki feel fuzzy, and yet he found himself pressing his face into that green mop of hair to hide a smile. Reaching up with one hand, Katsuki delicately put one palm on Izuku's shoulder. The other didn't flinch or even tense up. If anything, he wiggled into the contact. God, Izuku's complete lack of self-preservation instincts was going to get one of them killed one of these days. Probably Katsuki, from his damn heart exploding. Focusing, Katsuki reached out to feel Izuku's quirk. That was the last thing he could remember before blacking out. Red eyes fluttered open, and right away Katsuki could tell he wasn't in the real world. For one, the floor he was currently staring at had no detail to it. For two, there were like 8 people peering at him who hadn't been there before. The closest one of them had a skinny frame and light shaggy hair that made Katsuki jump back before he could control himself. He reached for his explosions only to realize it wasn't Mr. McHandface in front of him. They did look alike though. Mount Handface smiled at Katsuki kindly, making him feel at ease against common sense. Sorry about that. I didn't mean for this to be quite so sudden, but I needed to speak with you to be sure. Sure about what, fucker? There was Katsuki's anger. Welcome back. It's been like a whole 3 minutes since they'd last seen each other. The other gave a soft laugh before replying, even as the others around him looked unsure. Sure, my brother's quirk truly had been passed on, and that you were not the sort to repeat his mistakes. It appears both are true. Well, that explained absolutely nothing and brought up a fuckton of new questions. The image in front of Katsuki's eyes blurred for a second, and he realized he didn't have long here. Right, focus on important shit. Wait, so I really got All For One's fucking quirk? How do I get rid of it? The man in front of him startled at his questions, as did the other weirdos around him. He glanced to them before his eyes resettled on Katsuki and softened. You did. My brother's quirk opens a transfer pathway, but it does not allow him to take a quirk unchallenged. Instead, it comes down to the force of a person's will. He was forceful, collected, and had near unbreakable willpower. Nobody before you had a strong enough will to put up a fight. Your determination won out when he lost focus, and by accident you took the pathway as you reclaimed your own quirk. Great, how do I get rid of it? Again, a confused look. The quirk cannot be passed on like our own. It can only be taken by force, when both sides are fighting with all they have and the pathway is completely open. If you were trying to get rid of it, it would never open to that point. It is a quirk that may only be passed from enemy to enemy through fierce battle. The world wobbled again, but Katsuki glared at the person in front of him regardless. Several long seconds ticked by. Is this God's way of fucking with me for something specific I did? Or is it more of a general fuck you for everything? Concern overtook the person in front of him, but the world was gone before they could say anything else. Katsuki felt himself being yanked away, back into the void. When he woke up, it was 2 a.m. He was in the infirmary. Staring at the ceiling, Katsuki wondered if he should wake up his boyfriends who were asleep on one of the beds next to him. No, probably not. Katsuki went back to sleep instead. Because this was going to be an emotionally draining clusterfuck no matter what he did. It might as well be an emotionally draining clusterfuck at a reasonable hour. Could you describe the other people around the man you saw? I didn't get a great look at them. The clearest one was a black-haired woman with a mole. Looked a lot like Nana Shimura. So she was a previous bearer of One for All, right? Katsuki had gotten the whole One for All situation explained to him. He'd been able to guess most of it. Neither All Might or Izuku were particularly subtle and both were absolute shit at lying. Yes, she was. Nana was my mentor and the one who passed One for All to me. From his seat next to All Might's bedside, Katsuki could see the range of emotions playing across his hero's face. Nostalgia and worry danced in equal measure across his hollow features. The two of them were alone in the hospital room together. All Might wasn't confined to the hospital, but he was here more days than not. More tests, more treatments. His true form had always looked gaunt, but he looked more bone than skin these days. It was hard for Katsuki to look at him, guilt anchoring him to the bottom of a sea of nasty thoughts, even as he tried to put on a brave face. Both their smiles were getting more and more strained as the days slipped by. Izuku visited every day, even during the summer and school days. Most days Shadow went with him. As much as Katsuki wished he could too. He hadn't been allowed out of his house during the summer and now he wasn't allowed outside of school grounds without an escort. Besides, it wasn't like All Might wanted to see him of all people. What sort of person would want their murder by their side as they died? He was already so fucking selfish. There was no need for him to waste people's time and put that burden on All Might. Even now, Katsuki's eyes stayed on the floor, having trouble looking at the man beyond quick glances. Today, Aizawa and Present Mike brought him over so he could speak to the hero after the incident. Nobody else had any answers, and unfortunately Katsuki needed help with this shit. Then the one who spoke to you must have indeed been the first One for All user. Odd to think a piece of one's soul is carried on with the One for All quirk. Well, Izuku will see All Might there in a few months. Or did you somehow manage to fuck that up for them too? Unhelpful, but thanks for that extra thing to feel guilty about. Voice in his head. Guess he'd be a reliable source for information on this shit if he's All for One's brother. A beat of silence passed between them. To get all this straight, I somehow got a villain's quirk by accident, which lets me move other people's shitty quirks around. I can't get rid of it unless someone manages to out-willpower me. And that person has to be someone I'm trying to steal a quirk from. Oh, and I have to hate them like I mean it. That would seem to be the logical conclusion here, yes. All Might's voice was filled with sympathy, and it made Katsuki want to scream at him. Of all the fucking people in the world who didn't want or deserve All Might's sympathy, Katsuki was right near the top of that list. Maybe All for One would have a leg up on him. Maybe. He couldn't handle that shit. What's the actual name of his quirk? Like, we call the guy All for One, but we've been calling it his quirk. Technically speaking, both the man and his quirk are referred to as All for One. Whose dumb idea was that? It was the pettiest detail of this whole shitstorm. And realistically it was the last thing Katsuki should be worrying about, but it was one of the very few things that should have been under the hero's control. Yet they picked the same shitty names, for what? To confuse everyone. With a light chuckle, All Might gave him a soft smile, shrugging his shoulders as he glanced out the window, taking in the afternoon bustle of the city. Our policy is to refer to villains and their quirks by the names they give themselves unless they're particularly misleading or inappropriate. All for One selected both names. A thoughtful pause. Sunken eyes turned to Katsuki, staring down into his soul. Though, now it is no longer his quirk. You would be welcome to rename it. Fuck if that wasn't a weighted statement and a half. No chance in hell was Katsuki letting that bastard get the quirk back. But that didn't mean he considered this shit his either. Still, he detested the idea of calling it All for One. The less reminders of that asshole he had in his life, the better. Anything would be better than that shit. After a few seconds of thought, he reached a decision. Quirk transfer. No need for any dramatic naming nonsense. Then we'll call it that. The comment was oddly weak. Red eyes looked up from the floor tiles properly to scrutinize All Might. After a few seconds, the hero relented. His tone softened and his voice carrying no judgment. Knowing you can't pass it on, have you changed your mind on using it? It was an honest question, some fucking how. This quirk was indirectly responsible for the current state of the man in front of him, and here he was acting like there was no blood staining it. acting like there was no blood on the hands of its new user, acting like Katsuki wasn't just as bad as the one who came before him. Those thoughts were shoved deep down to the bowels of Katsuki's mind. They would resurface to haunt him later, but right now he needed to focus. Whatever he answered, All Might would accept. He wasn't going to pressure Katsuki on this shit. Aizawa wouldn't either. Nezu had already accepted his choice too, even if he seemed unhappy with it. Knowing that he was pretty much stuck with it, Katsuki took a deep breath, put his knee-jerk reaction aside, and thought it through. First and foremost, it wasn't his power. He hated the idea of using it. The very concept of it, stealing others' quirks, made him sick to his stomach. Second, it could be dangerous. If Ragdoll was any indication, forcefully moving quirks around could take someone out of a fight, and they had no idea what the long-term effects of quirk loss were. Third, it opened up a whole new fucking world of legal problems. A quirk like Aizawa's or Monoma's was one thing, both were temporary for one. Erasure didn't fuck with mutations. And again, it only stopped shit during the fight. Copy did work with mutations, but it didn't take anyone else's shit. Meanwhile, quirk transfer was potentially permanent. Heroes were supposed to minimize lasting injuries dealt to villains as much as possible. So how the fuck did taking someone's quirk work with that? What if he took a quirk, gave it back after defeating the villain, and then the person got away or killed someone with the quirk? Could he live with that weighing on him? Whose fucking call was that anyways? Hero licenses legalized quirk use ubiquitously for combat, but this felt like a major fucking gray area. Fourth, what the hell was he even meant to do with other people's quirks if he did take them? Learning new quirks would be a pain and a half, and he had no idea how mutations, quirks, and shit might affect him. Sure, he could put them on hold, but for all he knew they might activate when he lost focus or something. Side effects could compound or fuck with his ability to use his main quirk. There were any number of things that could go wrong. God help him if he got into trying to give stolen quirks to other people. What a shit show that would be. The public would have his head on a platter. Yeah, all things considered, this quirk was more trouble than it was worth. Still, he could see a very limited uses he might be willing to consider. Maybe if he had absolutely no other choice, or if someone's quirk was killing them and he could negate it. All Might waited patiently for Katsuki to collect his thoughts, wasting the precious time he has left waiting you to figure your shit out. Yeah, well, wallowing in self-pity would only waste more of his time, so Katsuki focused on answering the question. I don't want to use it during training, and I don't want. No, I won't use it normally. I'm not going to become the fucking quirk transfer hero or some shit like that. But if there's some situation I can't fix otherwise, and people's lives were at stake, I mean, I'm not going to let people fucking die because I don't like the idea of taking some asshole's quirk away. Or, I guess if a kid's quirk was completely out of control or something. If there's absolutely no other way for me to fix the problem, then I would use it. He could feel All Might's approving smile on him, and for a heartbeat Katsuki felt warmed by it, that awful voice slipping to the back of his mind. The man opened his mouth to respond, but blood came out instead of words, splattering the white sheets. A nurse bustled in right away, several more following, and Katsuki was ushered out of the room. Sometime that evening he got a text from All Might apologizing, as if it was somehow his fault his body was failing him. The following message reassuring Katsuki that he thought he'd made a good choice felt as hollow as the man himself looked. Even with the guilt weighing him down like cement shoes, Katsuki kept swimming. His head was only barely above the water, but fuck it, he was breathing. His teachers accepted his choice without any further issue. They ran a total of 5 tests with him after his visit to All Might. One upperclassman was brought in to try taking the quirk as well. It didn't work. Katsuki overpowered him after a few seconds of struggle, though he got closer than anyone else did. After that, it was about testing his limits. Aizawa quirk did work to halt the transfer. There didn't seem to be any quirks he couldn't take beyond One for All, and once he had an extra quirk he could tell whether or not someone was compatible with it. Some people were really open to new quirks. Some people would shatter if they got one even slightly different from their current one. Yeah, he'd made the right call to not use this shit. That would only end poorly. After he'd finished all 5 tests, he was free to go back to the dorms and forget the quirk existed, or that's what he was trying to do. All of Class 1 had been given a full briefing on the situation to prevent rumors, and so they understood the importance of keeping it under wraps. Their reactions ranged from Aijuru to Mainta. Aijuru was a fucking angel about the entire ordeal. Tuesday night, when Katsuki returned from his visit with All Might, was supposed to be their usual study night. While Aijuru had been respectful of Shoto and Izuku's need to keep an eye on Katsuki, he gently prodded them for his own alone time with Katsuki. In total, he asked 3 questions. Was Katsuki really okay? What happened? What did Katsuki want to do about it? After Katsuki wrapped up his answer to the last one with his intention to pretend it didn't happen, Aijuru nodded, took out his notebook, and asked if he knew how to do the math homework due tomorrow. Since then, Aijuru had done just what Katsuki requested. He pretended it didn't happen. Or, no, No, several of Katsuki's other classmates pretended nothing happened. Ijiru acknowledged what happened, but also acknowledged it didn't change anything and moved on. Unlike everyone else, Ijiru treated him normally and it was a breath of fresh fucking air. In all fairness, Izuku and Shoto were also trying to help in their own ways. They were just bad at it. Izuku was desperately torn between touching Katsuki as much as possible to reassure him he wasn't scared of him, and not touching Katsuki at all for fear of making him uncomfortable or triggering another vision. It left both of them on edge, dancing around each other and neither quite sure what the other wanted. They should really talk this shit out. They weren't going to though. Neither of them had any fucking idea where to start. Shoto, at the very least, knew what he wanted. The problem was he went overboard. Any chance he got, Shoto was cuddled up with Katsuki. Before the other had never been a big fan of PDA, but now he was glued onto Katsuki whenever possible. While it did help settle the fear in Katsuki's stomach that others wouldn't want to touch him again, it was also suffocating. Now that he knew he could transfer quirks, it was hard to not pay attention to it. He could feel the fire and ice dancing under Shoto's skin. There wasn't room for much else. Shoto would be a bad candidate to get another quirk. He didn't want to think about the possibility, but was hard when it was constantly right there. On some level, Katsuki had a sneaking suspicion Shoto was trying to get Katsuki to take his fire quirk. Not on purpose, his boyfriend wouldn't ask that of him, but subconsciously. The two of them had only talked about the new quirk once. Near 1 a.m. on Tuesday night, Izuku curled up on Shoto's left and Katsuki on his right. Pretty hypocritical of me to get mad about you not using your fire. Huh. It's different. The reply was instant. Shoto must have thought out this conversation already. My fire was mine from birth. Up until this whole mess there was no getting rid of it. Not using it actively put myself and others in danger, and honestly it wasn't as unpleasant. That was true. Katsuki knew how fucked up his boyfriend's temperature regulation could get when he didn't use both halves of his quirk. You've got a new quirk thrust on you against your will, which you only discovered a day ago, and you've got valid reasons to not use it. Sketchy legality, potential health effects, and a number of other risk factors, each of which would be a fine reason on their own, let alone put together. It's not a fair comparison. We both got them from monsters. Both our monsters tried to shape us into their image. It's not that different. Katsuki ignored the voice in the back of his mind and nodded. The room they were in was near pitch black, but Shoto could feel the nod against his shoulder. There wasn't much else for him to say. All in all, as much as his boyfriends set him on edge, their willingness to try helped quite a bit. The rest of their classmates were also mostly tolerable. His personal collection of idiots tried to follow Ijiru's lead. While they gained a newfound respect for Katsuki's personal space, it was exactly that, respect. None of them flinched back out of fear. They just weren't as quick to touch him when he'd already growled at them to fuck off. Nina and Denki spent 5 minutes complaining about how of course Katsuki would get an amazing power and not want it, only to promptly drop the topic at Ijiru's warning glare. Neither of them brought it up again. Hanta made a grand total of 3 teasing remarks, and honestly they were all fair, so Katsuki only blasted him for the last one. Nothing out of place for their group. Some of his classmates got a bit more flinchy. Not that Katsuki had ever been touchy-feely with anyone, but he still noticed how certain students drew back from his presence more so than before. Oddly enough, Toru was the second worst one, going out of her way to steer clear of Katsuki. She'd already apologized for it twice, being sure to add that it's not that she thinks he would. It's the could that bothers her. It still stung when she quietly requested a different partner for CPR training. Even though Shoto was more than happy to trade places with her, Katsuki knew her fear was perfectly valid. He didn't blame her for it in the least, but it dug into his heart all the same. Whatever, he'd get over it. And then there was fucking Maita. Their whole class had been told to keep their damn mouths shut about the new quirk. Since Katsuki was applying for a provisional license, Aizawa legally had to alert the Hero Commission to the change by Sunday. Luckily, Katsuki's records had already been sealed for his safety after the kidnapping, so it wouldn't be public information. The media had no way of learning about the change, which meant the only people who knew Katsuki's secret should have been Class 1A, his teachers, that one upperclassman, and the Hero Commission. Maybe if karma wasn't coming for him, Katsuki might have actually been able to move on with his life and pretend this never happened. Karma did come though, in the form of the grape-haired asshole. Maita made his fear of Katsuki very apparent. The first day it was whispers to the more fearful WANA students, the ones who wouldn't talk shit about Katsuki, but who would stay quiet while someone else did. After that, it was refusing to spar with Katsuki in training Wednesday morning. Aizawa forced him to anyways, but the entire match was Maita running like a coward. Whispered comments changed from what a scary power to maybe it suits him. By afternoon, the dickhead worked up the nerve to inform Katsuki of his disapproval directly. Let it be said, Maita was the best and worst person to start shit with Katsuki over his new quirk. The best, because Katsuki gave absolutely zero fucks about what that asshole thought of him. If anything, he would much rather Minta hate him. It let him know he was doing something right. The worst, because as much as he hated Minta, thought the guy was the scum of the earth and knew his opinion was absolutely worthless, the shitlord was only saying what Katsuki already knew. Losing the moral high ground to someone as shitty as that hurt. Having to listen to someone like that talk shit about you and not being able to fight back because you know they're right got under his skin. It was just a stupid comment during a training session on Wednesday. It shouldn't have gotten to him this badly. He'd been on the opposing team, having cornered Minta after the fucker had been going after Momo, disguising his attempted groping as combat. It was supposed to be a good moment. It really, honestly was. Nothing was more satisfying than blasting Minta right in the face, other than the rare opportunities he'd had to take down real villains. He could unleash his explosions without a trace of guilt or restraint. That was how it should have gone anyways. But when Katsuki reached for Minta with his manic battle grin in place, the asshole decided to launch those stupid balls at him and shout, "You're not getting my quirk. Not today, villain." Last semester, it had been normal for the entire class to jokingly call each other villains over anything, from training sessions to posting a dumb meme in the group chat. They all knew nobody meant it, or almost nobody meant it. Everyone had completely dropped the habit since the kidnapping. Another one of the little changes that reminded Katsuki he didn't belong here anymore. Not that he ever really did. In any case, most of the class had stopped, meaning it had been quite a while since someone called Katsuki a villain to his face. It was also the first time someone had said what everyone else must be thinking, that Katsuki would steal everyone else's quirks if they didn't protect themselves from him. That he was no different from the monster he'd gotten this stupid fucking quirk from. Katsuki flinched back, now unwilling to touch the grape fucker. The other saw the opening and tried to take it, but thankfully Katsuki's combat skills hadn't abandoned him. The AP shot to Minta's chest should have been satisfying, but all Katsuki could feel was a painful tightness in his chest. Nausea burned his throat as he was forced to again remember he would never be normal again, never be able to touch someone without that faint sensation, the restless feeling of being able to take. Minta was down, so Katsuki spun on his heel and went to rejoin his partner. His pace was slower than what it should have been. They had almost won anyways. It was fine. He could take his time. Momo would be fine without him. She's better off with you far away. Everyone is. Their team returned victorious, and no more than a few seconds passed before Katsuki could feel concerned green eyes boring into him. Luckily, it was time for Izuku's match, so there was no time for his boyfriend to interrogate him. Shoto was busy preparing for his own matchup, leaving Katsuki in the clear for at least the next 15 minutes. It only took 5 for him to come up with a plan. The moment Izuku got back, he'd make a big deal out of this shit, and he wouldn't stop until he figured out what had Katsuki so upset. Then it'd be a big deal and they'd waste their time trying to make him feel better for shit he absolutely deserved. He didn't want to deal with that right now. Besides, he'd taken a few hard blows during that match, so he had the perfect excuse. "I'm going to go see Recovery Girl. I think I bruised a rib." Aizawa's concerned gaze was on him instantly, picking him apart down to his soul. It was rare for Katsuki to leave heroics training early for healing, but he had done it before. Unlike a certain green-haired martyr, Katsuki knew his damn limits and knew to get himself patched up before his injuries got dangerous. After bearing that black gaze and feeling uncomfortably exposed for several long seconds, he got a nod of approval. "Excellent. Go ahead. Good job keeping on top of your injuries. Will you be returning to class afterwards?" "Nah, I'm already pretty tired. I don't think I'll be able to stay awake after healing." That got his teacher's eyes back on him, looking a little more closely. Shit, Katsuki couldn't tell him he was tired because of stupid fucking nightmares keeping him up last night. "Okay, can't lie, but need a better reason than that shit. I pushed myself during my morning training. It's not a big deal, I'm just tired." Lame excuse, maybe, but it was true. He had done nearly double his normal morning workout because he'd been unable to sleep. Aizawa didn't need to know the second part. For a moment, Katsuki was sure he wasn't going to get away with that explanation. A resounding crash from the battlefield saved him just as Aizawa was opening his mouth. His teacher's focus flickered back to the match and Katsuki was waved off. Fuck yes. Without waiting, Katsuki made a beeline towards Recovery Girl's office, ignoring Shoto and Ijiru's concerned gazes as he went. He'd been hoping to get himself patched up, drag his ass back to the dorms, and pass the fuck out. Well, okay, he still got to do that, but there was a slight hiccup in his plan. As it so happened, Minta had finished getting patched up when Katsuki arrived. When the purple bastard stepped out from the office, Katsuki a few paces down the hall and their gaze locked. Katsuki's eyes narrowed to dangerous points. Usually, Minta would cower out of his way, but today he'd finally grown a little bit of a spine. Maybe it was the realization he'd finally found something to hurt Katsuki with. Whatever, Katsuki didn't give a fuck. He was here to get healed and leave. To that end, he tried to stride past Minta, only to have the other jump out of his path with an exaggerated yelp. Boy, I don't want you near me. You'll steal my quirk too. Alright, that was fucking it. As if I'd want a pathetic ass quirk like yours. I like having decent fucking hair. And you're the last asshole who gets to complain about personal fucking space. The other was probably trying to yell something back at him, almost certainly offended by the hair comment. But Katsuki tuned him out as he pushed his way into Recovery Girl's office. There was no way she hadn't heard Katsuki's insult. Thankfully, she was well aware of how much of a dickhead Minda was, so she let his outburst slide. In fact, she didn't say anything as she patched him up, beyond a warning to be more careful next time. He rolled his eyes even as he nodded, and finally he was cleared to return to the dorms. Healing had taken more out of him than he thought it would. By the time he stumbled into the common room, Katsuki felt ready to fall asleep on the damn couch. Somehow, he dragged himself up the stairs to his room anyways, passing out the moment his head hit the pillow. In his exhaustion, Katsuki forgot to lock his door. Despite the panic that overtook him when he woke up and realized he'd forgotten, it wasn't actually a big deal. Shadow and Izuku did let themselves in, but they only did so to join him for an afternoon nap. He'd been expecting them to question him about earlier in the day. Both of them had apparently concluded his foul mood was because of his injury. Thank fucking God, because he didn't want to deal with them going after Minda too. Honestly, despite its rough start, Wednesday evening was quite pleasant. Dinner was nice. Katsuki cooked for the rest of the dorm since he was in a good enough mood after his nap. His classmates appreciated it, and he sat with Momo as they reviewed Aizawa's feedback on their match earlier in the day. Minda must have been spooked by him earlier, since he didn't even make an appearance. That night, Katsuki was left tired and sore enough to justify curling up with both his boyfriends again. Aizawa didn't give them shit for not being in their own rooms after curfew, even though it was the third time that week. Katsuki was too damn tired to even dream, so his sleep was blissfully peaceful. Normally, such a good evening would put Katsuki in a good mood the next day. Yet Thursday morning he woke up with dread curling in the pit of his stomach. He still had 3 days until the Hero Commission was supposed to find out about his new bullshit quirk. They weren't going anywhere for training, so today was a stupid day for an attack. Both Katsuki's boyfriends were okay. His morning workout felt good, and breakfast tasted just fine. Thursday wasn't usually a homework-heavy or project assignment day. He'd triple-checked and all his homework was already done and ready to be turned in. Something felt wrong regardless, like it was looming over him. It had him on edge, trying to figure out what had gone wrong. Good news, it didn't take him long to figure out what it was. In fact, as soon as Katsuki entered the bustling hallways with Aijuru on one side and Sparky on the other, he got a pretty good fucking sense of what was happening. Bad news, everyone knew. The moment he entered school, all eyes were on him. People turned and started to whisper. His hearing was shit, so he couldn't make out what they were saying. But from how people shifted, careful to avoid even the risk of contact, it wasn't hard to fucking guess. Aijuru looked like he wanted to say something, but Katsuki was not having it. One hand went to each idiot beside him, snagging their sleeves so he could drag them through the hallways to their classroom. Behind him, the rest of the idiot squad and his now very worried boyfriends followed them closely. He refused to talk about it, refused to acknowledge the issue. So what if everyone fucking knew? People were going to find out eventually. It didn't fucking matter. It didn't. Lunch changed that. The teachers hadn't caught on to the leak yet, although he was 99% sure they would figure out on their own. He sure as fuck wasn't going to bring it up. When Katsuki went to lunch, it only became more apparent that the whole school had somehow found out about what happened. All eyes were on him. People cleared out of his fucking way. And no matter how his class tried to surround him, to pretend there was nothing wrong, it was a matter of time before someone started shit. It was some dickhead from the general course who said what everyone else was thinking. Katsuki had never seen the guy before in his life. He had no idea who he was, or who the guy thought he was. If he had to guess, it looked like someone who hadn't made the cut for the heroics course. Not like Shinsu, who had actual talent and was unfairly overlooked. But like a rich boy whose daddy hadn't been able to bribe a seat for his kid. So is it true? The sneered word came from behind him, and Katsuki thought about turning around. But there was no fucking reason to. His focus stayed firmly on eating his food. No matter how sick to his stomach he felt. Seconds ticked by, his classmates frozen around him. Don't ignore me. We have a right to know if there's a quirk-stealing monster hiding in our midst. Katsuki didn't want to let the words get to him. It shouldn't mean anything. It didn't mean anything. The asshole was just looking for a fight. And he wasn't going to get it. Not fucking today. His classmates seemed unsure, but willing to follow his lead and not give the dickhead any satisfaction. I knew it. You really did become a quirk thief after those villains whisked you off. Okay, the quirk thief comment was bothering him a little. The use of the word whisked to describe being violently kidnapped was pissing him right the fuck off. He'd been about to spin around, about to get up and fucking fight whatever dickhead thought he had the right to talk shit here. And he was pretty sure that his classmates were ready to do the same. Only, all of them were beaten to it. What the hell is wrong with you? That got Katsuki to look up in shock. Never did he think he'd see the day that fucking Monoma of all people was defending him, but Katsuki was quickly learning his life was fucking weird. Copycat didn't seem deterred by people's shocked gazes. He was right up in that dickhead's face. For once, Kendo wasn't holding him back. He was kidnapped. Kidnapped by a number of powerful and dangerous villains. I don't know how he ended up getting a new quirk from it, if he actually did, but I do know I'd much rather he have it than the villain who nearly killed All Might. Or do you like dangerous villains having the ability to steal other people's quirks? The dickhead was left stunned by that, lips flapping and eyes bulging. Not only that, but he hasn't done anything. You can't harass him just because he could maybe take someone's quirk. Literally out of everyone in this damn school, Bakugo is the last person who steals someone's quirks. Did you miss the entire sports festival where he refused first place because he didn't think he earned it fairly? Monoma was going red in the face now, angry, defensive, and righteous. The other kid had yet to find a response, so Monoma kept up his rant. So you can fuck right the hell off with that. It's not like anyone would want a shitty quirk like yours anyway. Clearly it wasn't good enough for the heroics course. Nobody needs to drag themselves down with shit like that. Rage contorted the dickhead's face as Monoma's words hit him, and in a moment of stupidity, the asshole actually lunged for the blonde. Thankfully, said dickhead was stopped by a familiar capture weapon and a crackling red gaze. The whole cafeteria froze and all eyes went to Aizawa, who had appeared in the doorway. Bakugo and Monoma, both of you head to the staff room. You may bring your lunches with you. I'll handle things here. Weird that it was both of them, but whatever. Katsuki gave a nod to his classmates, grabbed his lunch and walked purposefully out of the room. Even if he felt like shit, he was keeping his head held fucking high. None of these extras were getting a reaction from him. He was halfway down the hallway before he heard the lunchroom door swing open again. Katsuki expected Monoma to catch up to him or call after him or something, but the other kept an even pace behind him. It wasn't until he reached the door to the staff room that Katsuki paused. Not for long, just a beat or two. Long enough for Monoma to almost reach him. Then he pushed the door open, not bothering to knock since Aizawa had sent them there. While he didn't exactly hold the door open for the other blonde, he did make sure to push it extra wide and keep his hand on it until he was sure Monoma's own had reached out. The other probably noticed, but didn't have a chance to comment. Hello listeners, what brings the two of you in here? Is everything alright? We're fucking fine. Aizawa-sensei sent us in here because some shit went down in the cafeteria. All eyes were on them now, and he could almost feel the raised eyebrows. Right, it was weird for Aizawa to send them to the staff room instead of Hound Dog's office if there was a fight. Secret's out and the whole school knows about my new quirk. Not sure if you lot noticed yet or not. Either way, some dickhead tried to start shit during lunch because of it. I was ignoring him, but Monoma told him off for it. Guy tried to get physical. Aizawa-sensei put a stop to that and sent us here. Dunno why yet. The entire room went tense and silent. Yeah, alright, they hadn't noticed the school had heard. Wasn't like there was much to be done about it now. He'd be shocked if the media hadn't already gotten wind of it, and the villains would definitely know. Mike was the first to recover, his smile now forced and the pep in his voice feeling flat. Well, I suppose that's not great. Any chance you know how word got out? The class won a student with the purple balls on his head, Minta. He stopped by our dorm yesterday evening to speak to a few of the more chatty members of our class. Given how quick he was to move on, I can safely assume we weren't the only class he visited. I heard the rumor shortly after that. Oh, of course it was the grape fucker. Of course, just his fucking luck. Actually, wait, Katsuki was taking that back. Mike's gaze had gone straight up dark in a way Katsuki hadn't seen before. This might be fun after all. Thank you, Monoma. That's very useful information. Why don't the two of you sit down and finish your lunches? I need to have a word with Aizawa. With that, Mike was ducking around them out the door, leaving them with Snipe and Cement Toss at the other end of the staff room. Well, no sense in standing around. Katsuki took a seat on the closest couch, setting his food down on the coffee table. It only took a few seconds for Monoma to follow suit. Silence reigned between them. Picking at his food, Katsuki wondered if he should say something. Probably. What the hell should he say though? He hadn't asked Monoma to defend him. Hell, he'd never even considered Monoma on the list of people stupid enough to speak up for him. The whole situation felt weird, like it had been personal for Monoma somehow. Quirk thief. Maybe. Worth a shot. Guess that asshole hit too close to home for you. Gray eyes went straight to the floor, refusing to look at Katsuki. Yeah, that was it then. It made it easier for Katsuki to accept Monoma standing up for him, knowing it was a projection thing. If the guy was trying to deal with his own issues by proxy, well, more believable than the ridiculous thought that Monoma was actually trying to defend him. This was something Katsuki could understand. Well, whatever the fuck your deal was, I gotta admit it was satisfying as fuck to hear you chew him out. Monoma looked like a goldfish with his eyes wide and mouth gaping. As funny as it was, Katsuki couldn't have him getting the wrong idea here. He needed to bring the asshole levels back up. Just don't make a habit of it. I don't need other people fighting my goddamn battles. And I don't like these extras thinking their bullshit is worth a response. Several long seconds of silence passed as Copycat got himself together, dropping his gaze back to the ground. Never thought I'd see the day I was defending you of all people, but it wasn't fair. I've lived through that. It hit a nerve, and I couldn't not say something. Katsuki gave a nod, understanding and maybe a bit of approval all rolled up into one. Silence again. So, it's true then. You actually got a new quirk from the villain attack. Ugh, why did people have to ask questions about shit that didn't concern them? Stupid human curiosity. Maybe if he told Monoma he'd passed it to the rest of the school so Katsuki didn't have to deal with any more of this shit. Yeah, quirk transfer. Lets me move almost any quirks around. Got it by accident from All For One. I didn't ask for it, I can't get rid of it, and am not using it. We don't know shit about it. Legality on it's sketchy as fuck, and for all I know it could seriously fuck with people's health. Oh, silence. You can't get rid of it. Like I said, I can move almost any quirk. Keyword is almost. The conversation ended there, both of them turning their focus to picking through their food. It took way too long for Aizawa to show up again, mic in tow. Hours had passed by, with teachers coming and going in frazzled states. Nobody had told either of them to go back to class, so they waited for Aizawa to arrive. Katsuki moved on to doing his homework, and Monoma followed his lead. Every so often, Katsuki glanced over to check the other's work. Any mistakes he saw were quietly pointed out with a hint to put Monoma on the right track. It had nothing to do with gratitude. He just didn't like seeing incorrect shit. When Aizawa finally made it to the staff room, his hair was a mess. The bags under his eyes had grown and everything about him screamed exhaustion. It fucking sucked that this was slowly becoming the new normal for him. Katsuki watched his teacher practically collapsed into one of the armchairs, waiting patiently for answers, even as Monoma startled beside him. Right, Vlad King was a lot more energetic, so Copycat wasn't used to this shit. He at least knew enough to stay quiet until Aizawa's black eyes blinked open and focused in on Katsuki. Well, it's as much of a clusterfuck as it can be. Media's gotten wind of it. There's reporters swarming the place, parents are finding out, and I just called the Hero Commission to let them know about the situation. No official statement from them yet, but odds are they'll have something ready by this evening. Yeah, that was about what he'd been expecting. So, since the secret is already out, and Monoma here already got himself involved, we're going to test one last theory before giving up on transferring the quirk. All of 3 seconds ticked by before both he and Monoma realized what Aizawa meant. He hadn't even considered the possibility. Wait, I mean, concerned gray eyes jumped between Aizawa and Katsuki, trying to read their emotions. Do you want to transfer the quirk to someone else? Hell fucking yeah, I do. We've been trying for ages, but nothing worked. There's a stupid fucking clause on the quirk which says I can only transfer it to an enemy. If you can use a copy to move it to Aizawa-sensei though, that'd be a pretty fucking amazing loophole. Monoma seemed hesitant on the idea, which Katsuki could understand. Metaquirks mixing might not turn out great. Katsuki didn't care about the risk. He wanted this shit gone. Holding out an arm, Katsuki raised an eyebrow in challenge. That concern narrowed down to a glare and Monoma took the challenge, grabbing onto Katsuki's wrist with more force than was strictly necessary. Silence. The gray-eyed glare shifted from Katsuki to some point in space, confusion and frustration growing more intense as each second ticked by. So much for that plan. A full minute passed before Monoma finally released Katsuki's arm. His own hand fell down to the couch. He looked like he might actually cry or some shit, shameful defeat painted all over his features. Katsuki still waited for him to choke out the words, to seal his fate. I can't, it's not there. I can't even copy it. Alright, fuck. Copycat was way more upset by this than he should be. Sorry, you don't have to fucking apologize. Comforting was not on Katsuki's list of skills, but what kind of asshole would he be if he said nothing? Fuck. Okay, say something else. This quirk's fucking weird. It's in a category of its own. Not your fault the rules are shitty. Aizawa stood up, moving slowly to Monoma's side. His movements were careful, and his eyes were soft. Bakugu's right. As far as we can tell, this quirk appears to operate on different rules as a function of its existence. It was worth a go, but I wasn't too hopeful it would work out. You've already done quite a bit of good today, and there's no use beating yourself up over a long shot. It took a bit for Aizawa to calm Monoma down fully, while Katsuki sat awkwardly to the side. Once he did, the conversation turned towards the other shit that had gone on. The student who decided to pick a fight in the cafeteria already had several warnings on his record. The final choice is Nezu's, and his homeroom teacher needs to be consulted, but expulsion is likely. As he paused, something between vindication and disgust flitted across Aizawa's face. Katsuki felt hope surging in his chest, even as he tried to stomp it down. Present Mike was able to confirm Minda told the school about your condition. He was on his last warning and has since been expelled. His things are being collected from the dorms now. You shouldn't see him again. Thank you for informing us of his involvement, Monoma. Hell fucking yeah. Knowing that purple bastard was gone almost made the rest of this bullshit worth it. Almost. After a few more questions and a few other minor updates, Monoma was sent back to the dorms. Classes had ended a while ago. Flad King was waiting outside to escort his student back, pausing only to make eye contact with Aizawa, a silent message passing between them as Aizawa shook his head. Giving grim nod in reply, Vlad said about ushering Copycat off. That left Katsuki and Aizawa alone in the staff room. So, what's next? The tired sigh he got in response wasn't a great sign. Well, part of it will depend on the Hero Commission's response. The other part depends on how your parents respond. We haven't had a chance to contact them yet, since protocol says to wait for the Hero Commission's response. I know you were told not to tell anyone else outside the class about your condition, but did you tell them anything? You aren't in any trouble if you did. We just need to know now. Katsuki damn near laughed at the idea. Holy shit, the day he willing told either of his parents about anything was the day hell froze over. He couldn't say that though. Not unless he wanted a lecture on respecting his elders or whatever. Nope, haven't even spoken to them since I figured it out. Actually, now he was thinking about it. Pulling out his phone, he confirmed his suspicions. 26 missed calls, 15 voicemails, and about 1 million texts. Yeah, my mom definitely knows. And she's not happy. Shit, she was going to be a pain and a fucking half to deal with. Aizawa's hand came up to rub at his face, clearly coming to the same conclusion. After biting his lip for a few seconds, Katsuki reached a quick decision. His teacher had been through enough shit today. Don't worry about her. She'll be fucking pissed with me, but she's not going to give the school shit over it. You lot had nothing to do with it. Worst case, she'll demand I drag my ass home for a weekend so she can tear me a new one. If you need approval for some plan or whatever, I'll get her on board with it. Or get my dad to sign it. Whichever. Black eyes narrowed. Katsuki didn't like the look on his teacher's face, a mix of suspicion and concern. It was too fucking close to pity, and he didn't want it. There was no damn reason for pity either. He was getting what was coming to him. Fair and fucking square. Again, Katsuki was saved by an outside force. Aizawa's phone rang before he could question that statement. And Katsuki didn't have to see the caller ID to know who it was. Wait here, this shouldn't take long. Nodding, Katsuki said about answering texts from his classmates. The phone call took 5 minutes and 10 years off Aizawa's life. By this point, the man should be legally considered dead. The Hero Commission was requesting Katsuki's presence tomorrow after classes. Requesting meaning he had no say in the matter whatsoever. You don't have to go, Aizawa said, and Katsuki wished he could believe that. Not a chance in hell he was running from this though. It was the least he deserved. I'll do it. Less shit to deal with down the line if I go now. His teacher nodded, and for a moment they sat in silence, staring down the future looming over them. The school still didn't have a plan in place, not a real one anyways. There wasn't a plan for this shit. What they did have was a list of rules for him to follow. Katsuki was on house arrest. Nobody was calling it that, but they all knew what it was. He couldn't leave the dorms anymore without an escort, even for the walk to and from the fucking school. Before it had only been for leaving school grounds entirely, and now he couldn't even go for his morning jog. Both his boyfriends were barred from staying over in his room. As apologetic as Aizawa was about that shit, they had to follow protocol to the letter. No visitors from outside the school. No talking to anyone outside an approved list about his condition, and his teachers were checking in on him every few hours. When he got back to his room, the first thing he did was call his mother. It was the last thing in the world he wanted to do, but the worst case scenario was her deciding to pull him out of UA. He'd be completely fucked if that happened. And if she thought UA let him hide from her, she'd do it in a fucking heartbeat. Particularly now she had an easy excuse. So Katsuki called his mother, and he spent 3 hours staring lifelessly at the wall as she let him know how badly he'd fucked up. The voice in his head got louder and louder the longer he listened, reminding him of every mistake, every place he could have done better, every flaw he'd never forget. At some point, her voice blended with the one in his head. Maybe they had always been one and the same. Katsuki was too numb to care. The school could do whatever it wanted with him. She didn't give a fuck. After the shit he'd pulled, they could throw him in Taurus for all she cared. Stick him in the cell All For One should be in. Since he'd taken the guy's quirk, he might as well get that too. Aizawa only needed to know the first part, in the form of a signed set of paperwork from his mother and father. The papers were usually used for custody shit, serious family sickness, parent death, or rare situations where parents might be out of contact for long periods. In Katsuki's case, the paperwork was there for emergency use. It gave Aizawa the right to make disciplinary, medical, safety, or basically any other choice without the usual parental consultation. Practically speaking, it meant they could move him to a new location, place whatever restrictions on him, or make calls on medical shit without risking compromising information. He'd only managed to get her to agree to it by pretending he didn't want her to sign it. A few minutes of acting like he thought his teachers were planning to do something to him, and she jumped right on board with the idea. When his mother handed over the forms, she had smiled at Aizawa sweetly. Unlike Katsuki, she was good with people, charming when she wanted to be. It was nothing new. Her words were honey-sweet as they always were with people she wanted to like her. We trust UA with him. You don't cut him slack like his middle school did. You see him for what he really is. My husband and I are glad for all you've done for him, and we're more than happy to make your lives a little easier. Katsuki will keep us updated with what we need to know. Aizawa was disinterested in most people, but he was oddly focused at that meeting. Black eyes watching her every movement, tracking Katsuki's reactions. It put him on edge. There was no reason for Aizawa to be looking this closely. Wasn't she already saying exactly what his teacher wanted to hear? We appreciate your cooperation. We'll do our best to keep you informed regardless of the forms. Though obviously, Katsuki's safety is our top priority right now. It really fucking shouldn't be. And yet, that had been Friday morning. Friday itself passed him by in a daze. None of his teachers called on him. None of them gave him shit for not paying attention. He really should be paying attention. He couldn't afford to fall behind. Despite his best efforts, it was hard to find any motivation, any reason to care. His mind kept being pulled back to the dreaded meeting that evening. Even when he was escorted back to the dorms, back to his room for an hour before they left. They're probably going to put you in jail. It's where you belong, villain. Maybe he did, but it'd cause a media shitshow for them. Oh, they won't call it jail. They'll tell everyone it's for your own safety. People won't pay attention beyond that. His teeth grit together. Just ignore it. I wonder if they'll keep you all alone, locked away and never able to see another person again. Can't risk you using that nasty quirk after all. Solitary confinement was illegal for minors. Maybe you'll get to see your old friend again. The slime villain is still in jail, isn't he? Fucking stop that. Maybe you could even take his quirk. You seem to love becoming what you claim to hate. Fuck off, fuck off, fuck off, fuck off. Or maybe they'll just lock you up in a lab. Cut out the legal part of things. Nobody would go looking for you. Fuck, 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 fuck. Bakugo. Several sharp knocks on his door. Showtime then. I'm coming. Hold your fucking horses. He hadn't changed out of his school uniform. Fuck it. This was fine. Aizawa looked him up and down when he stepped out of the room. Thank fucking God his teacher didn't comment on the lack of dressing up. Come on, the car's waiting. It only took half an hour to get there. When they'd arrived, he'd reached for the car door before Aizawa held up a hand to stop him. Black met red, those eyes looking into his soul. Bakugo, his teacher, paused, then started again. Katsuki, you aren't alone in this. Katsuki didn't have a response to that. I don't know what they want, and I'm not allowed in the room with you, but that doesn't mean you're alone. You don't have to do anything they say, and they don't have any right to you. They may try to get you to think otherwise, but they don't have any legal control here. No crime has been committed. You don't have a license, so they can't ask you to do any missions, and they don't have the right to remove you from UAS custody. No matter what they tell you, they don't have any real power. Even if they threaten withholding a license, we will handle that. Best Jeanist already reached out to offer his support, as have several other major pro-heroes. The commission can't risk any bad publicity right now. He deserved whatever they did to him. Whatever punishment they devised, he'd accept it. This was all his fault. From the multiple media shitstorms to the symbol of peace wasting away in a hospital, Aizawa probably knew he wasn't listening, since he sighed and gave up on the speech. Kid, just promise me you won't sign anything. A nod was the only reply Katsuki could muster. Good enough. It had to be, since they had to get going. Before he knew it, Katsuki was in front of too many fucking people. It wasn't a courtroom, but he was on trial all the same. The commission was in front of him, spread out with too many eyes watching him. The entity of the commission was sitting down, but he had to stand at the center of the room, 10 paces back, just in case. The guards were watching him as closely as the commission itself was, while his memories were hazy. He was pretty sure they'd gone through all the formalities, his responses coming on autopilot. Now it was time to get to the heart of the matter. The report from your teacher says that you acquired a new quirk. Can you confirm that? Yep. Can you tell the commission what quirk you acquired, and how it was acquired? Quirk transfer, formerly known as the All For One quirk. I got it during my confrontation with All For One at the start of the summer. The transfer was accidental. I didn't know what I was doing, and he didn't know either to my knowledge. And for clarity, what does this quirk allow you to do? Transfer quirks with skin-to-skin contact. I don't know that much about how it works, but hypothetically it lets me take almost any quirk. I can then keep that quirk and use it or give it to someone else. I can replace quirks after I take them. Moving a quirk from one person to another can be dangerous if their body is unable to handle the new quirk. Right now, taking someone's quirk while they're willing and replacing it doesn't appear to harm them, but it does tire them out. When did you discover this new quirk? Monday. I accidentally initiated a quirk transfer Sunday evening, but we didn't see the effects until training the next day. I was able to reverse the transfer without about issue 10 minutes after we figured out the quirk was gone. There was muttering between the commission members. Why did it take you so long to discover the new quirk? If the transfers can be initiated accidentally. Shit, he'd hoped they wouldn't ask about that. Okay, not a problem. Don't lie, just tell the right truth. Due to the kidnapping, I didn't have much contact with others over the summer. There were very few times the transfer could have happened, and nothing to trigger it. The accidental transfer only happened because the other person was having trouble controlling their quirk, and I was attempting to help them. I didn't know I had the ability to take their quirk, but I wanted to do something in the situation. Hence the accidental trigger. More muttering. They seemed to accept his answer, but he could feel questions lingering. Can you demonstrate the quirk for the commission? Katsuki's eyes narrowed, and he stared at the commission for a long moment, trying to puzzle out what the fuck they meant by that. The demonstration request he'd been kinda expecting. Gotta see it to believe it after all. But he was standing in a room, at least 10 feet away from any other human beings, and he wasn't going to walk up to some fucking rando and fuck with their quirk. After damn near a full minute of his confused stare, someone in the commission finally realized the flaw in their request. The chairman flustered when that person finally leaned over to whisper into his ear. Sorry. Hold on a moment please. The commission muttered amongst itself again, before a guard stepped forward from her post. Of all the guards, she was the only one who hadn't been glaring Katsuki down since he stepped in. Her posture was relaxed, even as all eyes turned to her. I could help out, if the commission is all right with it. She got a nod of approval, and crossed the wide floor to stand next to Katsuki, rolling up her sleeve for him. Unlike everyone else in the room, she seemed comfortable near him. As she held out her arm, she even gave him a bright smile. It made him nervous, how trusting she was. Foolish. You sure? He needed to hear it. Needed to know he wasn't stealing. Even if he was going to put it back, he refused to steal. Yeah, I'm sure, kiddo. You'll put it back afterwards, so it's no big deal. Okay, right. They're backing out now. Really though, they should do this right. With her standing this close, he could tell it was something to do with Earth, and it wasn't a high-energy quirk. It was concentrated around her hands too. All right, can you demonstrate your quirk first? With her grin intact, she wiggled her fingers, closed her hand and opened it again. A handful of sand slipping out from her grip to fall onto the floor. Katsuki couldn't help but stare. No wonder she didn't mind risking it. Not super useful, I know. Can't even do more than a handful at a time. Whatever, it'd work for this shit. You ready? After getting a nod, he reached out, doing everything in his power to keep his grip from shaking, and ghosted his fingers along her wrist. He hated how easy it was this time. How little time it had taken for him to become used to this. The glow started in his hand, slid up her arm, and back into Katsuki's hand. Pulling back once he had it, he gave the quirk a poke, opening and closing his hand just like she had. Sand fell out of his palm too. There went the muttering again. It was like they thought he couldn't hear them. Whoa. Looking back to the guard, she was opening and closing her hand, a grin still on her face. Reaching out to snag her wrist again was a bit rude, but Katsuki absolutely did not want to hold on to her quirk for longer than he had to. The glow returned, he felt the quirk leave him, and he let go. Air rushed back into his lungs. Done with that shit. All eyes were back on her now, and she opened and closed her hand one last time, sand tumbling out of her palm. The tense silence in the room could be cut with a knife. It felt like it was once the chairman finally gathered himself enough to speak. Thank you. You may take a break if you need one. Even as she yawned, the guard shook her head as she walked back to her post. Nah, I'm good. That was cool though. So now Katsuki was left alone again in the center of the room, with a pile of sand next to him. When had this become his life? The commission went back to talking amongst themselves for what felt like hours before they reached an agreement. He had to wonder if they were going to try and pretend locking him up was for his safety. They didn't need to. Not to him anyways, but he did hate the pretty lies. At best, he hoped they'd let him say goodbye. A selfish part of him wanted to steal one last kiss from the boyfriends he didn't deserve. A last hug from the friends who would be safer without him. Maybe he could even visit All Might, the hero he'd killed, and have his hair ruffled affectionately one last time. They almost certainly wouldn't let him go to the funeral. He didn't deserve to. He could only hope they'd let him say goodbye now. If not, he could probably get a few texts out, or ask Aizawa to take a message. You are currently enrolled in the Heroics course at UA, Class 1A, correct? Okay, weird question they should know the answer to, but whatever. Yep, even with this new development, and with your experience last summer, you still plan on becoming a hero. This felt like a fucking trap, but he wasn't going to lie. Yeah, my plans haven't changed. How do you plan to use your new quirk as a hero? Katsuki's posture tightened at that. Nope, not going down this path. I'm not. I plan to use my original quirk for heroics. If I end up in a situation that I cannot resolve without quirk transfer, I'll do what I have to do, but I have no intention of using it outside of when there is no alternative. Oh, they were murmuring again. Great. Exactly what he wanted. Do you have a reason for refusing to use your new quirk? Why the fuck were they asking him that? They were the fucking Hero Commission, they should know damn well why. I don't want anyone else's quirk. I don't know what health risks it could pose to myself or others. Current laws and hero protocols are not equipped to handle it. Realistically, it's not that useful during combat since it takes a few seconds. Not to mention trying to use a new quirk is a pain and a half. Have you considered its potential use outside of combat? He didn't like where this was going. Yes, but it doesn't change my stance on it. If I were in a rescue situation or handling a quirk accident, and I didn't have any other options, then I would use it. Outside of that, I'll stick to my original quirk. The commission exchanged glances and nods. Before the chairman refocused on him, Katsuki didn't like the look in the man's eyes. Too interested. Katsuki Bakugo, the Hero Commission has been hearing about you for quite a while now. Even prior to your admission to UA, you were on our radar as a candidate with a lot of potential. Obviously, we never expected a development like this, but it opens the door to a new world of heroics. Nope, he didn't like this one bit. While you may see a lot of risk in your quirk, there's also an astounding amount of good that you could do. We want to help you do that. Not one bit. Usually, a full hero license requires you be 18, among a number of other things. However, we can make exceptions when the need arises. This is such a case, where we would be willing to grant you a full hero license to allow you to use your new quirk for the betterment of society. What? You would need to leave UA, but you would be able to work directly under the Hero Commission on a special project. You would also be working with an approved agency so you could get experience in practical heroics. But your primary job would be removing quirks from convicted high-risk villains to prevent them from causing further harm. Depending on the specific quirk, health risks, and availability of candidates, you would then give those quirks to worthy heroes selected by the Commission. Regulations would need to be established first, but you wouldn't be at risk of any legal repercussions. What? The Commission feels this would be the best utilization of your new ability. You would be helping keep people safe as we've never been able to before. It would also let you become a hero 3 years ahead of your class, and Commission-chosen heroes tend to do very well in the ranking. Oh, fuck no. Did these assholes learn nothing from the fucking sports festival? Or his fucking kidnapping? Katsuki wasn't a fucking cheater. Not a chance in hell. He'd rather give up on becoming a hero than take an underhanded offer like that. Not to fucking mention how much of a slippery slope it was. Sure, it'd start out as him taking quirks from only the worst of the worst. But soon enough there'd be people demanding he take every villain's quirk, regardless of their crime. Nope, no fucking way. He wanted to curse them out for daring to suggest he'd go along with that shit. But he just barely held himself together. Gotta stay civil, even if he shattered his teeth from how hard he was grinding them together. While I appreciate the interest, I have to decline your offer. I'm not willing to forcibly take quirks outside of emergency situations. And I'm not interested in taking the easy way to becoming a hero. After a pause, Katsuki decided to add on to that. I'm not ready to become a fully fledged hero anyways. I still have a lot to learn, and I think UA is the best place for me to do that. Ooh, they had not been expecting that. Mr. Chairman's face got ugly with Katsuki's rejection. Be sure in the choice you make. Becoming a hero is not an easy task, no matter what route you take. If you pick a more difficult path on purpose, you might find it's beyond your abilities. I'm sure. Yeah, they did not like his rejection one bit. More muttering. The Commission would like to ask you to reconsider, but we understand you might need a bit of time to do so. For now, you may leave and return to UA. Your presence will be expected at the same time after your classes on Monday, once you've had time to think the offer over carefully. Oh, for fuck's sake. Why couldn't they just listen when he said no? Punishment he was willing to take without question, but he wasn't going to take some shitty bribe to be their fucking lapdog, no matter what they tried. I don't need any extra time. I've made my choice. This isn't a decision to be made hastily. Take the weekend to think through your options. The hero world has suffered a great loss this year, and your cooperation would go a long way towards restoring the public's faith in the heroic system. Be sure to consider that before you make up your mind. For now, you're free to leave. Thank you for your time, Mr. Bakugo. Well, that was a low blow. Katsuki didn't bother to reply. The Commission was already packing up anyways. Turning on his heel, he marched out the door, back to where Aizawa was waiting. It took all the self-resistance he had left to not stomp his feet like a goddamn toddler. The bad mood was written all over him, so he didn't bother beating around the bush as they walked back towards where the waiting car. I have to come back on Monday. They made a bullshit offer I don't want. And even though I said no, they want me to think it over or some shit like that. Silence filled the air for a few seconds as his teacher thought the situation over. All right, we'll come back on Monday. And you'll tell them no again. If they try to push you anymore, you walk out and tell me. I'll handle it after that, whether they like it or not. Katsuki slid into the car. His hands were shaking badly, but he nodded. One shitty weekend. He could do this. Thanks. Even though his voice was quiet, Aizawa caught it. The smile he got from his teacher made it worth it. A hand moved to rest on his shoulder, giving him a comforting squeeze. It was enough to make him consider saying it again sometime. This isn't going to be fun, but you'll be alright, kid. My job is to look out for you brats, and I'm not going to fuck that up a second time. No chance in hell. He didn't deserve Aizawa, didn't deserve his comfort, or the dedication the man had to his students. Katsuki was fucking selfish though, so he let himself lean into that comforting hand and let himself believe his teacher. Just for a little bit. Maybe tomorrow will be better. Katsuki could only hope it would be, and given how shit this week had been already, the bar was so low they might actually clear it. Once that shit was already touching the ground, it couldn't get any lower. That was what he'd thought anyways. He'd forgotten how far down the universe was willing to dig. When he woke up, he'd known something was wrong. The world felt off, wrong, bad. What could it fucking be now? What could possibly make this situation worse? The answer to the question he didn't mean to ask came in the form of his green-eyed boyfriend. Izuku had gone to visit All Might early that morning so he could update the hero on Katsuki's situation. He'd said he'd be gone for 2 hours. It was close to 6 before he showed up again, not answering any of Shaodo or Katsuki's texts. The worst part was, he wasn't crying. Green eyes were dull and lifeless. His body looked like a puppet being dragged along. Katsuki knew that feeling all too well, and he hated the thought of Izuku dealing with it. There wasn't much he could do though. Not when Izuku explained why he'd been gone for so long, his voice quiet and flat. The doctors had been there. Another set of test results had come back. Before, they'd all known All Might was dying, but it had been abstract. He was dying the same way they all were. It wasn't real. Not yet. Not until the doctors had put a timer over his head. 2 months, maybe 3 if he was lucky. 2 months, and Katsuki's childhood hero, his boyfriend's mentor, the symbol of peace, would be gone for good. Because Katsuki killed him. 2 fucking months. There was nothing Recovery Girl could do. Too much had been lost already. All Might was too weak for her healing to do much anyways. Katsuki couldn't go see him until next week. 1 week out of the 8 that he had left. He felt like he shouldn't go see him at all. Shouldn't waste any of the precious time he had left. Izuku should have that time. Fuck, Shaodo deserved that time more than he did. Any of his classmates did. All Might had asked to see him regardless, probably to make Izuku feel better. Or maybe it had to do with the quirk. So Katsuki agreed to go in a week. What else could he do? That was all he could remember of Saturday, the 2-month time limit looming over him. Sunday, things managed to get even worse. The League of Villains knew for sure now that he'd gotten their leader's quirk. Intel suggested they were going to be going after him soon. Aizawa suspected a leak at the Hero Commission. Despite his teacher's best attempts, the Hero Commission still demanded to see him the next day. At the very least, they agreed to an increased escort for safety. None of them wanted to risk Katsuki falling back into the wrong hands. Sunday, Katsuki spent as much time as he could snuggled into his boyfriend's sides, pretending he wasn't scared. He didn't complain when Ijiru hugged him too tightly. He didn't push away Denki or Mina when they pressed too close to him on the couch, and he didn't say a word when Hunter ruffled his hair. Monday passed by in a blur, like someone had hit fast forward, until Katsuki found himself in a car fucking flipping over that was about to hit the ground. People were yelling. Something was grabbing him, pulling him out of the way. He was out of the car now. Aizawa pushed him behind the hero's lines, shielding him, told him to stay. The pro-hero escort wasn't doing a bad job. Even with All For One on the villain's side, they were almost holding ground. A voice was yelling at him again, and then he was being told to go, to run to the nearest agency, where there was a lockdown ready. So he ran, mind numb, knowing there was a battle behind him but not able to understand it. As he ran, he caught a glimpse of Best Jeanist taking on the bastard who decayed stuff with his hands, binding his fingers. All For One was moving and then, forcing Jeanist back. Aizawa was somewhere in there, the only thing keeping All For One at bay. Someone landed a hit on All For One, a nasty one. He yelled something, and the other villains moved. Dabi tore away from his own fight to summon up a wall of flames, enough that it must have broken Aizawa's line of sight. Not for long, but it only took an instant for the injury to heal over. Katsuki's mind flashed to that day. Jeanist, beaten within an inch of his life, body torn to shreds, healed in a few seconds by that quirk. It didn't seem to work for All For One's face, but maybe it could be enough. Didn't the guy have some quirk for living fucking forever too? He was still running. There was someone behind him now. That someone was not friendly. The agency wasn't far. If he launched himself now, gave it his all, he could escape. That was what he'd been told to do. That was what he was supposed to do. His mind was back on that quirk, a regeneration quirk like nothing they'd ever seen before, one that could heal near any injury in moments. Back on the only chance he might have to get a hold of that quirk. Back on All Might, dying in a hospital, all because of Katsuki, with nothing anyone else could do to save him. If he was caught, the villains would leave. They'd flee the battle once they had what they wanted. Nobody else needed to get hurt. It was such a stupid idea. There was every chance they'd kill him. At best, they'd torture him. At worst, they'd make him a Namu or something. Even if he survived, he wasn't going to come out of it okay. He only had seconds to decide, seconds before the person was on him. No time to think it through. In the end, he only really had one choice anyways. His palms didn't ignite. No real hero would let All Might die, not when there was something they could do. Besides, he thought, as he felt that hauntingly familiar sensation of his body being compressed, he deserved this. Whatever came next. Whatever they did to him, he deserved it. Katsuki wasn't going to let them win, but he let them take him. Even knowing if his insane plan did work, it wouldn't redeem him, his soul would never be clean. It was his fault. His fault All Might was dying. His fault Izuku was losing the closest thing he had to a father. His fault the villains were after him. His fault people got hurt, were getting hurt. All of it was his fault. And it was far more than he could ever make up for. Despite all his mistakes and flaws, Katsuki still desperately wanted to be a hero. Heroes didn't make excuses. They didn't let impossible odds deter them. They did what they had to do, with no hesitation. A true hero always did whatever they could, even when they knew it wasn't going to be enough. Katsuki Bakugo wanted to be a hero, so he plunged back into the void once more, hoping this time he might find more than the water filling his lungs. When Katsuki woke up, he had 3 seconds to startle before there was a rag pressed over his face. He couldn't breathe. The void took him back once more to its oily grasp. The next time he woke up, he was retching. Where was he? Why couldn't he move his arms? Why couldn't he get the fluid in his lungs out? Out. Everything was gray. Stone and metal. Something wasn't right. His dorm room wasn't made of stone and metal. It shouldn't be this cold either. There was something on his arms, pinning them behind his back. Why? Why was he here? Oh, right. They left him alone in that room for what could have been minutes or hours. It was hard for him to tell. There are no windows, no clocks, nothing to tell him time was passing by. Maybe it wasn't. His head hurt. Why was he here again? Katsuki tried to itch his face. The muzzle was digging into his cheeks. Oh wait, his arms were still bound. Because they didn't want him to explode things. That was something he could, right? He could explode things with his hands. Maybe. Why couldn't he do that now? When someone finally entered the room, it was the man with the suit and the mask. He had a name, Katsuki was pretty sure. It was a dumb name. Katsuki couldn't recall what his name was, but he knew it was dumb. The man did not seem happy when Katsuki told him so. Or maybe he was happy. It was hard to tell. Katsuki couldn't make out what the man was saying. And he couldn't see his face either. The man shook him a few times. That was rude of him. Why would he do that when the room was already spinning? Was he trying to spin in the opposite direction so it would hold still? Maybe that would work. He should try it again. The man gave up, growling out words Katsuki couldn't understand to a portly man with strange goggles and a weird mustache. Katsuki didn't like that man. He didn't like either of them. In fact, he wanted both of them to go away right now. They didn't listen to him. They came closer and closer until there was a pinch in his neck and the void came back. When he woke up for a third time, Katsuki was still disoriented. This time, though, the disorientation cleared as he focused on making sense of his surroundings. His memories came back to him, of All Might in the hospital, of his first escape, of his stupid fucking choice on that battlefield. Well, nothing to be done about it now. Nothing but make sure he actually got that goddamn healing quirk so this shit wasn't in vain. All he needed was a distraction. He couldn't risk trying to take the quirk when All For One had the upper hand. For all Katsuki knew that would let him get the transfer quirk back. While Katsuki knew he was stubborn as all hell, he couldn't trust his determination to hold up when the guy could stab him. At least they'd taken the muzzle off at some point. His arms were still bound behind his back. Chains on the arm restraints lead to the wall, matched by a set of chains on his ankles. At best he could stand and take one step in either direction. Sitting was uncomfortable with the chains, so he laid on his side as he tried to figure out a plan. Time still didn't make sense to him, even though he was pretty sure he wasn't drugged anymore. This time, it was just the weird guy with the goggles who came by. You've caused my employer quite a bit of trouble. Thanks, I'm trying my fucking best here. Not his best comeback, but whatever. It's not like he was getting scored. Now, that's no way for you to talk. Didn't anyone ever teach you to respect your elders? Being old doesn't mean you get any fucking respect from me. All it means is you're that much closer to dying. Dr. Goggles sighed, like he was disappointed in Katsuki. As if, in whatever delusional world this man lived in, Katsuki gave a shit about his opinion. Well, I suppose there will be time to work on that later. I suppose you already know what I'm here for. The smart choice here was to stay silent. That's what he should have been doing from the start. Usually, Katsuki was smart. Today he had a fucking headache, his arms hurt, and his emotions were all fucked up from this whole situation. He could be smart tomorrow. Today, he looked that fucker right in the eye and did everything in his power to keep his voice as deadpan as possible. Oh, of course I do. Obviously. This is all because you want my curry recipe. Dr. Goggles didn't look particularly impressed by that, so Katsuki couldn't help but add, "You won't get it from me. That shit's coming with me to my fucking grave." Several long seconds ticked by as the man contemplated Katsuki before sighing again, like he was dealing with a fucking toddler or something. "It doesn't have to be like this, you know. I'd really rather not hurt you. All For One has requested I keep you in good shape. It'll make you more useful later. Really, if you could only behave. This could be so easy for you." Katsuki straight up fucking laughed. Not a snort or a little giggle. Nah, it must have lasted a full minute at least. Right in that dickhead's face. "Tell me, how well did that speech work out last time? Huh? I mean, fuck. You assholes must have been spying on me for a while. How has that shit worked out for fucking anyone who's ever interacted with me?" He paused, needing to catch his breath. "I don't do behave, motherfucker. Never have, never will." Those stupid goggles meant Katsuki couldn't see the guy's eyes, but he glared at them anyways. They could try whatever they fucking wanted. They weren't going to break him. Can't break what's already shattered to pieces. Once more the man sighed, his head shaking, and Katsuki swore to God he heard him tut. "You have quite the fire in you. It's such a shame we'll have to put it out." Before Katsuki could reply, there was a needle going into his neck. Well, fuck. Whatever. They couldn't get the quirk from him when he was drugged. Just meant less shit he'd remember later. Back to the void then. It bothered him how familiar the darkness felt these days. After that, the narrative in Katsuki's mind fell to pieces. Time didn't seem to move in a linear fashion anymore. People seemed to shift and change, morphing from one person to the next as if they were one and the same. Sometimes he saw All For One. Not often, but sometimes. It hadn't taken them long to discover Katsuki either wouldn't or couldn't transfer the quirk back to him. Nor could All For One find a way to force it from him, much like Monoma's copy. His forced activation trick didn't work on it, so the man himself kept away, unwilling to risk Katsuki getting a hold of one of his strength quirks to escape. When he did come by, he was always polite, always well-spoken, even when Katsuki was coughing up blood. What Katsuki hated most about it was how sympathetic he sounded, as if he wasn't the reason Katsuki was there, as if this situation was somehow out of his control. Hansy called the man father a few times, and Katsuki didn't like to think about how much the man reminded him of his own father. Sometimes, during those rare visits from All For One, on the worst days, Katsuki would see brown hair and glasses where he should see a mask. The voice would change, from the villain's lower bass to his father's soft coo. They blended together. He couldn't tell which one of them was really there. Not that it really mattered. Both of them asked the same thing of him. Neither would do shit to help him. All they had were empty words. "Just stop fighting, Katsuki. It's so much easier if you don't fight. I don't like seeing you like this. You just need to behave. It'll be better if you do. I want things to be better, don't you? Just behave. Just behave. Behave. Behave." They could implore him all they wanted, in their low, honeyed voices. It wasn't going to fool him. The man with the goggles, Dr. Daruma as he liked to remind Katsuki. He was the one Katsuki saw the most. Sometimes it was to inject him with some new drugs. Other times he was just there to hurt him. When Katsuki's vision started to blur, the man would be replaced with his mother, leering over him, trying to break him down, trying to shatter him even further, making sure he knew this was all his fault. They were only doing this for his own good. He'd understand one day. Katsuki considered himself lucky. Or, well, he didn't, but he probably should. He should be grateful. Lots of heroes got tortured. He'd seen some of the results of it. Not firsthand, but in newspaper accounts. Photos passed around online. Rumors that circulated. When you compared his situation to those stories, Katsuki got off fucking easy. The villains couldn't risk killing him. And they couldn't risk breaking his mind completely, as either one could mean All For One's quirk was lost forever. That meant they were limited in what they could do. Sure, whatever it was would fucking hurt, but they weren't trying to mind control him or chopping off his limbs. A lot of it had to do with taking things away. Food was the first one. Water too. Movement. Time. Awareness. They did feed him, but not enough for him to feel full. Only enough to keep him alive. The same for water. If he behaved, then he could have more. They loved to remind him of how easily he could end his torture. He didn't have to give up the quirk. All they wanted was for him to address them a bit more politely, be a little kinder, behave a little. Lies upon lies filled his ears. But it didn't sway him. It couldn't. Katsuki was incapable of behaving. He was bad to his core. Besides, he'd lived through all of this before. It made him want to laugh. In a way, his mother had prepared him to survive this. How many times had she sent him to his room without dinner? Locked him in his room well past when he would have eaten breakfast? Straight up told him he didn't deserve to eat when he'd fucked something up yet again? That summer alone had been an exercise in surviving without people around. This wasn't so bad. At least now when he eventually escaped, he'd be able to tell people about it. He could complain about how bad it was, and they wouldn't give him that awful look of concern or ask a bunch of probing questions. Wouldn't give him yet another lecture on how he should be grateful to his parents for taking care of him. When he escaped this hellhole, he'd be free to bitch about it as much as he wanted. And that thought was often the best thing he had to keep himself going. Sometimes, Katsuki saw other villains. There was no rhyme or reason to when they came. His best guess was they came by when they got bored, to see if he was really still holding on. Twice, and Mr. Compress only came by 2 times each. The first had been okay company. He'd seemed uncomfortable with Katsuki's state on his second visit, blood splattered on his chest and ribs showing. After a bit of talking to himself, he'd left and come back with a towel to clean off the blood and grim. That was nice. It was one of the few times Katsuki came close to feeling clean. Twice didn't visit him again after that. The latter had been quiet. He hadn't stayed long either time that he'd visited. Katsuki didn't care much for him. He'd apologized. Guilty words whispered under his breath before he left the second time. It pissed Katsuki off more than almost anything else. That motherfucker was the one who'd brought him in both times. He didn't get to say sorry. He didn't get to say sorry and not do shit about it and make himself feel better because of some meaningless fucking words. Whatever. Toga was weird, but better company than almost anyone else. She'd come down to visit regularly. Unlike the others, she was bright and bubbly about the whole experience. This girl was fucking crazy. Like, seriously messed up sorta crazy. Katsuki found he didn't mind. The fantastical story she had going on in her head was an enjoyable reprieve from the rest of this bullshit. When she was around, he would usually play along with whatever weird fucking world she lived in. He'd greet her with a smirk, and he'd act like they were pals. Of course, he still grouched at her and made sarcastic comments. That was how he was with his actual friends. The difference was the warmth behind it, which he let shine through just a little for her. Not because he actually believed her nonsense, but because she'd be super fucking smiley no matter what he did. Might as well have some fun with it. If nothing else, she was interesting as fuck. She'd bring gossip with her or tell him some batshit crazy tale that would entertain him long enough for him to forget where he was. Plus, Dr. Goggles hated him getting along with her. Guess the guy couldn't stand someone else getting positive responses from Katsuki while he kept failing. Sometimes, Toga would fade out. He'd see Ijiru in her place. Mina, Denki, bright smiles, happy tones, eyes lighting up with joy. Stupid fucking sunshine children, finding light in the darkest of hellholes. Maybe that's why he played pretend with her. Who fucking knew? Dabi came by more often than All For One did. Of all of the villains, Dabi was the most confusing to Katsuki. The guy didn't make any fucking sense. For the first while, Katsuki pegged him as one of the psychos. Probably an entitled only child or something. That idea didn't hold up for long. Dabi was different from the others. The others were either nuts or they acted guilty. He was in some weird third category. Not quite either, but not separate. During his first 2 visits, he was quiet when he stopped by the cell. Not the guilty quiet like Mr. Compress. A contemplative quiet. Unlike the 2 cowards, Dabi wasn't upset by the state Katsuki was in. He wasn't overly happy about it like Toga either. Dabi just accepted it for what it was. And there was an odd sense of relief in that. On Dabi's 3rd visit, Katsuki was high out of his fucking mind. He couldn't stop talking, and Dabi found amusement in holding a conversation with him. Random shit that didn't mean anything. It had trailed off eventually, as Katsuki's tongue got heavier and heavier. Then, as his vision started to blur, he heard Dabi say something. The comment wasn't intended for him to actually hear, but somehow Katsuki managed to puzzle out the words. Man, for a 16-year-old brat, you're holding out against this shit way better than I thought you would. I'll be honest, I thought you'd drop the tough guy shit after a day or 2. He couldn't stop his mouth from moving, slurred words falling from his lips out against his will. As not elky I've never deet with ths as high, T4. My mom does worse hen she's not pissed at me. Dabi went quiet. When Katsuki managed to get his vision to focus, he saw blue eyes watching him far too intently. God, he hated that look. For half a moment, one blue eye was replaced by brown. Mismatched eyes narrowing in concern and knowing after Katsuki slipped up and mentioned his mother. Katsuki squeezed his eyes shut. He didn't want to think about that right now. A few minutes later, he passed out. Dabi was gone when he woke up. The next time Dabi came to visit, something had changed. Uncharacteristically pleasant conversation flowed between them. It had been 2 days since the last time Katsuki had had water, and he was saving his anger for whenever the doctor came by next. The guy was probably going to try and get him to address him respectfully or some shit like that. Not that he would. He knew they were trying to break him down slowly. Katsuki also knew damn well they weren't going to let him die. He could deal with the discomfort. Dabi stayed for about an hour. Towards the end of his visit, he'd seemed nervous. What the fuck did he have to be scared of? Katsuki was about to call him out on it when Dabi turned to check his phone for the 14th time. Before he could, the phone pinged. Apparently, that was the signal Dabi had been waiting for. His mood shifted to something calmer. 5 minutes passed by, and Katsuki had been about to write it off when Dabi stood and entered the cell. From how he glanced back and forth, Katsuki was pretty sure Dabi wasn't supposed to enter his prison. Most of his visitors stayed outside the cell. Toga, he knew for a fact, wasn't allowed in the cell. She had told him as much. Dabi didn't seem to care. He pushed his way in and knelt down near where Katsuki was lying on the cold stone floor. For one terrible moment, Katsuki worried the other was going to kill him. Maybe he saw it as a mercy killing or some shit like that. Instead, Dabi pulled a water bottle from his jacket. Wait, what was that for? Katsuki watched it suspiciously as the villain uncapped the bottle. A bribe. What could he possibly want from Katsuki enough to try and bribe him? Depending on the demand, Katsuki might consider it, if only to be able to spit in the doctor's face during his next visit. No demand came. A rough hand pushed Katsuki up into a semi-sitting position and the bottle was held to his lips. What the fuck? Red eyes met blue, his hesitation not going unnoticed. A shrug was his reply. Kid, if I wanted to drug you, I'd use a needle. Take the water or don't, but make up your mind quick. Cameras will be back on eventually. Well, he had nothing to lose. Katsuki tilted his head so he could drink from the bottle, keeping one eye on Dabi in case it was a trap. The whole thing took him less than a minute to finish. He felt nauseous from how much he'd drunk in the short time span. But it was better than the endless desert he'd been stuck in. Fuck, it had been so damn long since he wasn't thirsty. Dabi recapped the empty bottle, tucking it back into that jacket pocket. You weren't supposed to look a gift horse in the mouth. Fuck it. Why? His voice was weak, but he knew Dabi heard him. Blue eyes found his own again. And for a second, Katsuki was sure he saw guilt in there. It smoothed over, replaced by some sort of determination. Another shrug. You look like you could use a break, and what can I say? You're impressive for some random brat. Katsuki wasn't sure how to respond to that. He sure as fuck wasn't going to say thank you. It still felt like he needed to say something though. There was more to this story. Unlike Mr. Compress, whatever guilt Dabi was feeling was enough to drive him to actually do shit. The right words might go a long way to getting him an ally. I'm not expecting your gratitude or any shit like that. This is mostly to fuck with the guy running this place. Just don't mention it to anyone, okay? Fair enough. All right. Those burning blue eyes inspected him for a long moment before deciding whatever they saw was good enough for Dabi to return to his seat outside the cell. There was silence between them for a while. Red eyes found themselves pulled towards one corner of his cell, the top left. From the sounds of footsteps he'd been able to figure out that was the vague direction of the dungeon's exit. The corner was identical to the other four, but sometimes Katsuki could swear there was light coming from it, probably the drug talking. Whatever mood Dabi was in, he seemed content to sit outside Katsuki's cell in their comfortable quiet. This might be Katsuki's only chance to get some information, some hope. How long have I been down here? Nobody else would tell him anything related to time. The closest gauge he had was Toga, who sometimes dropped hints as to how long it had been between her visits. Quiet. Well, it had been worth a shot. It didn't really matter. Wouldn't change anything. 2 weeks and a day. The reply was soft. Katsuki had to strain his ears to catch it. 2 weeks. Feels like longer. I don't doubt it. Some of the shit they're giving you will seriously fuck with your sense of time. Oh, did he want to push his luck? Yeah, nothing to lose after all. During the battle, the last one, did anyone die? The quiet was longer this time. It made Katsuki wonder if Dabi was going to lie to him. Nah, no serious injuries on either side. Your teacher had a lot to do with that. All For One was pissed about it, and he was extra pissed that he couldn't grab the guy's quirk to make up for it. Aizawa-sensei's cool like that. He's a damn good hero, I'll give him that much. This next question might break him. It was dangerous to give Dabi this much power, to risk revealing his motivations. He couldn't help it. He needed to know. Is All Might still alive? Dabi's answer came surprisingly quick. Yeah, he's up and kicking last I heard. Worried you'll miss the funeral? Thank fucking God for that unintentional out. I never got the chance to say goodbye. It wasn't a lie. He hadn't. Katsuki didn't need to mention he had no intention of saying goodbye. If this shit actually worked. Silence. There wasn't anything else he needed to know. His lips formed a quiet question against his will. Voice weak, fucking childish, despicable. It made him want to gag. Are they still looking for me? Dabi didn't say anything. The question had been so quiet, Katsuki was pretty sure he didn't hear it. Fuck, Katsuki had hardly been able to hear it. Time ticked by them, until the man stood up and stretched. Probably had other places to be. Oh well, Now that he wasn't parched, Katsuki could grab a nap. His eyes fluttered closed, and his breathing started to slow. He'd gotten good at falling asleep, had to get it whenever he could. It only took a few seconds now. Something held him back from passing out. Why weren't there footsteps? It was weird enough Katsuki almost opened his eyes to check if Dabi was there. Instead, he kept his eyes shut and breathing steady. Focusing, he could hear the other man breathing. Why was he still here? If his ears hadn't already been straining, he would have missed what the other said under his breath. As it was, it took Katsuki several seconds to puzzle out what Dabi said as he left the dungeon. The words clearly hadn't been meant for him. The tone was far too soft. "Don't worry, kid. They're still looking for you." He should feel bad. Searching for him put them in danger. The last thing Katsuki wanted was for someone else to get hurt because of his stupid plan. It was his weakness that got him caught the first time, and it was his job to bear this pain until he could fix his mistake. Nobody else's. A selfish, childish, cruel part of him still felt happy hearing they hadn't given up on him. Hope was for babies, but Katsuki couldn't help the spark that flickered in his chest. Dabi stopped by several times after that. Whenever he visited, he'd bring something with him. Water, food, some method of lengthening the chain so Katsuki could take more than a single step. Katsuki hated that he started to look forward to those visits. Rationally, he knew Dabi was a villain. The guy had killed people. He'd tried to kill his classmates. These little gifts shouldn't mean shit to him. It didn't stop him from perking up whenever he heard telltale shuffling footsteps, from seeing dark hair and thinking it was longer, that those bags under the man's eyes weren't burns but were from exhaustion. Blue fading, sometimes entirely replaced by solid black, sometimes only partially giving way to a warm brown. Either was a welcome sight. For fuck's sake, he hadn't fallen for this shit from All For One or that asshole doctor. Why was the emo serial killer different? Even as he questioned it, Katsuki knew the answer. Because unlike the others, Dabi meant what he was doing. The guy was a dickhead, a murderer, a villain. He was honest about it though. Never tried to pretend he was anything but a villain. Or that these little gifts somehow redeemed him. Dabi didn't apologize. Never acted like Katsuki owed him shit, and Katsuki could respect that. The honesty was refreshing. A nice relief from the bullshit lies the others tried to beat into him. He also had a fucking sense of humor. That helped a lot too. Shigaraki was the second most confusing visitor Katsuki got. Now, Katsuki already knew the guy was nuts, but his visits were straight up weird. While the other villains, sans Dr. Goggles, kept outside his cell, Shigaraki always came in. The hands he wore into battle were gone most of the time. Once or twice he brought them in a pocket. Seeing him without them was uncomfortable. Without the weird hands covering him, the guy looked almost human. He also wore gloves. Their first few interactions had been mostly what Katsuki expected. Shigaraki tried to convince him to join, with words parroted straight from his sensei. The only difference was Shigaraki seemed to actually believe the shit coming out of his mouth. Honest to fucking God, the guy thought All For One was some kind of saint. And in his fucked up mind, he thought Katsuki would jump on board with him any day now. On his most recent visit, the dear doctor had put Katsuki through the ringer. His body was bloody and bruised, and he'd groaned when he'd heard the shuffled approach. Shigaraki let himself into the cell, like all the times before, only to freeze when he saw the state Katsuki was in. For several long minutes, he stared. Katsuki could feel those red eyes on him, and he fucking hated it. If he wasn't so tired, he would have started shit over it. As it was, the only thing on his mind was taking a goddamn nap. Instinct screamed he shouldn't fall asleep while this asshole was here, but he was too fucking exhausted to care. Or he was, until the creep had reached out and touched him. Out of all the memories Katsuki could recall, this one struck him hardest. This one haunted him. Fear sealed his throat shut with that initial touch. Not of death, but of what Shigaraki could do to him while he was chained up. All the stories Katsuki had heard of 20-something man-children with power complexes pointed towards the only form of torture they hadn't tried on him yet. None of them had sunk that low. It seemed even Dr. Daruma and All For One had limits. Shigaraki might not. That fear morphed into confusion as the touch continued. It didn't feel like that sort of touch. There were 3 fingers tracing his injuries, but it was too light to hurt. Nothing in the touch felt possessive or lustful. Katsuki stayed frozen as Shigaraki traced his wounds. Like a curious child. Eventually, sleep overtook him. When he awoke, Shigaraki was gone. He hadn't been moved. As far as he could tell, the guy hadn't done anything. After that, the tone of the visits had changed. Shigaraki no longer tried to win him over, no longer spouted that bullshit about how this was for his own good. Usually, he was quiet. Red eyes would look over Katsuki's battered form. And Katsuki had to wonder who Shigaraki was seeing. Why keep fighting? The voice was quiet, hesitant, almost pleading. It didn't sound like Shigaraki. Katsuki had refused to respond before, but this felt important, so he answered honestly. Giving up isn't an option for me. I've got shit left to do. At least 2 visits passed without another word. Somewhere along the way, Shigaraki had become Tamura in Katsuki's mind. The person who came to his cell was not the same villain he'd faced down on the battlefield. For whatever fucking reason, Tamura had taken to touching him whenever he showed up. It never escalated. Never went anywhere inappropriate. Never even felt like Tamura was capable of that sort of thing. The touch was always careful. Never more than 3 fingers, never pressing. There was never any skin-to-skin contact. The gloves stopped that. There was never any pain either. Katsuki considered telling the guy to stop. He should. This was a super fucking dangerous game. For fuck's sake, the guy wore decapitated hands that he called his family. In the end, he never told Tamura not to touch him. Sure, it was weird as fuck, but everything about this situation was weird as fuck. At least the touch was somewhat pleasant. Plus, he was pretty sure if he did tell Tamura to fuck off, the guy would. And there was something different about Tamura now. The vibe was strongest whenever Katsuki was injured, but it was a constant undercurrent. What it was, Katsuki had no fucking clue, but it felt important. An odd sort of familiarity. If there was no one coming, if you had nowhere to go back to, would you still fight? The question sounded like it wasn't really meant for Katsuki, but he replied anyways. Yeah, why? Flashes played in Katsuki's mind. His mother had been the first one to say it, that he'd end up a villain. Almost everyone had repeated it to him at some point or another. Teachers, classmates, strangers. More recently, the headlines on shitty news sites. Katsuki wasn't Izuku, his soul wasn't pure. He didn't have a heroic spirit. Didn't have his boyfriend's kind instincts. Katsuki wasn't Shadow. He didn't have his path chosen for him. Didn't have his destiny planned out for him. There was no predetermined fate for him to follow or rebel against. So why did he keep fighting? Why did he refuse to become what everyone thought he would be? Spite. It was a shitty answer, but it was the best he had. Tamura left with fingers digging into his neck, upset about something, though Katsuki couldn't fathom what. How does your quirk work? A more dangerous question this time, something solid and real. Tamura was tracing the restraints that kept his explosions at bay. They only took them off when he was drugged out of his mind. It was a dumb idea to tell this guy anything. Really dumb. I sweat nitroglycerin from my palms. Deadly hands completed a full circuit of the arm's restraints in silence. Can you turn it off? Shouldn't Dr. Asshole know this shit? The guy had definitely been recording info on Katsuki's quirk. Why wasn't Tamura asking him? Nah, I can force out more, but I can't do less than the baseline. 2 circuits. Is it toxic? Like regular nitroglycerin? When he'd started dating Shadow and Izuku, it was one of the many little things he'd warned them about. One of the many reasons on his secret list of why they shouldn't be dating him in the first place. He didn't want to answer the question. It's not quite as bad, but yeah, it's toxic. 1 circuit. Is it hard to control? Sometimes. I've gotten better at it over the years. Mostly just gotta pay attention to it and keep burning it off. As long as I'm careful about touching shit, it's not that bad. Though, Tamura was quiet for the rest of the visit. Tamura wasn't touching him this time. He wasn't sure if it was a good thing or not. On one hand, he should probably be relieved. On the other, this was unfamiliar ground for him. Unfamiliar was dangerous. Today, Tamura had brushed the light blue hair out of his face. It wasn't exactly neat, but it was tucked behind his ears, leaving his face exposed. With his hair back, Katsuki could see Tamura's eyes clearly. Red looked into red. They were the exact same color. Katsuki knew a few other people with red eyes, but always been a different shade of red. The only other person he knew with his shade was his mother. Tamura's eyes didn't look like his mother's. They looked like Katsuki's. That didn't make much sense, but he was at the tail end of a drug high. Fucking whatever. Now that he thought about it, Tamura hadn't come by after he'd been drugged before. Looking back into those red mirrors, he thought there might be a reason for that. Words flashed into his mind unbidden. The same words he'd thought of the first time he'd met Tamura. Heroes and villains are 2 sides of the same coin. A single heartbeat. And blue hair slid to blonde. The scars faded from those lips, and the face he was looking at seemed younger. The image was gone as soon as it arrived, but he couldn't unsee it. For once, Katsuki broke the silence. He shouldn't. He did anyways. How long's he had you for? Tamura's posture tensed. Katsuki was convinced he was going to lose it. The smart thing to do was backing down. Katsuki held Tamura's gaze, red meeting red. It was Tamura who broke eye contact, looking to the floor. When he mumbled out an answer at last, his voice was almost nothing. A while, there was a long pause. Tamura's hand dug into his neck, sharp fingernails leaving painful-looking lines down his skin. He wasn't wearing the gloves. First time Katsuki had seen him down here without them. Finally, the other muttered something to himself, words Katsuki barely caught. Gotta be 10 years at least. Well, that explained a lot. They sat in silence again. Again, Katsuki couldn't help himself. Why me? Out of all the shitty kids out there, why pick me? I thought you'd understand. The hand fell from Tamura's neck to his lap where it wrapped around his other hand. Red eyes inspected those deadly fingers for a long time. before looking back up to meet their twins. There was something different about them now. A spark, flickering, dim, but burning nonetheless. Maybe you do. Tamura left not long after that. It was the last time he visited Katsuki. Katsuki didn't see anyone for what felt like a long time after that. When the doctor came back, he was upset. Past experience told Katsuki he was going to be in for it. He braced himself for the pain. There was none. Food and water were shoved down his throat, and he was left alone again. The next visit was much of the same. And the one after that, Toga was the one who gave him answers. Her tone was unusually concerned. Mr. Shigaraki got really upset with Mr. All For One about how they were treating you. I thought the blood looked good on you, but it was making him sad all of a sudden. Mr. All For One was confused, but he didn't want Mr. Shigaraki to be sad, so he told Dr. Daruma to be nicer. Like Dabi said, it wasn't like it was doing much in the first place. Big Sis backed him up. Yeah, it was kinda scary. Mr. Shigaraki's been acting strange in general. I'm worried about him actually. He's jumpier now. And I've heard him muttering about people he's never mentioned before. You know his family's hands that he usually loves, right? Now he keeps acting weird towards them. Sometimes he can't stop staring. And other times he acts like he's freaked out by them. We keep finding him staring off into space too. He'll mumble under his breath, or start digging into his neck if we don't snap him out of it. If it's real bad, we have to get Kurogiri or Dabi. Otherwise he'll startle and try and decay us. Wait, Dabi. Oh yeah, I guess word hasn't gotten to you yet. It's so cute. Mr. Shigaraki and Dabi have been getting along a lot recently. I asked Mag about it, and she said they've finally warmed up to each other. Mr. All For One gets nervous about it, but I think he's just jealous that Mr. Shigaraki's been spending time with other people. Weird. That reminds me, Mag showed me a new way to do my eyeshadow. It couldn't have been that long after Toga's visit that Dabi finally came by. He looked like shit, hair a mess and eyes wild. Normally he waited outside the cell until he got a ping on his phone, which meant the cameras were down. Today, Dabi didn't bother. He pushed his way right in. Katsuki hardly had time to sit up before there was a container thrust in his face. Drink. Tilting his head slightly, Katsuki could see it was a smoothie of some kind. Maybe. After taking a few seconds to consider his life choices, he leaned in to snag the straw. Not a smoothie. Tasted like a protein shake. Not awful, but not great either. By this point, as long as it wasn't making him gag, Katsuki didn't care. He finished the whole thing, releasing the straw and looking to Dabi for answers. Dabi tucked the drink away and dropped to sit beside Katsuki, head twisting back and forth. Antsy, blue eyes regarded him for a long moment, staring into Katsuki's soul and weighing his heart against a feather. Like he had any fucking right to judge. It's an energy boost, with some other shit mixed in. Won't fix everything, but it'll do you a lot of good. You're going to need it. Why? A long pause that set Katsuki's every nerve alight. Since he talked to you, Tamura's been getting testy with All For One. Apparently some of his childhood memories started coming back. They got into a nasty spat today, and I'm making a choice about where my loyalties lie. I won't go with you. I won't be, I can't. If it had been anyone else, Katsuki's words would have been shouted. They would have confident and powerful. Dabi made him doubt himself. As much as Katsuki hated it, Dabi was the only one who'd been kind to him. The only real friendly face he'd seen in what felt like years. The only one who'd bothered to actually do shit to help him. For all his words, if it came down to it, he might follow Dabi if All For One was the alternative. Might. Don't worry, kid. I'm not dumb. Tamura really wanted to take you with us, but I talked him out of it for now. Convinced him you'd be better off going back to the heroes. You aren't a villain, and we can't change that. Katsuki wanted to cry. It shouldn't mean shit to him what Dabi of all fucking people thought of him. Still, to hear someone say it, someone who had every reason to tell him otherwise, and still tell him he wasn't a villain, his eyes might be watering. I've gathered up the people actually worth shit, and we're leaving. I've already sent your friends a message with some info that'll unlock as soon as we're gone. The problem is, All For One is going to know the moment we're gone. I don't know how long it'll take for your friends to get a team over here who can handle him and the other dickheads we're leaving behind. He'll be after me as soon as he knows. A grim nod in return. All right, this was going to be his only chance to get out of here. He couldn't fuck it up. I've already put an override code into all the shit down here. Everything should deactivate when we leave. After that, good fucking luck. Thanks. He meant to say that sarcastically. Unfortunately, it came out sincere. Shit. A scarred hand moved up to ruffle his hair. And Katsuki hated himself for leaning into the touch. Hated himself for not even thinking to try and take Dabi's quirk until the other had broken contact. Hated himself for knowing he wouldn't have done it, even if he had thought of it in time. Be careful, kid. You've been down here a month with limited mobility and on a fuck ton of drugs. Move slowly, keep yourself in dark, quiet places away from anything producing heat, and he'll have a tough time finding you. Take a left at the top of the stairs once you're out. That'll get you to the warehouse, which should be perfect for playing keep away. Dabi pushed himself back to a standing position, pausing for a moment to look at Katsuki. If you're smart about it, you've still got a chance to say goodbye. Then he left, pushing his way out of the cell, footsteps echoing down the hallway. He wouldn't say that unless All Might was alive. Katsuki wasn't too late yet. He still had a chance to save him. It couldn't have been more than 5 minutes before the lights started to flicker, and the restraints around his wrists fell away, chains clattering to the ground. No time to waste. After a month of hell, his first few steps almost sent him crashing to the ground, but whatever was in that drink was helping a fuck ton. It only took seconds for him to be out of the cell and up the stairs. The warehouse was to the left. From the right he could hear increasingly loud cracks and smashes. If he went left, he could say goodbye. If he went right, there was a chance he wouldn't have to. A hero should always be ready to risk their life. No excuses. Katsuki Bakugo didn't do losing. He didn't do shit he didn't want to do. And he didn't do anything less than his best. He went right. Aizawa was having the worst month of his fucking life. So far, 2 months, year. Of course, Katsuki being kidnapped wasn't enough. No, he had to come back to school a month before their provisional license exam with a brand new fucking quirk. Just about the most complicated quirk he could have gotten too. For fuck's sake, couldn't the universe give this kid a break? Apparently not, because it only took a week from when Katsuki found out he had the quirk, just when they'd finally gotten a handle on things. And then he was fucking kidnapped again. This time, there were no leads, no trackers stuck onto Namu. Nothing. They had to resume classes after 3 days. Policy said to keep things going, so that's what Aizawa did. Shinsu was selected to replace Minta in Class 1A. Nobody dared suggest they fill the other empty seat. Every homeroom started the same way, with Kirishima asking him if he'd heard anything. There's no new publicly available information. He dreaded saying that awful phrase every morning. He dreaded the morning Kirishima didn't ask even more. 3 weeks went by, and they still had nothing. All Aizawa had to comfort himself was the knowledge Katsuki wasn't dead yet. Probably not dead yet. The kid was smart. He knew better than to give up the quirk, and they couldn't take it from him without a transfer. As long as he had it, they wouldn't kill him. The class hadn't given up hope, but he could see how it was crushing them. He hadn't wanted them to take their provisional exam. Not with the emotional state of the class being what it was. They had insisted. Midoriya looked like was going to break down if he wasn't able to make progress, wasn't able to help somehow. So he let them. What else could he do? All 39 students passed with flying colors. Class 1 and 1B. They got a lecture on work study from his third-year students. Even Mirio couldn't bring up the class's mood. Not when there was an empty seat in the room. Mirio wasn't exactly his usual sunny self either. His eyes lingered on where Katsuki normally sat. Guilt clear in his eyes, though there was no cause for it. It wasn't his fault Yue had failed Katsuki yet again. Mirio's lecture was followed up by Aizawa's own edition, delivered in a voice that left no room for argument. None of you are allowed near the case. All prospective hero agencies have already been made aware of that. As unhappy as they were, all of them understood. Aizawa called Mitsuki Bakugo once a week now to let her know there was no news. She didn't seem to care that much, diverting the conversation into angry rants about her son. If no, when they got Katsuki back, he had some serious investigating to do into exactly what was going on in that household. A week passed. Slowly, each of his students was picked up by agencies. The passion behind it was lacking. There are no new leads. Until one day, a month after this entire mess started. A month after Aizawa had failed his student. A month after he'd been sedated because he lost his shit when he found out the villains had gotten away with Katsuki. 1 month later, he got an email. Everyone associated with Class 1 did, students and teachers alike. The sender was some randomly generated account. The subject line read soon. Inside, there was a link. Nothing else. Clicking on it was a really stupid idea, which is why Aizawa didn't do that. Several of his students did. And all of them were getting a lecture on cybersecurity. All Might had clicked on the link as well, but he wasn't getting a lecture. Not much point to it now. It didn't really matter anyway. The link didn't lead to anything. Just a blank page. From what we can tell, it's a placeholder. Even in the code of the webpage, there's not much we could find. It's waiting for some sort of signal. Great. Just wonderful. So now, Aizawa had the entirety of Class 1 and 1B sitting in the school gym. The doors were locked, and none of them were leaving without an escort. Classes were cancelled, and all non-heroic students were on lockdown in the dorms. All the gathered heroic students were watching him with wary gazes. Aizawa had exactly one chance to do this right. We have no confirmation this has anything to do with Katsuki. For all we know, it's random spam or something completely unrelated. But, and there it was. Aizawa sighed. But, investigators are suspicious. It's been exactly a month today, and it's not easy for someone to get a hold of this many UA email addresses. We assign random IDs for a reason, and they didn't get anyone outside of Class 1A. The easiest way for someone to pull this off would be getting access to a Class 1 email account. Kaken's phone. Midoriya's tone was breathless as he put it together. Green eyes narrowed. He kept it locked though, with a pin, not a face ID or thumbprint. Silence, as the class wondered if maybe Katsuki hadn't been able to hold on forever. Aizawa refused to think about it, refused to consider it as an option. The kid was made of fire, spite, and determination. He wouldn't have broken. There's plenty of ways around a pin when you have the physical device and time. Regardless, it's still entirely possible this has nothing to do with him. That's why you've locked us all in the gym. Black eyes narrowed in on the blonde student who was glaring right back at him. Monoma, one of Vlad's, the one who had stood up for Katsuki in the cafeteria. With a sigh, Aizawa's glare softened. We're being cautious. If this does have anything to do with Katsuki, none of you can be involved, even with your provisional licenses. This is going to be a dangerous operation. None of them were happy with that. Angry looks and tense shoulders all around. They might stage a revolt if he didn't put a stop to this now. Need I remind you all, if this does involve Katsuki, there's every chance it's a trap. All eyes back on him. Good. Maybe he could use this as a teaching experience. As much as he wished he could say they'd never deal with this again. This shit happened to pro heroes. No time like the present to learn to handle it. Assuming this is actually the League of Villains, and they sent this message specifically to Katsuki's class and teachers, what would their motivation be? After a month of no contact, when supposedly they already have the person they want. Quiet again. They were starting to put it together. Finally, Todoroki raised his hand, shoulders slumped but meeting Aizawa's gaze nonetheless. They haven't gotten what they wanted, so they're trying a new approach, or they had gotten it, and this was to rub it in. Aizawa put that possibility to the side though. There wouldn't have been a delay for that kind of thing. He hoped. Exactly. Any ideas as to what they could be trying? It was Yaoyorozu who replied to him this time, not bothering to raise her hand. Her voice was quiet, eyes downcast. Of all his students, she had been the most realistic about the situation. Being smart had its downsides. When your strategic thinking was off the charts, it meant you knew what a lost cause looked like. Two options. First, they're trying to lure one of us into a trap. If Katsuki isn't breaking on his own, they'd need someone he cared about to threaten instead. Second, it could be an attempt to break him through humiliation, depending on what kind of message they release afterwards. He didn't miss how his students shifted closer to one another. They were all too fucking young for this. Still, he kept the conversation going. Helping them understand the situation would help them rationalize it and make good choices if it came down to it. While the second one is a possibility, they would probably do a completely public broadcast. Under the circumstances, we're most likely looking at the first situation. Now, usually, if you're luring someone into a trap like this, you'd want to force them to make choices independently and quickly. Why delay it? Midoriya was the one to pipe up this time. A show of power. If they give us piecemeal information about him, it would create desperation. Then they could make demands. That'd be my best assumption given the evidence. So, considering all of that, what's our best response? All of them were quiet for a full minute. It was Eda who answered him, subdued. Be as emotionally distant from the situation as possible. It should only be handled by people that don't have an attachment to Katsuki, since the villains specifically targeted people who are emotionally attached to him. They understood the weight of the situation at last, guilt settling over the room. Aizawa hated crushing their dreams of running in to save their classmate. But he had to be sure they wouldn't try anything. If this really was about Katsuki, the situation could go south quickly and he couldn't risk any of them getting involved. Good. That's why all of you are now in the gym and will not be allowed to interfere with the situation if it does turn out to involve Katsuki. We can't risk playing into their hands. There is a team of professional heroes working on it as we speak, and we need to put our faith in them. Understood. A chorus of yeses and nods. He let them have silence to process their emotions until Kaminari raised his hand. Not the one Aizawa expected to have questions first, but not entirely out of character. If it does yield something, and they send out a rescue team, will you be going? Oh, all eyes were on him now. Reading the emotions of the gathered crowd was hard. What with the amount of conflict in their expressions? He'd been asking himself the same question for the past month. God, why had he let Midnight talk him into teaching? If I'm picked for the team, yes, it's possible I will be. Before their indignant cries could start, he held up a hand. Normally, I would not be. If it were another group of villains, I would recluse myself from the team because I'm too emotionally invested in the situation to act rationally. However, there are special circumstances. Of all of them, Yaoyorozu and Midoriya were the only two who put it together. I'm currently the only counter to All For One. If he's involved, my presence may be required regardless of emotional involvement. None of them were happy, but they got the point. Without All Might around, Aizawa was the only remaining option. That got him another minute of quiet until Todoroki raised his hand again. Even if we aren't allowed to interfere in the situation, Are we at least allowed to monitor the link? They said it looked like it was waiting for a signal, so the web page could change. We won't intervene, but shouldn't we be allowed to know what's going on? If a message appears, it could also be directed towards one of us, so our input could be important. It was a bad idea. They were all young and emotional. There was every chance that even with his lecture, they were still going to try and interfere in the situation. If he didn't let them, though, they'd find another way to watch it, and he wouldn't be able to monitor what they were seeing. Besides, as much as Aizawa was trying to be a responsible adult, he was dying to know what was going on. A selfish part of him wanted any information about his student as soon as possible. I'll get a projector and a quarantine computer in here, and we can watch the link on it. Don't open it on any personal devices. Biting his lip, he looked them all over again. I'm letting you all watch it under the condition that if something does happen, I may shut it down. If I make that call, all of you need to respect it. No matter what was said or being shown before I cut it off, if I say it's enough, you leave it. Understood? They were hesitant, but agreed. Good. Getting everything set up only took a few minutes. The link was the same blank web page from before. The browser was set to refresh the page every 5 seconds unless something changed. While they waited, he was able to get a few other things brought in for his students. Blankets and pillows, because the gym was not the most comfortable location to spend the day. Food and drink since none of them had had breakfast yet. Pens and paper so they could work on projects if they felt like it. None of it made the situation better, but it made him feel like he was doing something. His phone's notifications were all on. Aizawa still found himself checking it every minute or so for updates. An hour passed like that. He'd settled into the idea that it was probably just a spam email. Probably had nothing to do with his missing student. Then someone gasped. Swinging his gaze to the laptop in front of him, the page was changing. There was a new loading symbol on it. He almost closed the window, scared of what his students might see. Thank fuck he didn't, because when the page is loaded, it was quite possible the best thing he'd ever seen. There was a whole interface. At the top of the screen was actively updating GPS coordinates. That wasn't what got their attention. No, Aizawa couldn't take his eyes off the security footage taking up most of the screen. Katsuki was on the screen, looking absolutely awful, hair far worse than normal, frame gaunt from what must have been malnutrition, clothing tattered, body covered in cuts and bruises. He was alive though, alive, with all his limbs, and from the looks of it, he was free. His movements were slow down the hallway he was in, but he was clearly sneaking through. There were no restraints on his arms, and sparks came from his palms when he stumbled. Aizawa's relief was near instantly replaced by fear. Why were they being shown this? If whoever had access to this knew where Katsuki was, and knew he was escaping, why would they broadcast that out? Distantly, he realized his phone was buzzing. Opening it, there was someone from the investigation calling him. He should answer that. He needed to answer that. Instead, his fingers were pulled to his other notifications. One new email. None of his students had gotten an email. He had several of their phones up with him, confiscated for safety. The same sender as before. Subject, soon. Message, you've got one hell of a kid on your hands. Decided since we were splitting off, we might as well give him a hand. Site should be tracking him, but it has access to any of the cameras. All for One is probably going to be after him now he knows we're gone, so I'd hurry if I were you. Good luck. Another ping and a second message appeared. Subject, soon. Message, by the way, just in case you do get him back alive, I'm mailing you a drive with some interesting footage, probably worth checking out before you send him home. There was every chance this was a trap. Numbly, he forwarded the first email to the investigation team. Heroes shouldn't get their hopes up like this, shouldn't take something like this at face value. Still, the very idea that maybe, just maybe, this was actually a betrayal. Maybe they had actually just been sent Katsuki's location, along with every possible advantage for a rescue. God, he had to rub tears away from his eyes as he finally picked up the phone. It was Hizashi who was currently with the investigation team. You're seeing it too. Investigation team's looking into it. But Shouta, they think it might be legitimate. Everything's pointing at this being a live broadcast. And the location appears to match what the security cameras are showing. We still don't know why they would send this though. It felt like his throat was closing up, tears dripping from his eyes against his will. Fuck, this might be real. I got an email, just forwarded it. I don't know if it's real, but it implied there's a coup or something of the sort going on. Oh. There was hope in Hizashi's voice. Aizawa knew his husband, and he knew that voice. What if people heard? There's been rumors going around about unrest in the League of Villains since Katsuki got kidnapped. Word on the street was they weren't doing quite as much because of it. It's only been rumors up until this point, but it would make sense. If a group of them wanted to split off, setting Katsuki free would be a good distraction, and it'd draw hero attention to the hideout they're leaving behind. It would explain why they would send so much information on a delay. How Katsuki escaped his prison in the first place despite his condition. Why he hadn't been recaptured yet. Are they sending a team? The tense silence from the other end of the line was not what he wanted to fucking hear. As soon as they can ensure it isn't a trap, yeah. Right now people are scouring the other security cameras to confirm the coup theory and see who's left. We can't just run into this sort of thing. Rationally, Aizawa knew that. On an emotional level, he was staring at grainy footage of his fucking student, a child who has been in enemy hands for a month, who is still in the enemy base, carefully sneaking his way around corners. How far away is the hideout? It's fairly isolated. We're expecting it to take an hour or two to get there. That was not what he wanted to fucking hear. They're working on it, Shouta. I promise they are. I know. Silence between them. Aizawa's hearing tuned back into the rest of the room, which seemed torn between eavesdropping on his phone call and excitedly discussing everything Katsuki did on screen. Midoriya and Todoroki were holding onto each other, looking as if they were 1 second away from saying fuck it and trying to rescue Katsuki anyways. Call me if I'm needed. I've got to deal with the kids. Okay. Love you. Love you too. After hanging up, he had to take a moment to breathe, ignoring the imploring gazes on him. When he looked up again, all eyes were on him. All those young, desperate, hopeful eyes. He should tell them nothing was certain. They were still verifying all the information. For once, he said fuck what should be done. They think it's legitimate. From what we can tell, this may be about a splinter in the group letting him go as revenge. He could hear their excited voices. Ashido was actually bouncing where she sat. They're working on verifying everything now and getting a team ready to go to his location. It's pretty remote, so it's going to take some time. I'll repeat, none of you will be going. How long will it be until the team arrives? Probably 2 hours. The temperature in the room dropped. He could feel their anger and discontent like a physical blow, but he had to hold firm even if he agreed with them. We have to do this right. This might be our only chance to get him back safely. And if we move in too soon, it could put him in further danger. They weren't happy, but the anger simmered down, eyes turning back to the screen. Aizawa's gaze was drawn back to the screen too. He was not a religious man, but there were silent prayers on his lips as he watched Katsuki stumble around another corner. The first thing on Katsuki's mind was how much he fucking ached all over. It wasn't any one specific spot that was in pain, it was his entire body. Everything fucking hurt no matter how he moved. He was pushing through the pain as best he could, but it didn't make it any less distracting or annoying. Fighting was going to be a bitch. Dabi had said he was taking people with him when he left. From what Katsuki understood of the villain's dynamics, that probably implied a good chunk more than just him and Tamura. Almost all of the high-ranking villains who'd kidnapped him the first time around hadn't known shit about All For One, implying Tamura was the one they'd actually worked with, and the one who'd hold their loyalty. If they'd split off into their own group, that meant he for sure wasn't going to be fighting Dabi or Tamura. Toga would have gone with them for sure. Dabi definitely cared about her and he wouldn't leave her behind to deal with All For One's shit. Magni was one of the 2 villains he'd never met, but from how Toga talked about her, she'd almost certainly follow Tamura as long as Toga was on board. If Toga went with them, Twice would have followed her as well. Spinner would have followed Tamura, at least based on what Katsuki knew about the guy. That left Kurogiri and Mr. Compress up in the air. Kurogiri seemed loyal to All For One, but the few times Katsuki had interacted with him he seemed to care for Tamura as well. Katsuki didn't really know shit about Mr. Compress. Either of them could have stayed or gone with, and either villain would cause him a new set of problems. Guess it'd be an adventure to find out. And by adventure, Katsuki meant trip through hell. For right now, following the extremely loud noises seemed like his best bet. Whatever was going on, someone was pissed. Really fucking pissed. Katsuki could relate it. He staggered his way through another set of hallways, all long and narrow with little variety between them, before he reached a door with noises coming from inside. It wasn't the loud crashing sounds, but the room looked important enough to warrant a look inside. Unlike many of the other doors, it was worn, scuffed up, with plenty of scratches on it. Taking a deep breath, he carefully reached out and gently turned the doorknob, pushing the door open as softly as he could. What is he doing? Aizawa couldn't tell who hissed out what everyone was thinking. All his attention was on the screen. While he was at least being cautious, Katsuki was going against common sense and entering a room that clearly had someone inside it. In this case, the infamous and mysterious Dr. Daruma, someone with access to enough drugs and equipment to take Katsuki down with ease. Oh, the lab has an exit. The windows to the far left are big enough for him to slip out. Maybe he's trying to sneak out. It'd be a lot harder for them to catch him again if he makes it to the woods. Okay, that actually made sense. It might work too. Katsuki's entrance had gone unnoticed as Dr. Daruma worked fervently at his computer. Red eyes flickered around the room, taking in the environment. He noticed the windows. Good. All he'd need to do was... Nope. The smart thing to do, the thing Aizawa was ready to beg his student to do, was to make his way to the window as quietly as he could and slip out before he was noticed. Katsuki's eyes had narrowed in on Dr. Daruma instead. Aizawa had seen this kid pissed off more times than he could count. He'd seen him upset. He'd seen him angry beyond belief, facing down villains, facing down death itself. He had never seen Katsuki this angry. This level of hatred was unprecedented. There were an awful lot of bruises and cuts on Katsuki's body, far more than could have been caused by accidents. Oh, on a very selfish and petty level, Aizawa wanted his student to murder the man he was now slowly making his way towards. Any other students driven to that degree of hatred would have already thrown themselves into battle. Katsuki kept himself restrained, but a damn near thing. Those red eyes screamed vengeance. Well, whatever he decided to do, it wasn't like there were going to be legal consequences. Even if he killed the man in cold blood, nobody would hold a 16-year-old who'd been kidnapped and tortured for a month responsible for killing one of their captors. Keeping himself low to the ground, Katsuki crept through the lab. Quick and smooth movements, eyes never leaving his target. It reminded Aizawa of a cat stalking a mouse. Not a sound to be heard, no warning before the first strike. Sharp teeth gleamed in the dim light of the lab. No more than a handful of steps from the doctor, the blonde paused. Red glanced down to examine his palms, which were coated in sweat. He seemed to consider them. Then his eyes were back on his prey. Closer and closer Katsuki crept, and the gym collectively held its breath. Aizawa couldn't tell what the hell he was planning that required him to get so close. Katsuki waited until he was a few feet from the doctor, and then he pounced, lunging out from his hiding spot. Katsuki's usual explosions were absent from the attack as he clamped one hand over the doctor's mouth, wrenching the man back from the computer he had been furiously typing away at. The doctor's hands came up to scrabble at Katsuki's arms. But with all his tools out of reach, there wasn't much he could do. What next, though? Neither of Katsuki's hands were on the man's neck, which meant he wasn't going to choke him. Just restraining him wasn't going to work forever. The whole room watched as something rather strange happened. The man in Katsuki's grasp struggles started to falter and fail, before he slumped and stopped fighting altogether. What? Kaken's nitroglycerin. Midoriya was the most excited Aizawa had heard him in months, voice filled with awe and hope. All eyes were on him for an explanation as Katsuki dropped the man who was now completely passed out. It took Todoroki poking him in the side, but Midoriya jolted from his reverie and quickly started on one of his rants. Well, we've talked about it a little before. It's the other reason Kaken has to be careful about touching people. Obviously, nitroglycerin explosive and that's not good, but it's also pretty toxic. Kaken's is a little less dangerous, since it's a slight variation that makes it a bit easier for his cells to move around. But if he's at battle concentrations right now, with how much was on his hands, that's enough to have that guy down for a solid few hours. I'd almost forgotten that he could do that. He's never used it in training, since it's dangerous to do, obviously. He doesn't want to risk poisoning anyone, and it's not as precise for him as his explosions. Thankfully, Todoroki quieted his boyfriend before he could go on for too much longer. At some point, Aizawa was going to need to sit down with Izuku and get a detailed report from him on all his classmates' quirks. It should have been done sooner. The amount of information Midoriya collected was near obsessive, but extremely useful for teaching. Aizawa also needed more details on Katsuki's quirk in particular, because he'd had no idea his student was apparently dealing with a toxic substance dripping off his hands whenever he worked out. Putting that aside, he was relieved that the maneuver worked out. Now all his student needed to do was escape. It was a clear shot to the window from his position, and there was nobody else in the room. Why was Katsuki looking around the laboratory? Aizawa felt himself tense as Katsuki picked his way through the various bins, picking up certain items and leaving others. He took a hunting knife, bandages which were wrapped around the worst of his injuries, a heavy stick, a bottle of halothane. Those weren't the choices of someone about to escape. Those were the choices of someone who was planning on fighting. Again, Aizawa pleaded with any god that would listen. Katsuki was smarter than this. He knew better than to pick a fight he had no chance of winning. There was no reason for him to. As much as Katsuki could hold a grudge, he wouldn't throw his life away for revenge, right? It seemed Katsuki was almost done when he happened upon one last bin. A small one tucked out of the way. The bin looked slightly out of place, as if it were new. Katsuki hesitated and pulled it open. Aizawa wanted to cry with joy. Inside there was a familiar cell phone sitting atop Katsuki's clothing from when he'd disappeared. There were a few other things in there, but the cell phone was the important part. Katsuki obviously thought so too, because his hand darted down to grab the device. It flicked to life. Oh, thank fucking God, it still had power. The rescue team would be seeing this too. They already had Katsuki's phone number, so they could call him and give him directions. Though from Katsuki unlocking the device, they might not need to. Right, it took everything Aizawa had. But he tore his eyes from the screen to look at the devices in front of him. His own phone was there, however. There was every chance Katsuki would call Midoriya or Todoroki instead. Or he might call his parents, which wouldn't be great, but would be understandable. If he was smart, he was calling 911. As it turned out, Katsuki wasn't calling anyone. He spent a minute or two tapping at the keyboard instead, and sent off a quick series of texts. That made sense too. Several of the phones buzzed. After that, he turned on his phone's GPS and began broadcasting his position out. Unnecessary. They already knew where he was, but a smart move nonetheless. Then, for reasons Aizawa wouldn't ever understand, Katsuki turned his phone to silent and tucked it into his pocket. Stretching himself out, he took one last look around the room. Red eyes lingered on the windows, and Aizawa knew in that moment his student understood what they meant. Katsuki knew damn well that he could escape then and there. He knew that was the smart choice. He knew that was the safest route for him to take. Guilt flashed over Katsuki's expression. Only there for an instant and then gone, but Aizawa caught it. Why? What could there possibly be that would have Katsuki feeling guilty at a time like this? Aizawa desperately wanted to know what could be so fucking important at a time like this, because Katsuki turned away from the window. He grabbed the supplies he'd collected, and he started back towards the hallway. Back towards where All For One was currently having a fit. Aizawa wanted to scream, but he was interrupted by his husband, who pushed open the gym doors. The two of them made eye contact, years of working together meaning that neither had to say a word. For the sake of the students around them, Hisashi spoke anyways. Rescue team is almost ready to go. They want you on it. I'm taking over babysitting duty. He was trying to keep his tone light, but Aizawa knew his husband, and they both knew what was going on. This wasn't a race to get to Katsuki before the villains found him. This was a race to get to Katsuki before he found the villains. And Katsuki wasn't wasting a damn second. Jumping to his feet, Aizawa almost ran from the room. What else could he do? It wasn't like there was anything that would dissuade Katsuki from his current course. That kid had always been too damn stubborn for his own good. Hopefully, this time his determination wouldn't get him killed. Having acquired weapons and bandaged up the worst of his cuts, Katsuki still didn't feel ready to take on All For One, but like fuck that was going to stop him. At the very least he'd had the chance to send out a few messages before he got back to his stupid, suicidal quest. He could almost hear Aizawa screaming at him to turn back around. Unfortunately, Katsuki had mistakes he needed to make up for. All For One wasn't going to stick around long. Not when the heroes were on their way and his own forces were depleted. No chance in hell. If Katsuki did manage to hide from him, then the bastard would slip off again. He wasn't going to get another chance like this. Katsuki's biggest concern was making sure that the bastard was thrown off enough that he could get the quirk he needed. Sure, losing to Mira probably fucked with him a little, but Katsuki wasn't delusional. He'd been able to take this stupid quirk the first time because he'd gotten lucky and All For One wasn't ready for it. Not to mention Katsuki was in pretty bad fucking shape right now. For fuck's sake, he couldn't walk without pain. Focusing was going to be a challenge and a half. So, he was going to need to take this asshole down a peg before he tried anything else. He was also going to need to not die. Not before he fixed things. A surprise attack wasn't going to help much, but it was his best shot. Katsuki would bet anything that the dickhead wasn't expecting him to come after him. If it threw him off enough, with some lucky hits, Katsuki had a shot. However, before he even got to that shit, he had another asshole he needed to pay a visit to first. Dr. Googles very handily had the security cameras up, something about fixing a breach, and from those cameras, Katsuki knew who stayed behind. Mr. Compress hadn't, thank fuck. No marble-creating asshole this time. Kurogiri was hanging around though, down near the Namu. There was no way Katsuki could leave him to do whatever the fuck he was doing. All For One had already escaped using him once. Katsuki wasn't going to let him pull that shit again. Briefly, his mind flashed back to the messages he'd sent out. 5 in total. 2, nerd lesser than 3. None of this shit was your fault. Don't you dare try to blame yourself. You're so fucking strong, and you're going to be a damn amazing hero. I love you, Zuko. Take care of yourself. 2, ice a hot lesser than 3. You don't deserve the shit he puts you through. I wish I could have done more to help you. You're going to be such a fucking amazing hero. Nobody will even remember his name. I love you. Don't ever let him convince you otherwise. 2, Sharky. Out of everyone on the fucking planet, you decided you were going to be friends with the angry explosion kid. I don't know what the hell I would have done without you. You're the best friend I could have ever asked for. And I don't deserve you, but I'm so fucking grateful for you. 2, Aizawa Sensei. You're the first teacher I've ever had that gave a shit about their students. It's not your fault we keep getting put through this shit. I know you've done everything you fucking could to protect us. Thank you. Sorry I wasn't a better student. 2, All Might. I don't know how you're doing, but he said you were still alive. If you are, I know you're sick, but I need you. Please, I need you to come find me. Now more than ever. The words had come easily. He'd been thinking of them over and over during this past month, planning just what he'd say if he got the chance. Now though, he had a war to win and a hero to save. Taking a deep breath, Katsuki braced himself and set out for the Namu pens. Back in the gym, Izuku was a mess. He'd sent Kaken 1,000 texts by now. Mike had given them their phones back so they could see the messages. It didn't matter, nothing they did mattered. Kaken had already turned his phone off. Shadow hadn't bothered to send a reply, knowing it would go unread. He was curled up against Izuku's sobbing form, still and quiet as he read Kaken's message over and over again. Achako was trying to comfort Izuku. It wasn't doing much. Her efforts were pretty half-hearted anyways. There wasn't any comfort in a situation like this. All of them watched the screen as Kaken dragged himself down the hallways towards his enemies. The mood in the room was desolate, near defeated. The rescue crews weren't going to arrive on site for an hour, let alone however long it would take them to find Kaken in the hideout. With the pace Katsuki was moving, there was no way the villains wouldn't have found him by then. Or more accurately, there was no way Kaken wouldn't have found the villains by then. They had come so fucking close and they were going to lose him again. For what? His need for revenge. What could he possibly be planning to do? What could be worth risking his life? Mike had tried to cheer them up too, but there wasn't anything he could say that didn't sound empty. They'd been hearing to trust the pros all damn month. It wasn't fucking enough. Not when they were about to watch Kaken die. Kirishima was the one to break the silence, as Kaken stumbled through a doorway, only barely catching himself in time. He was almost to Kirigiri, who had just finished transporting the last Namu out of the facility. Once Kaken reached him, there was no escaping without fighting his way out. Katsuki's going to make it. Nobody else could reply to him. Nobody else had the nerve to agree with him or the nerve to let him down gently. Not with how the situation was weighing on them. Kirishima's hands curled into fists at his sides, teeth grit and eyes aflame. I don't know what he's doing. I don't know why he thinks this is the best route, but this is Katsuki we're talking about. Wild eyes turned on his classmates, pleading no, demanding that they agree with him. Katsuki's going to fucking make it. He's going to get through whatever plan he's concocted, and he's going to make it out alive. It was a statement, not a question, but Izuku felt the need to answer him anyways. Bringing up one scarred hand to rub the tears from his eyes, he felt Kirishima's determination infecting him. Kirishima's right. Kaken is the strongest person I've ever known. He's going to make it. I don't know what his plan is, but it's going to work. He wouldn't be doing it if he didn't think it would. Slowly, their determination spread through their classmates. 1B seemed more hesitant, but Monoma piped up, eyes desperately hopeful. Maybe he has more information than we do. We know the part of the league that split off were the ones who let him go, so maybe they told him something before they released him. He might know exactly what he's doing. Izuku hadn't even considered that possibility. Around them, excited whispers started up. Their determination and trust in their classmate renewed. Their faith wouldn't do anything to help Kaken, but it sure as hell was helping Izuku hold on as he watched his boyfriend sneak through the last doorway. Mouthing a silent plea, Izuku red-tightened his grip on Shadow and braced himself for whatever came next. Please Kaken, I need you to know what you're doing. I need you to be strong. I need you to come back to us. Katsuki pressed his way through the last door. All right, fucker should be somewhere in here. He kept himself in the shadows of the doorway, sliding over to the wall as he listened for any movements. There was a rustle of movement, and as he crept around a corner he finally got a visual on Kirigiri. Red eyes narrowed down as Katsuki considered his options. On one hand, he couldn't use his quirk too much in this fight. Even with the drink Dabi had given him, Katsuki's nitroglycerin took a fair bit of energy to produce. Using it up would only increase his exhaustion. On the other, there was no way in hell he'd win this fight without it. Kirigiri turned slightly, muttering to himself as he messed with a set of controls. All the Namu were gone. This guy wasn't sticking around for much longer. It was now or never, and Katsuki didn't fucking believe in never. Launching himself forward, Katsuki pinpointed the physical part of Kirigiri, his shoulder, and slammed his full weight into it. The moment he made contact, he ignited an explosion and knocked the misty form clear across the room. The villain was completely taken off guard. Though he wasn't defeated just yet, he managed to stumble to his feet as Katsuki launched at him again. Fuck. Instead of hitting the villain, Katsuki found himself slamming through a portal. Luckily, Kirigiri was heavily dazed from the attack and his portals were limited. It only took Katsuki to the ceiling. It was disorienting as shit, but Katsuki hadn't been training to fly for 9 years of his life for nothing. One blast reoriented him while his head spun to lock onto his target, and then Katsuki launched himself forward. Gravity helped him this time, slamming him into the unprepared villain with the force of a meteorite. If he survived this, he was going to be sore as shit, but it was worth it to watch Kirigiri smack into the wall across the room. Everyone was tense. Nervous energy filled the room to the brim. Some of them didn't dare breath as they watched Katsuki continue his assault of the villain. Others couldn't stop themselves from vibrating in excitement. Katsuki had the clear upper hand despite his condition. He'd fought Kurogiri before and already knew his weak points, and Kurogiri's portaling wasn't an effective deterrent. It looked like he might actually win the fight, though they were all still confused as to why he was fighting in the first place. Or they were until Momo suddenly bolted upright. Momo's mood had swung from a tense nervousness to bouncing in her seat almost as much as Mina was. Of course, he's taking down Kurogiri so he can take his quirk. I can't believe we didn't think of that. Her words brought a wave of understanding and relief through the group. Even Mike looked surprised and then thoughtful at her words. Izuku latched onto the idea, his mind running at 1,000,000 miles a second. Oh, I can't believe. Yes, that'd make so much sense. Kaken would know they'd have cameras, and maybe All For One put some kind of tracker on him to prevent an escape. So if he tried to run, they might catch him. He'd need a way to get far enough away that they couldn't get to him again. First, he had to take down the Dr. Daruma who might have been monitoring the cameras. And then all he needs to do is get Kurogiri's quirk. I'm sure he knows UAS coordinates. Kaken has always liked maps, and he uses a GPS system when he's hiking sometimes, so it'd make perfect sense. Hope was resurging in the room as Katsuki delivered another blast. The matchup was bad for Kurogiri. Katsuki was too fast and too destructive for him to combat without help. As Kurogiri got more and more disoriented, it looked like Katsuki's victory was certain. For all they knew, he could be in the room with them in minutes. Katsuki was running out of steam, but like hell he'd show it. The asshole he was facing didn't seem to be much better off either. He'd stopped even trying to portal Katsuki around and was now attempting to dodge, probably stalling for All For One. Sucks to be him, Katsuki wasn't having that shit. He gathered what energy he had left and slammed a full-sized blast into the warper's side, right where he knew part of Kurogiri was. When he did so, the two of them had been pretty damn close to one of the walls, and Kurogiri slammed into it at full force, rattling the building. The endlessly swirling mist slowed and slumped down as he fell unconscious. Most of the villains reformed, though parts faded off to mist and back again in a pulsing pattern. Fuck yeah, okay. There wasn't a chance in hell All For One didn't know where he was or what he was doing. Pulling the bottle of halothane out of his pocket, Katsuki soaked the remainder of the bandages and tied them around Kurogiri's now solid mouth. Great, that would keep the guy down for an hour or two. The next step was hiding the body. Katsuki grabbed the half-formed body as best he could, able to heft the other onto his shoulder, and darted over to one of the now empty Namu pens. They were deep, dark, and would work perfectly. Didn't Dabi say something about All For One having trouble seeing in dark, cold areas? That sounded right. Once he'd thrown the body down, Katsuki was left with an empty warehouse. Closing his eyes to rest for a moment, he could hear thunderous footsteps. Faintly, he could feel an overwhelming presence approaching. He would be here soon. After catching his breath, Katsuki took in the warehouse again. There were rafters, dark and the perfect height for launching an attack. Using the knife he'd stolen, he darted up the wall closest to him and situated himself up in the solid wood beams, crouched down and poised to spring as soon as his target entered his sights. Well then, yeah. The exchange between Monoma and Denki summed up the class's feelings fairly well. What else could he possibly be doing? Momo asked, as they watched Katsuki rest before turning to scale the wall. He can't be thinking of taking on All For One. Right, there's no reason for him to do that, he wouldn't. Despite the desperation in her voice, Mina knew as well as everyone else that was exactly what Katsuki was about to do. Who knows, maybe he'll win. The words sounded flat even to Izuku's ears. But at least Kirishima was trying to bring their spirits up. Nobody had the energy to reply this time. All intently focused on their classmate as he positioned himself in the rafters and his doom walked closer and closer to him. Meanwhile, in a truck hurtling down an old forest road, Aizawa put his face in his hands. He didn't take Kurogiri's quirk and escape, I assume. He'd dumped the body and now he's hiding in the damn rafters. Best Genus sighed in response. He had been the most doubtful when they'd heard of the potential plan from Hisashi, and he didn't seem surprised Katsuki hadn't escaped. Gritting his teeth, Aizawa switched through the cameras on his phone, helplessly watching All For One stalk down the hallways. It would be minutes at most before he reached Katsuki, and it would be close to half an hour before they arrived. Rubbing at his eyes, he had to set his phone down for a moment. Fuck, why, now of all times does he chose to lose his damn mind? He's supposed to be the one with common sense. He should know better than to pull this shit. There's nothing for him to gain, and he's already in awful shape. It was unfair to put all these expectations onto a child. But Aizawa couldn't help himself. He'd been so relieved, so sure that Katsuki would get himself out of there, and instead his student was feeding himself to the wolves. All while Aizawa was helpless to do anything but watch. Katsuki has been held captive for a month. We don't know what they've been doing to him in that time. It's entirely possible that he's not thinking straight right now. The ones who left also may have lied to him to get him to fight as a distraction. Fair, didn't mean Aizawa had to like it. Genist paused for a moment, eyes going back to the live stream. Though his actions do strike me as oddly purposeful. I'll admit I may not know him as well as you do, but putting motivate aside, how he's carrying these actions out seems to be consistent with what I would expect of him. That's not to say this can't be the result of a month of torture, or some lie he's been told, but I must wonder if he doesn't have a reason to engage them we don't know about. That actually made a weird amount of sense. This entire time Aizawa had been assuming that Katsuki would act like himself, and would take the logical route to safety. Everything else about Katsuki's actions had been in character for him. The only missing puzzle piece was the why. I don't know what he thinks is so fucking important that he's getting himself killed over it, but if he survives this, I'm going to kill him myself. Genus quietly snickered at his declaration, and the situation lightened for a heartbeat. Then both their weary eyes turned back to the cameras. Any trace of a smile faded from their features, and the mood grew somber once again. He'll make it out alive. He did the first time. Aizawa didn't like to have false hope. This time, though, he was willing to play along. If it was going to be anyone, it'd be that fucking kid. Only seconds before All For One arrived, all they could do was hope Katsuki knew what the fuck he was doing, because they absolutely fucking didn't. When All For One entered the room, it took a lot for Katsuki not to launch himself at the man. Gotta wait for a better position. Kurogiri, where are you? Come out this instant. Weird. Didn't the guy have a tracking quirk? Or the teleporting quirk? All For One was furious, footsteps cracking the ground he walked on, but he didn't seem to realize Katsuki was in the room. His head swung back and forth like a bloodhound looking for his lost servant. Then he shuddered. Katsuki saw it only for a moment, how those strange tree formations from before grew from his back for a moment before vanishing. How his muscles rippled. The man was almost in a good position for Katsuki to attack, but he hesitated. Something more was going on here, and he needed to know what before he started his attack. For almost a full minute he watched as All For One searched for Kurogiri, and again he saw that shudder. This time, a bit of the goop appeared by him before fading away. A violent shake of his head indicated something else happened too. He couldn't control all his quirks. Katsuki almost startled and gave away his hiding spot when he realized it. The man genuinely had lost control of himself. No wonder. Katsuki already knew people could end up mindless Namu if they got the wrong set of quirks shoved into them. Intel reports from the currently captured Nomas told them that much. Katsuki himself had noted those feelings of rightness or wrongness of quirks, that vague sense of how well a quirk would fit a person outside of its original owner. Obviously, All For One had a fuck ton of quirks. When he had the original transfer quirk, that wouldn't have been an issue. Now that he didn't, he couldn't put them on hold anymore like Katsuki could. All of them were active all the time. Might help explain why he'd been so desperate to get his original quirk back. It also meant Katsuki had a chance in this fight if he played his cards right. He waited for All For One to get a bit closer, bunching up his limbs and timing it. Wait for the next shudder. The timing seemed a bit random, but from how the guy was shouting and losing his shit, his emotional state was probably causing at least some of it. Seconds ticked by, and they felt like centuries in moments at the same time. Then he saw it start and let go. An explosion shattered the beam he'd been hiding on as he flew forward, just as All For One dropped his head to try and contain another quirk glitch. He couldn't react in time to escape Katsuki's explosion, couldn't activate any of his own shit in response, and took a damn nasty blow right to the face. The blast knocked him clear across the room, blood dripping from the wound that was starting to close up. Katsuki saw his chance and followed, reaching out to grab All For One's arm just as the man had done a few months ago. Now, Katsuki would be the first to say that he hadn't thought this plan through. That was a fair and valid criticism. Still, he'd had a general sense of how he was going to pull most of this shit off. What he hadn't considered at all was how the fuck he'd know which quirk to grab. All For One had so fucking many of the damn things in him. They were practically trying to escape his body. Katsuki couldn't make heads or tails of them in his rush, meaning he had only the vaguest idea to go off of when he grabbed hold of one and yanked. The interaction only lasted a few seconds, and All For One was too stunned to fight back mentally, so Katsuki managed to grab one quirk before a hand came up to swat him aside. As he slammed into the wall, feeling several ribs snap, he took a closer feel at the quirk he'd just grabbed. Fuck, dodging to the side to avoid All For One's rush attack. Katsuki realized he had the wrong fucking quirk. This wasn't the healing quirk he needed, it was something to do with longevity. Not fucking helpful right now. He tucked the quirk to the back burner and turned his focus back to the fight, just in time to be smashed in the face. Shit, that was going to sting in the morning, if he lived that long. Katsuki groaned and pushed himself back to his feet, stumbling to avoid another attack and launching an explosion in the general direction of All For One. It didn't connect. He felt a hand grab him by the arm, yanking him off the ground and slamming him back down. Yeah, his leg was probably fucking shattered. How the fuck did Izuku keep going at the training camp after having this happen to all his fucking limbs? Now he was being held above the ground by the neck. All For One was saying something, but fuck if Katsuki knew what it was. Probably a demand of some kind. In all honesty, Katsuki didn't particularly give a shit about what this asshole wanted from him. What he did give a shit about was getting slammed into the wall again. If that happened again, he was out. No chance of getting the quirk he needed. No chance of saving All Might. Katsuki had really been hoping for better circumstances, maybe getting the asshole injured first or something, but he'd take what he could get. In this case, emotional distress and panic were going to need to do the trick, because this was his last fucking chance. Hands shaking, Katsuki pulled one up to grab a hold of the arm on his throat. There wasn't a bone in his body that wasn't bruised by now, but he pressed on because he was Katsuki fucking Bakugo, and he didn't fucking do losing. Reaching out mentally, he felt All For One jolt at the connection. Realizing what he was doing, the man made no move to throw Katsuki away. Maybe he'd finally figured out this was the one shot he had at getting his stupid fucking quirk back. Connection established. Katsuki reached out and felt through the quirks more carefully this time. Sifting through them took moments he didn't have, but he grabbed onto the one that felt brutally comforting. Like recovery girl's kiss, forcing broken bones back into their place. As he grabbed hold, he felt All For One do the same. Fuck. Well, asshole, time to see who's really the stubbornest fucker on the planet. Finally, you little thief, time to give back what's mine. Katsuki felt the others pull and yanked back even harder, gritting his teeth and biting out a reply. That's real fucking rich common from you. All For One slammed him back against the wall, though much more softly, not wanting to risk the connection. Katsuki bore the pain even as he felt his grip slip for half a heartbeat before he regained it. As soon as I have my quirk in my grasp, I will force you to watch as I kill each and every one of your little friends. You'll watch and you'll know it was because of you. You've stole what's mine twice now, and I will see you suffer for it. With his hissed threats, All For One's pull got stronger and stronger, until Katsuki was struggling to hold on. Fuck, fuck, fuck. Just as he thought his grip might slip, images flashed to the forefront of his mind. Izuku and him when they were kids, before quirks, before kidnappings, before they'd understood how awful life could be, smiling and laughing as they played some made-up game. There was that stupid grin on Izuku's face, his eyes shining as he looked at Katsuki like he was the fucking sun in the sky. Shadow and him sitting quietly side by side after the sports festival. A mere minute or so after he'd been let out of those damn chains. They hadn't even let him get water before he'd been hauled up there, and Katsuki was almost too dehydrated to stand. Shadow had been the one to bring him a water bottle, apologizing for what wasn't his fault. He hadn't quite been ready to forgive Shadow then, but his anger at the other had faded, enough to not hold a grudge. At the time, he'd just nodded and Shadow had given him a hesitant twitch of the lips. The start of so much more. Ijiru and him on Island, fighting side by side. His friend had dragged him around and made him have fun even when he was grouchy about both his boyfriends being busy. In the end, he had ended up having a good time taking down villains. The redhead was always there, supporting him with that bright, friendly smile. Eyes looking like they saw something in him that he himself couldn't find. Aizawa giving him a smile and telling him he was proud, even after all the shit he'd put his teacher through. His teacher standing up for him, giving him space and kindness when he desperately needed it. All Might trying his best to be encouraging, even though he was kind of shit at it. Big bright smile and stupid catchphrases that Katsuki wouldn't admit he had memorized. His teacher who was so fucking strong, laying on that hospital bed, still smiling on death's door, still smiling at Katsuki, the reason he was at death's door. Scene after scene filtered through Katsuki's mind, of his boyfriends, his classmates, his teachers, his friends, his family. Red eyes snapped open and Katsuki felt fire surging through his veins. He was not going to lose now. This asshole was not going to stop him from saving All Might. There wasn't a force on heaven or earth that was going to keep Katsuki from saving his goddamn family. 2. He tightened his grip on the quirk. Fucking. Shoulders tensed, bracing for the mental pull. Bad. As he shouted, Katsuki yanked with everything he had in his fucking body, explosions blasting from his palms. One burned the arm holding his throat. The other aimed towards All For One's midsection and it hit dead on. The blasts weren't Katsuki's biggest, but they were fucking powerful all the same, more than enough to send that asshole sprawling. As the connection broke, once more Katsuki felt his victory. The quirk he'd fought so hard to get, and the rope fell back with him. He barely managed to catch himself. One hand braced up against the wall behind him. All For One was injured, and it wasn't healing this time. Didn't seem to be enough to kill him though. Shit. For a moment, Katsuki considered using the quirk he'd just stolen. It'd probably be enough to keep him alive. The thought was dismissed near instantly. If he did, it'd take what little energy he had left. With how injured and exhausted he was going to be out of commission for a week or two at least, even with the healing quirk. There was every chance All For One would kill him while he was knocked out. Not to mention he couldn't risk a week or two recovery to get the quirk to All Might. His hero might not have that long left. The healing quirk was also tucked to the side as All For One pushed himself back to his feet. Katsuki dropped his hold on the wall, breathing coming in short, ragged pants and blood dripping off him. His leg was still fucked, but he could take some of the weight off with his explosions. The fury contorting All For One's face was pretty fucking satisfying. I see now there's no hope for you. You are a pest that needs to be exterminated here and now. I'm sure we can find a way to retrieve my quirk from your corpse. Venom dripped from All For One's voice, and Katsuki knew he meant that shit. Baring his teeth in a facsimile of a smile, Katsuki let madness overtake his eyes and the thrill of battle overtake his face as he taunted back, his words starting to slur together. How many times I gotta tell you, this shit isn't yours anymore, dickhead. I haven't renamed it. And no, it's not fucking Stide. He saw the attack coming and threw his weight to the right, barely escaping the air cannon blast. Fuck, his explosions were barely anything. Body probably didn't have the energy for nitroglycerin anymore. Pitching himself forward as best he could on one broken leg and with blurred vision, Katsuki blindly tried to dodge. A second blast from All For One's air cannon clipped his left side and shit that fucking hurt like a bitch. His whole side was torn up now. Fuck, can't stop. A large hand grabbed him, and Katsuki knew he was done for. This was it. He was spun around to face his death. Well, if nothing else, he'd fucking tried. Katsuki had given this shit his all, and it wasn't fucking enough. Story of his fucking life right there. With what little energy he had left, he forced his eyes open. He refused to be the sort of coward that looked away. If it was his death, he would face it head on. When God greeted him, Katsuki was going to spit in that bastard's eye for all the shit he'd put him through. All For One raised one hand, summoning what seemed to be another air cannon. Execution style then. Katsuki braced himself and kept his blurry vision on that hand, only to watch the air cannon fizzle out. All For One looked just as shocked as Katsuki did for a heartbeat before the two of them were being yanked apart. Katsuki felt himself flying through the air as if something was pulling him. After a moment, he realized something was. The tattered remains of his shirt. There were blasts of energy around him, voices shouting. Someone had grabbed him out of the air and they were talking to him in a soothing tone. Oh, the heroes had finally gotten to him. He'd forgotten they were coming. Blinking his eyes a few times, he was able to make out a blue form. Probably Genist. Funny how these things worked out. Katsuki could feel the man's steps jolting him. It hurt like hell, but everything hurt like hell right now. Blackness was encroaching at the edge of his vision, even as daylight hit his eyes for the first time in a month. He forced his mouth to move, forced words to come out around the blood. I need to seal mict. He was being pressed down onto a flat surface, and everything was too damn white. Forms shifted and buzzed past his vision as he tried to repeat himself. A familiar form was peering over him then, and he felt a large hand gripping his own. Bright yellow hair was overtop him, attached to a watery smile. All Might must have gotten his text then. Among the din all around him, comforting words cut through everything else. It's all right, my boy, I am here. You're going to be okay. Even though All Might's voice was shaky, the sap was probably crying. Katsuki still found himself grinning at how much it reminded him of home. He could feel All Might through their connected hands. Feel the emptiness, the faint ghost of another quirk that left behind unused potential. Perfect. There was room for at least 2 quirks there. Katsuki summoned the dregs of his energy and focus, and once more summoned the connection. It only took a moment, taking both quirks from where he'd held them and shoving them over. He could feel them starting to take effect even as All Might startled. The transfer took everything he had left. Darkness overtook Katsuki's vision and he could feel himself fading. People were shouting his name, pleading with him not to go. There wasn't enough strength left in him to move his mouth, to tell them that everything was okay now. Oh well, they'd figure it out eventually. If this killed him, at least he'd die having finally succeeded at something. His plan might have been bullshit, but it worked. He'd managed to get one part of this hero shit right. With his rib cage shattered, fluid filling his lungs, and blood pooling in his mouth, Katsuki finally found himself able to breathe easy even as the void enveloped him once more, knowing he'd fixed his mistake in the end.